The term fragging, or the deliberate killing of your military colleagues, was coined during the Vietnam War. It was a shockingly common phenomenon during that conflict, but why? Why were American soldiers killing their own officers? What drove them to do it? How did they get away with it? And what impact did this unprecedented level of murderous insubordination have on how the military operates today? Before we get to that, let's talk a little bit about the Vietnam War and how it all began. The Vietnam War lasted from 1955 to 1975, making it a 20-year-long hell for all involved on both sides. It was a divisive conflict, and to this day, many Americans question if the United States should have gotten involved. The main driving force for the United States invasion of Vietnam was the domino theory, the belief that if one country were to become communist, all of the neighboring countries would do the same. The US feared communism would spread to South Vietnam and the rest of Asia. In an attempt to stop this from happening, the US government sent supplies, funding, and military advisors to South Vietnam, involving the United States in what was, at the time, a civil war. Ho Chi Minh was the leader of the Viet Minh, a communist resistance army that fought against the Japanese and French occupation. Ho Chi Minh wanted to unite Vietnam under a communist government. The country had been under French colonial rule since the 19th century, and during World War II, the country had been invaded by Japan. When Japan was defeated in 1945, they withdrew from Vietnam, and this would be the first domino falling. If you'll pardon the metaphor, that would lead to the Vietnam War. Emperor Bao Dai was in control of the country until he abdicated in 1945 at Ho Chi Minh's urging, leaving the country in the hands of the Viet Minh. Bao Dai spent a year as supreme advisor to the Viet Minh until he left Vietnam for Hong Kong, but the French and Viet Minh continued to unsuccessfully ask him for political support. When a coalition of Vietnamese anti-communists formed a national union, they told Bao Dai they would support him, but only if he would seek independence for Vietnam. Bao Dai would align himself with them. In 1955, Ngo Dinh Diem, a staunchly anti-communist politician, became president of the government of the Republic of Vietnam. Both sides had the same goal of a united Vietnam, but drastically different ideas on what a unified Vietnam would look like politically. Ho Chi Minh and his supporters wished for a communist government, while Bao Dai and Ngo Dinh Diem looked for a government closer to what existed in Western countries. Diem's forces received training and equipment from the United States military and the CIA, and they would use this to punish Viet Minh sympathizers in the South. Diem would refer to them as the Viet Cong, meaning Vietnamese communists. He had 100,000 people arrested, of which many were tortured and executed. In the United States, America was equally divided on the war. The first substantial student protest occurred in October 1963. At the time, the United States had only sent American military advisors to Vietnam, but students across the United States were speaking out, and they were united under the belief that the Vietnam War was wrong. The protests grew in strength as the conflict escalated, and some of the protests turned violent. When American troops were sent to Vietnam, they were surrounded by death and cruelty. American soldiers had to go up against the Viet Cong, who relied on guerrilla methods. They set traps in the jungle and would ambush American soldiers. And crucially to what would follow, many of the American soldiers were also not there voluntarily, but brought over due to the ongoing draft. Out of 27 million eligible men, the United States drafted 2.2 million American men during the Vietnam War. Although only 25% of the military were draftees, it also spurred a lot of men into joining the military to avoid being drafted into it. There were a lot of people who did everything in their power to avoid the draft, including intentionally failing aptitude tests and fleeing to Canada. It's not surprising that resentment would build between soldiers and their superiors. Although the total is incomplete, from 1969 to 1972, there were around 900 cases of known or suspected fragging during the Vietnam War, which resulted in 99 deaths and an untold number of injuries. From 1970 to 1971, the incidence of fragging increased even as the United States was withdrawing from Vietnam. But by the end of the war, it's believed at least 450 officers and 600 United States soldiers had been killed by fragging, and 1,400 had died under mysterious circumstances. Fragging was not new, as similar incidents had occurred prior to the 1960s, but it became far more prevalent. It was a way for soldiers to discourage those in charge from being too enthusiastic for combat. As the Vietnam War grew more and more unpopular, the soldiers lost morale. They saw no reason to risk their lives for a losing war that many of them didn't even support. There were a lot of soldiers who were given a one-year tour of duty, and this meant there was less cohesion among units. For some, it was self-preservation, killing their officers to ensure they might get out of the Vietnam War alive. American soldiers were staring down the Viet Cong as the United States was making little progress in the war. At times, fragging was used in order to remove leaders that soldiers viewed as incompetent or a threat to their survival. Soldiers resented that unit leaders would risk their soldiers' lives for personal gain. Fragging had surprising consequences, such as opium addiction among American soldiers. In some units, soldiers used fragging in order to fight anti-drug policies, so officers would tolerate drug use and general insubordination among their soldiers due to a fear of fragging. Without any restrictions on narcotics, drugs became freely available to the already traumatized soldiers. There were incidents where unit leaders who were considered too strict would be given warnings from soldiers. When a unit leader would enforce discipline or regulations, sometimes they would find a frag grenade with a safety pin left in it and their name written on it in their bunk. Other times, soldiers might have discharged a smoke grenade under their bunk. These always had a loud and clear message, and unit leaders would back down due to the threat of fragging. If you're wondering if anyone was ever caught committing the offense, it wasn't many, and even fewer people were convicted of the crime. Lower-ranked GIs united to protect their fellow soldiers, and they helped make it difficult to identify the guilty party of the incidents. Of those who had been convicted, they were given incredibly light sentences. Some were sentenced only to 10 months in jail. There were some notable incidents. In 1969, after the assault on Hamburger Hill, there was an underground GI newspaper that had placed a $10,000 bounty on Lieutenant Colonel Weldon Honeycutt's head. Honeycutt had ordered and led the attack at Hamburger Hill, and the bounty had led to several unsuccessful attempts on Honeycutt's life. Hamburger Hill was a 10-day battle where in a remote valley in South Vietnam, American troops fought for control of a 3,000-foot tall hill. After days of a bloody and vicious battle, they were able to take the hill, but they would abandon it only days later. After they abandoned it, the North Vietnamese would return to reoccupy it. Many saw it as a senseless loss of lives, and the debate continues to this day. Anger over the loss of life most likely incentivized American soldiers to want Honeycutt dead. In 1970, in Vietnam's Quang Ngai province, 25-year-old Captain Scott Edward Schneider was the commander of United States Army Artillery Battery. At 1:40 a.m. on August 17th, he was killed when an American soldier threw a frag grenade into his quarters while he slept. He died instantly. Private David K. Laughlin would be charged with his murder. 19-year-old Laughlin was described as a druggie, known for using hashish, LSD, and meth. He was also known for consuming a 6-ounce bottle of obesitol on a daily basis. Obesitol was a drug that combined several amphetamine salts in order to treat obesity. Laughlin would spend most of his time in a nearby village with a group of Marines. One of his platoon mates recalled that he would spend his time smoking opium with the old men. He was assigned menial chores, mostly due to his drug habit and absences, and he was prohibited from operating complex artillery. Schneider would eventually demote him from specialist to a private, or an E4 to an E1. They believed Laughlin's motive for the murder was a drug-induced grudge. Laughlin would plead guilty to unpremeditated murder, and he was sentenced to 25 years of hard labor. In 1979, Laughlin would be released after just 8 years and 7 months of his sentence. While drugs played a large part in fragging, racial tension was also considered a motivating factor in some cases. On March 15, 1971, at an Army base in Bien Hoa, Lieutenants Thomas A. Delwo and Richard E. Harlan, 2 white men, were killed by a grenade being thrown into their sleeping quarters. When Billy Dean Smith, a black private, was arrested for the crime, the prosecution argued that Smith had actually meant to target Captain Randall L. Rigby and First Sergeant Billy Willis due to their racist encounters with Smith. When Smith's case received international attention, it was moved from Vietnam to Fort Ord, California. The defense argued that the grenade pin had been planted in Smith's pocket after the attack. They alleged he had been targeted due to his anti-war statements prior to the murders. According to Black Scholar magazine, Smith was the logical guilty party because he was a black GI with a bad attitude. Billy Dean Smith was found not guilty. It wasn't unusual for the fragging incidents to miss their intended target. In 1969, a new commander was put in charge of Battery D of the 11th Marines at Phu Loc. Due to his style of discipline, he became unpopular with some of the Marines. On February 27th, someone threw a grenade into his sleeping quarters hoping to frag him, but he wasn't in his quarters that night. Instead, the explosion would kill First Sergeant Warren E. First, who was scheduled to return home to his family in just a few days. They never convicted anyone of his murder. At the Quang Tri Combat Base on April 21, 1969, someone threw a grenade into the company office of K Company, 9th Marines. First Lieutenant Robert R. Roweller would die as a result of the explosion. Private Reginald F. Smith would go on to brag to a colleague about the murder, which led to him being apprehended. As he told of his exploits, he still had the grenade ring on his finger. Smith would plead guilty to the murder and he was sentenced to 40 years. He wouldn't finish his time, though. On July 25, 1982, he was murdered by a fellow inmate. Army captain and incoming commander of the 188th Military Police Company, Roy Moore, was strict. When he arrived near Da Nang, he would quickly discover that some of the MPs had developed addictions to drugs and alcohol. Moore comfortably filed disciplinary charges against addicted and insubordinate soldiers. Unsurprisingly, he received threats of fragging. One night, Moore was told that one of his soldiers, Kidwell, a known drug user, had shot First Sergeant Howard and planned to attack Moore next. Moore took precautions to defend himself against Kidwell, only to discover he'd already been taken into custody and was in his office. Kidwell was court-martialed and First Sergeant Howard survived the attack. The United States Army wasn't the only one contending with fragging. It was prevalent in the Australian military as well. Lieutenant Robert Thomas Convery of the 9th Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment died on November 23, 1969 at the age of 22. After a night of heavy drinking with his battalion, a grenade was placed in his tent in Nui Dat around midnight. He was killed when the grenade exploded as he slept. He was due to return home in 5 days. Later on, Private Denzel Allen would be convicted of his murder and sentenced to a life sentence in Riston Prison, but he would only serve 10 years and 8 months. In one case, a booby trap may have saved a man's life. Eugene Linden was an American author who once wrote about the demoralization of American troops in Vietnam in a 1971 Saturday Review article. He told the story of a company commander in the 23rd Infantry Division. The captain was injured when he fell on a punji stick, a booby trap that's a simple spike made from sharpened bamboo. It turns out this was a life-saving event, as it removed him from combat. He was informed by a medic that all of the men in his unit were most likely pleased that he'd fallen on that stick. The medic explained to him that his unit felt he constantly put his men in danger and lacked common sense. The men had been talking about fragging him until he fell on that punji stick. Fragging statistics mostly cover incidents that involve explosives, typically grenades, but there are also several hundred murders by firearms. In those cases, it was typically men of equal rank shooting each other, though. According to the statistics on hand, less than 10 officers were killed by their colleagues via firearms. There were rumors of enlisted soldiers deliberately killing officers and non-commissioned officers using the chaos of the battlefield to get away with it. Another incident at Nui Dat involved Private Paul Raymond Faraday opening fire into the sergeant's mess of the Royal Australian Army Service Corps with his SLR rifle. On December 25, 1970, Faraday shot and killed Sergeants Alan Brian Moss and Wallace James Galvin and wounded Sergeant Frederick Edwin Bodle. He committed the crime after an all-day drinking session. Faraday was described as being paranoid and prone to fits of rage by an Army psychiatrist during his court-martial. Witnesses would state that Faraday was aware of his own actions, and they provided details of previous altercations with Faraday. Faraday would be convicted on 2 counts of manslaughter and 1 assault with a weapon. Of his 10-year sentence, Faraday only served 8. The United States military began to instill tougher restrictions on access to weapons to try to minimize the number of fraggings. They would instill post-fragging lockdowns until the investigation was completed. In May 1971, the United States Army had to temporarily stop issuing grenades to all units in Vietnam, and they confiscated weapons, ammunition, grenades, and knives. Despite their best efforts, this didn't reduce the amount of fragging incidents. If they couldn't get it from the American military, soldiers would find weapons through the black market in Vietnam. Fragging played a role in why the United States switched to an all-volunteer military, dropping the draft altogether. Nixon signed the legislation to end conscription on September 28, 1971, but it wouldn't go into effect until January 27, 1973. When Nixon ran for president in 1968, he had promised he would end the draft. Nixon also believed that ending the draft would put an end to protests. He thought that middle-class Americans would lose interest in the war if they didn't fear that they or their loved ones might be sent to fight. Despite running on that, Nixon wouldn't act on his promise for the first years of his presidency. In fact, a draft was originally due to expire in June 1971. Instead of allowing it to expire, Nixon asked Congress to approve a 2-year extension on it. They'd even compiled draft priority numbers for men born in 1954, 55, and 1956. Congress would not extend the draft, though. Vietnam led to a great deal of resentment from American soldiers. Many soldiers were also faced with Agent Orange, a mixture of herbicides that the United States used to clear foliage. It was meant to take away the Viet Cong's hiding places, but it's also believed that nearly 3 million American soldiers might have been exposed to Agent Orange. Many of these soldiers who were exposed later developed cancer or other medical problems, including Parkinson's disease. In 1979, United States veterans were able to bring a class action lawsuit against the 7 herbicide manufacturers who produced Agent Orange. They would settle out of court in 1984, creating a $180 million fund to compensate 250,000 victims and their families. It's also believed that exposure to Agent Orange is responsible for abnormally high amounts of miscarriages, skin disease, cancers, birth defects, and congenital malformations among Vietnamese people in the 1970s. American soldiers not only witnessed brutality, they participated in it as well. On March 16, 1968, the United States committed one of its darkest atrocities during the Vietnam War in the village of My Lai. The village of 700 civilians was invaded by the Charlie Company, 11th Brigade American Division, and they slaughtered 504 Vietnamese innocents, including children, within 3 hours. There were no reports of opposing fire from the village, but Lieutenant William Cawley, the commander of the unit, ordered his troops to enter the village firing. Civilians were clubbed, stabbed, and women were assaulted. The soldiers mutilated some of their victims by carving C Company on their chests. Only one American was injured during the massacre when he accidentally shot himself in the foot while he was clearing his pistol. Robert Maples, one of the soldiers at My Lai, refused to open fire at the Vietnamese civilians in a ditch. His commanding officer trained his own weapon on him, and Maples still refused. Meanwhile, helicopter pilot Hugh Thompson Jr. threatened to open fire on his fellow Americans, desperate to protect the Vietnamese villagers from being massacred. He threatened to report the massacre as well. He had blocked the American soldiers with his helicopter, and he had his crew aim their guns at the American troops and rescued villagers hiding in a bunker. When Thompson noticed movement in one of the ditches, he landed so the crew chief, Glenn Andreotta, could rescue a young boy from the ditch. The boy was covered in blood but uninjured. Thompson would report the incident to his Army officers, but while that did lead to a ceasefire, it also led to a cover-up. The United States military would work diligently to keep what happened in My Lai a secret. L. Mendel Rivers, the chairman of the House of Armed Services Committee, would later claim that Thompson was the only guilty party there that day since he was the one who had turned his gun on his fellow Americans. It's no surprise that Thompson would throw away the Distinguished Flying Cross that they'd awarded him for saving the lives of the Vietnamese villagers. When given the medal, the citation made no mention that the hostile fire he faced was from the American side. Thompson believed the United States military wanted to buy his silence. He would receive the Soldier's Medal in 1998, but he refused to accept unless they gave the award to his door gunner, Lawrence Colburn, and the late Andreotta. Sadly, Glenn Andreotta had died in a crash 3 weeks after My Lai. The United States military couldn't keep the lid on My Lai forever, especially after Ron Rittenhour, a 22-year-old gunner in another unit, wrote letters to 30 congressional and military officials a year later. Someone connected to the military called a part-time political columnist from the Village Voice to tell them about a United States soldier being court-martialed for the massacre at the Vietnamese village, but the Army didn't want anyone reporting on it. Naturally, the columnist, Jeffrey Cohen, was interested. He called a freelancer named Seymour M. Hirsch and told him about the story, and it was Hirsch who would dig deeper into what had happened. Hirsch would fly out to Salt Lake City to meet with Cawley's lawyer, and he would travel to Fort Benning, walking around the base until he found Cawley to interview him. Hirsch would uncover the story for the American public, later winning the 1970 Pulitzer Prize for international reporting. When the public learned about the My Lai massacre, anti-war sentiments rose further. The investigation into the massacre uncovered widespread failures in leadership, discipline, and morale. The United States military had lost many career soldiers over the course of the ongoing war. If they hadn't been rotated out or retired, they were killed. They'd been replaced with draftees who lacked experience. Military officials blamed the disappointing talent pool for the military deteriorating. They argued that if they had more educated middle-class draftees, someone like Cawley, an unemployed college dropout, would have never been the leader of a unit. Although he had dropped out of college, in 1967, Cawley had managed to graduate from Officers Candidate School at Fort Benning, Georgia. Cawley would testify that he was ordered by Captain Ernest Medina to carry out the slaughter in My Lai. However, all the photographic and recorded evidence pointed to Cawley alone. Cawley was sentenced to life in prison, but he was released in 1974. He was given a dishonorable discharge and entered the insurance business afterward. The Vietnam War was in hindsight a travesty for all involved, with flaws that cost countless thousands their lives trickling down from the very top of leadership. Fragging is just one more shade of red amidst the overall atmosphere of tragic, bloody chaos. It's the closing days of the Second World War, and despite defeat being a near certainty, the German army is still fighting ferociously, forcing Allied troops to pay for every inch of territory with their blood. Just outside the Vosges Mountains, an American infantry platoon is under heavy assault by a well-coordinated and armed German advance. Several M10 tank destroyers are lending their fire to the battle on the American side, but one by one they are hit by German Panzerschrecks and anti-tank munition, forcing their crews to abandon the vehicles. Amidst the chaos, one soldier sees that his men are about to be overrun, and he immediately orders them to make a break for the woods behind them. To cover their retreat, the soldier leaps up and rushes to a burning tank destroyer, hopping atop it and manning the .50 caliber machine gun, standing alone against a horde of oncoming Germans. Just 2 years earlier, Ali Murphy found himself being rejected for military service by first the Army and then the Navy and finally the Marine Corps. The 5-foot 5-inch would-be soldier was too short and underweight, the military doctors all said. Plus, to boot, he was too young, only 16 years old. Yet there was a war on, and the pain of Pearl Harbor was still deeply felt by Murphy and most Americans. Plus, the US had just suffered crushing defeats in the Philippines. Murphy wanted to fight, and he wasn't going to stop trying to enlist until he was allowed to. Faking his birth certificate with the help of his sister, Murphy was finally accepted into the Army on the 30th of June, 1942. Taunted for his short stature, Murphy nonetheless immediately proved a very capable soldier, earning his marksman badge with rifle component bar and expert badge with bayonet component bar. Graduating from basic training, Murphy was sent overseas to the Mediterranean theater, acting as a platoon messenger in Algeria, while the Allies trained for their upcoming assault landings on Sicily. Weeks later, Murphy found himself on a speeding landing assault craft, plowing through the stormy seas with swells several feet high. A freak summer storm had sprung up overnight, preventing the landing of paratroopers meant to strike the German defenders from behind and ease the pressure on the landing sites. The weather was so bad, however, and the sea so violent, that the German commanders relaxed their defenses, thinking no Allied commander would be insane enough to risk amphibious landings in such extreme wind and rain. Yet from out of the gloom and the howling wind, there suddenly came the thunderous booming of battleship batteries, raining death down amongst the German defensive positions. And just behind the fiery onslaught were lines of Allied landing craft, bringing 150,000 soldiers into the soft underbelly of Axis-held Europe. Murphy hit the beach with his men that day, and while on a scouting patrol came across 2 fleeing Italian officers, which he shot and killed. Having survived the violence of the initial landings though, a severe illness sidelined Murphy, and he was forced into a field hospital for a week. Rejoining his unit, he was then sent to Salerno, landing near Battipaglia, where he and 2 other soldiers were ambushed by a German unit. Their withering barrage immediately cut down one of the soldiers, leaving Murphy and another soldier alone against a squad of 5 Germans firing at them from a fortified position. Responding with hand grenades and their own machine gun fire, Murphy and his comrade killed all 5 Germans, sadly too late to save the injured soldier's life. 1 month later, Murphy joined in the assault against the Volturno Line, the southernmost line of German defenses meant to slow down the Allied assault into Italy. There, Murphy and his men repelled a counterattack by 7 German soldiers, killing 3 and taking 4 prisoners. For his leadership and excellence on the battlefield, Murphy received a promotion to sergeant, only to be promoted just 1 month later in January 1944 to staff sergeant, still only 19 years old. Hospitalized with malaria, Murphy was out of action for a week and a half before rejoining his men at the First Battle of Cisterna, a disastrous American defeat that saw the loss of over 700 U.S. Army Rangers. As U.S. forces licked their wounds, Murphy found himself taking shelter in an abandoned farmhouse along with his unit. Suddenly, a German panzer discovered their position, and Murphy crawled out alone on his belly, drawing close enough to destroy the tank with rifle grenades. For his incredible heroism, Murphy was awarded the Bronze Star with V device. Months later, Murphy found himself once more on a landing craft, being tossed around the choppy seas as he sped to shore on the south of France. The Normandy invasion had been successful, and Allied forces from a now defeated Italy would join in the retaking of France by catching the Germans between a northern and southern invasion, squeezing the Nazis back into Germany. Under heavy fire, the landing craft hit the beach, and men rushed forward to destroy the German defenders firing down on them from fortified bunkers. As the invasion force pushed out of the beaches, Murphy and his platoon found themselves picking their way through a beautiful French vineyard, a surreal moment of peace and calm amidst the incredible violence raging all around them. However, the peace was quickly shattered as German infantry opened fire on the Americans, wounding and and killing several. Murphy's squad's machine gunner had been detached from the rest of his unit and desperately in need of some heavy suppressing fire. Murphy braved a storm of bullets to retrieve the weapon and then incredibly rushed back into the fray and began returning fire, killing 2 German soldiers. Suddenly, the German fire slacked off and stopped, and 2 German soldiers left their position inside a house with their hands up, appearing to surrender. Murphy's best friend responded and approached the soldiers, ready to take them prisoner, when suddenly Germans hiding inside the house opened fire, killing him instantly. In a fit of rage, Murphy stormed the house completely alone as the Germans poured fire in his direction. Incredibly, Murphy avoided being hit and, armed with only his rifle, killed 6 Germans, wounded 2, and took 11 prisoner. For his and his men's heroism that day and in the following days, Murphy and his unit received the Presidential Unit Citation. Murphy's seemingly invulnerability, however, came to an end when on the 15th of September 1944, he was wounded by a mortar blast, shrapnel cutting deep into his heel. Just a few weeks later, though, Murphy was back in action and would earn a Silver Star for assaulting a German machine gun position, killing 4 and wounding 3. Just 3 days later, engaging the Germans at Lumay in the Clure River Valley, Murphy and his unit found themselves unable to take a heavily defended hill from their German defenders. Crawling alone forward toward the German position, where he could get a better vantage point, Murphy directed his men and their assault via radio, even while Germans rained machine gun and rifle fire down on him for over an hour. After successfully taking the hill, Murphy earned a bronze oak leaf cluster for his Silver Star and a battlefield commission to second lieutenant. Joining the assault into the heart of France, Murphy and his platoon were ambushed by German snipers on the 26th of October. Picking his way from cover to cover, Murphy managed to make his way right up to the German position, taking 2 of the soldiers prisoner, while suddenly a 3rd sniper shot him in the hip. Spinning on his attacker, Murphy leveled his rifle and put 1 round directly between the sniper's eyes. For his injury, Murphy received his first bronze oak leaf cluster for his Purple Heart, but partial loss of his hip muscle due to the removal of gangrene from the wound forced Murphy out of combat until January. By that time, though, the Allies were pushing the Germans steadily back and out of France. Joining his men at the Colmar Pocket in the Vosges Mountains near central France, Murphy and his men found themselves in the thick of some of the most brutal fighting of the war. Determined to force the Allies back into the sea, a fierce German counterattack broke on the U.S. lines like a storm. Caught out in the open, Murphy called for any fire support available to prevent the Germans overrunning their position. A detachment of M10 tank destroyers responded and immediately began engaging the Germans. However, German fire quickly began eliminating the vehicles one by one. Firing from a hastily prepared defensive position, the blast of a Panzerschreck striking an M10 just feet away rolled over Murphy. Knowing his men would be killed to the last if they remained out in the open, Murphy ordered his men to make a break for the woods behind them. Remaining at his position alone, he fired at the oncoming Germans while also directing artillery fire over the radio. Murphy knew he needed to lay down some heavy suppressing fire if his men were going to have any chance of making it to safety, but he was armed with only his M1 rifle. That's when Murphy spotted the 50 caliber machine gun atop the destroyed M10, and ignoring the flames, smoke, and incoming German fire all around him, Murphy made a mad dash for the burning wreck and crawled atop it, manning the heavy machine gun and laying down a withering barrage of fire at the oncoming Germans. For over an hour, Murphy stayed atop the burning vehicle, returning fire against the Germans and advancing vehicles. The mighty 50 caliber machine gun, nicknamed Ma-Deuce by US forces, belched out high-speed death, shredding even the armor of the German vehicles. Wounded in both legs and finally out of ammunition after over 60 minutes of fighting, Murphy finally left the burning wreck and crawled his way back to his men in the woods behind him. Having killed and wounded 50 Germans and knocking out several German vehicles, Murphy ignored the wounds to his legs and led his men in an assault to repel the German counterattack, pushing the enemy back and securing the US position. On guard against a second counterattack, Murphy refused to be evacuated to a field hospital and remained with his men as his wounds were treated. For his heroism that day, Murphy was awarded the U.S. military's highest decoration, the Medal of Honor, given only in the most extreme cases of gallantry and heroism. His wounds proved to be too great to rejoin the fighting this time, however, and Murphy was moved from the front lines to regimental headquarters to act as an Army liaison officer, a well-deserved rest for an incredible soldier. Audie Murphy would ultimately become one of the most highly decorated soldiers in U.S. history, and even earned several awards and citations from the French and Belgian governments for heroism. Unable to continue service due to his injuries, Audie left the military at the end of the war and began a very successful career as a Hollywood actor, starring in several films featuring his own exploits in combat. Sadly, Murphy would go on to be killed in a plane crash on the 28th of May 1971, though his body would be interred in Arlington National Cemetery, where it remains one of the most visited graves. March 5, 1944. The Burmese Jungle, U.S. Army 849th Engineer Aviation Battalion Camp. "Get back!" yelled 21-year-old Private Herman Perry. He stood in the road brandishing his M1 Garand rifle. Lieutenant Cady ignored the warning and stepped closer. Sweating, sobbing, probably coming off an opium high, Perry was losing it, having a breakdown. He wasn't going to let Cady take him into custody. He wasn't going to do more time at the parasite-infested hellhole known as the Lido Stockade. Despite Perry's erratic behavior, Cady wasn't about to back off. This boy had a smart mouth. He'd been AWOL. He was a troublemaker. He needed to be punished. Besides, there was no way that Perry would shoot. That would be suicidal. Now less than a foot away from Perry, Cady stretched out a hand toward him. Bam! Cady jerked and crumpled to the ground. For a split second, everyone stared in disbelief at the fatally wounded Cady. Then Perry swung his gun around and trained it on the other officers as he backed away down the road. As he neared the trees, he turned and ran, vanishing into the brush. During World War II, the United States segregated its armed forces. Sure, there were a couple of African-American combat units created mainly for political reasons, but the majority of African Americans who served were relegated to menial tasks including cooking, cleaning, and construction. That's how close to 10,000 African Americans ended up being shipped to Burma. These men are stationed there to build what will end up being a boondoggle, a 1,072-mile supply road to run through the Burmese jungle connecting Lido, India to Kunming, China. Some 5,000 white Americans are also sent to work on the Lido Road. However, many of them are officers overseeing the black soldiers. The Burmese jungle is torturous. It's hot, humid, the vegetation's dense, the terrain is rough, it's easy to get malaria or dysentery, and it's hard to avoid the leeches, lice, and mosquitoes. Even worse, sometimes man-eating tigers lurk in the brush, clothes rot, and the food rations are poor. Building the Lido Road is backbreaking, far harder than Perry's North Carolinian childhood of picking cotton in a sharecropping family. The soldiers have mandatory 16-hour shifts. Bulldozers supplied by the Army quickly break down, and the GIs are forced into manual labor. They use hoes and pickaxes to dig the muddy, rocky red soil. Many of the black soldiers work side by side and become friendly with coolies, unskilled native laborers. As a result, the black soldiers pick up bush lingo, Urdu, and Hindi. They trade in the local black markets for moonshine known as jungle juice. Some soldiers, including Perry, seek solace from the grim drudgery of their lives in opium and marijuana. When Cady was attempting to take him into custody, Perry was coming off a 2-day drug bender. After shooting Cady, a panicked Perry runs into the jungle. Oh God, he killed someone! For 3 days, Perry stumbles through the jungle in a daze. Not knowing what to do, he veers back to the Lido Road. He runs into some soldiers from a different unit working on the road. They feed him and pass along messages from his friends in the 849th Battalion. Military police are looking for him. Perry decides to surrender. At nightfall, he stands by a bridge for the Namyong River. Sooner or later, a patrol will come by and he'll turn himself in. While waiting, Perry sits down his rifle. Hearing gunshots somewhere nearby, Perry gets worried the MPs are gunning for him and they'll kill him outright instead of arresting him. Spooked, he slips into the jungle again, accidentally leaving his gun behind. Perry spends several days wandering in the jungle. Luckily, he speaks some bush lingo, which allows him to beg for rice from Naga farmers. The Naga are an ethnic group native to northeastern India and northwestern Burma. Some of the tribes live remotely and stick to traditional practices, including headhunting. For the most part, the British and Americans ignore the Naga as long as they stick to making war on each other and not Westerners. March 18th. Around 2 weeks after he'd killed Cady and fled into the jungle, Perry runs into some British troops. Perry, who's always been a smooth talker, thinks fast and makes up excuses as to why he's alone in the jungle. He's able to charm the Brits into giving him some food rations. It's hard going trekking through the remote Patkai's foothills, but the farther away Perry gets from the army, the better. One day, Perry's hiking up a dense mountain slope when he sees something spine-chilling, a basha, or a temporary shelter often made with bamboo. This basha is decorated with human skulls, to which water buffalo horns have been attached. Perry has stumbled into the head-hunting Naga village of Tumga. Believe it or not, Perry delights the villagers by giving them the remaining canned food rations he got from the British. The Ang, or village chief, invites him to be his honored guest. Perry takes a liking to the chief's 14-year-old daughter. She seems to return his interest. Perry has a new problem. How do you flirt with a girl and impress her warrior father when you don't know the culture or speak the language? The answer is gifts. Perry hikes some 8 miles down the mountain back to the Lido Road. Somehow he manages to get a hold of a load of army goods. Most importantly, he gets an M1 Garand. In Naga culture, tiger pelts and claws are prized. The act of killing a tiger is seen as a virile feat of masculinity. Compared to the clubs and flintlocks the Naga have, with his modern gun, Perry is seen as having the ability to kill many a tiger. The village is impressed. Perry is considered an important man, and the chief allows Perry to marry his daughter. The first few months of Perry's married life are pretty good. He struggles with malaria, but due to his stockpile of army rations, he's rich enough to hire servants to work his fields. Perry spends much of his time hunting monkeys and tigers. He grows fluent in his wife's language. The couple's excited to find out that they're expecting their first child. Many nights, the tribal musicians play flutes and drums while the tribe chants, takes psychoactives, and dances. Meanwhile, the army has offered a 1,000 rupee reward for information leading to Perry's capture. That's upwards of $14,500 in today's money. They assume that he's headed for the city, so they've been searching for him in Calcutta. The legend of Perry is beginning to grow. Warranted or not, he's becoming a folk hero. To the black GIs who stew with the resentment of daily petty racial humiliations, Perry is awesome. Apropos of what actually happened, they see Perry as someone who fought back against the man and won. Eventually, Perry becomes homesick. When he was drafted into the army, he left behind a young daughter and a girlfriend in Washington, D.C. Also, his stockpile of rations is quickly dwindling. He begins to hunger for Western items, especially cigarettes. He hires runners to go down the mountain to trade at the black market in rural towns. Finally, the army finds a clue. In the summer, some 5 months after Perry vanished, a coolie finds the rifle Perry accidentally left behind when he panicked at the bridge. The army realizes they've been searching in the wrong place. They put out feelers in rural towns near where the gun was found. Eventually, a rumor reaches their ears about the chief of Tkumga having a black soldier as a son-in-law. Army brass is incredulous. They never would have expected an unarmed tenderfoot like Perry to survive for so long in the jungle. A runner who had gone to the town of Namyong to get rice quickly comes back to tell Perry that there are men searching for him. Perry leaves his wife in Tumga and goes to Noksa, or a satellite village. July 20th. Captain Walter McMinn and a small posse of MPs, along with hired Naga guides, go on a 3.5-hour hike up the mountain to Tkumga. None of the Americans speak any Naga. They use a picture of Perry and hand signs to communicate. The posse learns that Perry's gone to the Noksa. By the time that the posse huddles outside of the Noksa making a plan, it's twilight. The MPs get a guide to go ask Perry to borrow his gun for a hunt. The ploy works. It's a common request and Perry agrees, which leaves him unarmed. Army snipers sneak through the brush and position themselves around Perry's basha. They have to be careful. It would be diplomatically unwise to accidentally kill any Naga. While eating dinner, Perry sees flickers of light outside. The Naga don't have flashlights. It can only mean Westerners. Perry thinks about trying to sneak into the pitch-black jungle behind the village, but tigers have recently been a problem. He grabs a dao, or short Chinese sword, and lights a bamboo staff to use as a torch. Getting up his nerve, Perry goes outside. McMinn immediately blinds Perry with his flashlight, ordering him not to move. McMinn fires, but misses. Perry takes off, and the soldiers chase him, shooting as they go. Perry seems to vanish into the jungle, escaping the ambush, but then they find his body at the bottom of a hill. Perry's been shot in the chest. Around 10 p.m., McMinn hikes several hours back to Namyong to get a doctor and more soldiers. Even with the extra manpower, it ends up being a 9-hour ordeal to carry the stretcher bearing the 170-pound severely injured Perry down the mountain to reach Lido Road. From there, an ambulance takes Perry to the 73rd Evacuation Hospital at Xingbuyang. Perry spends the next several days recovering. While Perry's hyped up on morphine and other medical drugs, he's frequently interrogated. At first, he denies being Perry, but then finally admits his identity and confesses to shooting Katie. He's coerced into signing a 3-page document that he's told is a statement of what had happened, though Perry thinks some key facts are missing or distorted. Against his better judgment, he notarizes and signs the paperwork. On August 28th, Perry is deemed healthy enough to be transferred to prison. He's sent to the notorious Lido Stockade. the very prison he was trying to evade when he shot Katie in the first place. This is his second stint in the stockade. Several months before the whole shooting incident, Perry had spent hellish months in Lido, convicted for disobeying orders when an officer tried to assign him extra work. Though Perry's sentence for disobedience was 90 days, he'd been forced to serve an extra couple of weeks in the stockade without an explanation. The Army assigns Perry a lawyer, Captain Clayton Oberholzer. Unfortunately for Perry, Oberholzer only has experience as a civilian lawyer and has never handled a felony. The fact that Perry killed Katie is indisputable, but Oberholzer hopes to get the charges reduced from premeditated capital murder to manslaughter, the difference being life in prison versus execution if convicted. Perry is also accused of desertion and willful disobedience. September 4, 1944. Perry's court-martial takes less than 6 hours. Oberholzer fumbles a chance to get the sworn statement Perry made while drugged tossed. He botches explaining that the morning of the murder, a distraught Perry was headed to see Lieutenant Colonel Hyatt, the commander of the camp, who had an open-door policy to chat with the soldiers, white or black. Katie went out of his way to accost Perry with the intent to take him into custody, consciously seeking to prevent him from seeing Hyatt, who might have limited Perry's punishment for going AWOL. When Oberholzer brings up Katie's history of abuse toward black GIs, the tribunal warns him that Katie's character isn't on trial. The vote is unanimous. Perry is dishonorably discharged, must forfeit all pay, and will be hanged by the neck until dead. As part of the Army's due process, the verdict condemning Perry to death must undergo a review by 3 members of the Judge Advocate General's Department in New Delhi. All the way across the world, Perry's mom gets a letter from the Army informing her that her son has been court-martialed, convicted of murder, and is sentenced to hang. Bewildered and frightened, she scraps together some money and hires the best lawyer she can get. Her lawyer submits a brief to the Washington-based office of the Judge Advocate General's Department. The Washington office informs New Delhi that a brief for the Perry case will shortly arrive in the mail. Nearly a month later, on December 15th, the New Delhi office transmits a classified message asking about the brief. It hasn't arrived. It's been lost in the mail. Meanwhile, Perry has been stuck in limbo, imprisoned in Lido Stockade. He spent his time watching and memorizing guard schedules. Then, on December 15th, Perry makes his move. Late at night, he crawls under the rear of his tent. The sleepy soldier standing guard at the entrance to his tent doesn't notice. Perry only has 11 minutes before the next time the guards make a circuit. Using wire cutters he stole while on work detail, he quickly cuts a hole in the prison fence just big enough to wiggle through. Protected by strips of coarse wool cut from his prison-issue blanket, Perry crawls through the drainage ditches filled with barbed wire. After that, he runs through a field at the stockade's edge and disappears into the jungle. Sweet freedom. Perry stops to catch his breath. He's free, but some 80 miles of mountainous jungle separates him from his wife and unborn child. How's he gonna get home? Army brass loses their minds when they realize that Perry has escaped. The Lido Stockade's warden and 8 guards are formally reprimanded for negligence. The Army again puts a 1,000 rupee bounty on Perry's head. They radio broadcast Perry's description in several languages and print wanted posters. By airplane, they drop some posters on the village of Tkumga. The illiterate Naga villagers collect them, impressed that pictures of the chief's son-in-law are falling from the heavens. MPs begin stopping black soldiers at random based on the chances that they might be helping Perry. Whenever they can, many black soldiers tear up the wanted posters. They enjoy swapping tales and rumors of the Jungle King. The law brief in defense of Perry finally reaches New Delhi on December 27th. The advocate judge's review finds some of the Army's actions questionable, but reconfirms the verdict of execution. In the wee hours of January 1st, 1945, Perry is almost caught at an abandoned timber camp by a posse of MPs who had heard rumors of a black soldier hiding there. Luckily for Perry, he's a light sleeper and escapes into the jungle just in time. A bullet barely grazes him. The MPs recover a .45 pistol Perry accidentally left behind. February 19th. 2 black soldiers, Staff Sergeant Toomer and T4 Troxler, are buying liquor in the town of Macomb when Perry suddenly storms the bootlegger's shack. Somehow he's gotten a replacement .45 pistol. He mugs the 2 soldiers of 95 rupees and forces the bootlegger to cook him dinner. Perry asks Toomer and Troxler to do him a favor. He wants them to bring a truck stocked with rations, clothes, a tent, a knife, and ammunition in the next 24 hours. They agree to meet Perry in Macomb the following night. Even though he stole money from them, Toomer and Troxler debate what to do. Ultimately, they decide to tell the Army, mainly out of fear of what could happen to them if the Army found out that they had suppressed information about Perry. They inform Major Earl Owen Cullum, commanding officer of the 159th Military Police Battalion at nearby Chauba Camp. Cullum decides to set up a trap. The soldiers will arrive with the truck and the army will ambush Perry. Toomer and Troxler agree to help as long as the army keeps it a secret that they betrayed the Jungle King. However, Perry has anticipated a trap. A crowd of coolies shows up to meet Toomer and Troxler. The army doesn't see Perry, but even if he's there, they can't shoot without risking a diplomatic incident. Suddenly, from among the crowd, Perry sprints for the truck and hops aboard. He forces Toomer and Troxler to drive away down the road, but there's a snag. A checkpoint's coming up. Perry gets out of the truck to trek through the jungle around the checkpoint. Toomer directs Perry to meet them at a grassy field on the far side. Perry doesn't know that this is the army's plan B. As he reaches the field, MPs fire at Perry, but again he escapes into the jungle. This time he's wounded. A bullet nicked his right foot. He packs it full of moss so it won't get infected, a trick he learned from the Naga. Perry limps through the jungle and hides in a rice paddy. Hours later, he awakes to the barking of German shepherds. The army's caught up to him. Perry escapes yet again. This time, the tip of his nose gets grazed by a bullet. He puts moss on this wound, too. Cullum receives a scolding note from his commanding officer for letting Perry get away. Cullum vows to capture Perry. February 22nd. A desperate Perry hides by the side of the Lido Road. His new plan is to board a truck, hide among the supplies, and hitch a ride over the mountains. When the truck reaches Burma, he'll ditch it and disappear into the jungle. But Perry is unwell. The gunshot on his foot is very painful. Also, he's had to drink river water and has caught dysentery. When Perry tries to hop on the back of a slow-moving truck, he's too weak and falls in the road, dropping yet another 45. The gun skids further away as it hits the ground. Perry realizes that a coolie has witnessed his failed hijack attempt. Spooked, he quickly melts back into the jungle. For the third time, he leaves a gun behind. Cullum starts a mobile posse to hunt Perry. He begins visiting town after town to question locals. He also coordinates with the British and native police forces. He and his fellow posse follow Perry's trail for over 2 weeks. Cullum eventually figures out that Perry's headed in the direction of the town of Namrup. Perry's following the southeastern branch of the Tsang River. It's a long, indirect route to Tunga. However, Perry's probably taking this way because just south of Namrup is considered the gateway to the Naga heartland. Here, Perry would be able to make friends. Chances are some of the Naga tribes speak the same language as Perry's wife. Cullum realizes he has only a few days to catch up with Perry before he vanishes into a remote area again, maybe this time forever. Meanwhile, Perry's been growing weaker by the day from dysentery and malnutrition. He's surviving on stolen sugarcane and begging farmers for rice. Stupidly, Toomer and Troxler mention they're snitching on Perry to a colleague. The army has to evacuate them from Asia over threats of murder from Perry's fans. After a long, rough journey, the posse arrives in Namrup. Cullum receives a tip as to where Perry is. He's staying at a rural farm a few miles away. The posse waits until nightfall before hiking to the farm. Cautiously, the posse fans out and surrounds the farmer's basha. They find 3 Naga tribesmen wearing traditional dhotis sitting by a fire outside of the home. Cullum senses that there's something not quite right. He takes a closer look at the men. He then grabs one of them. It's Perry. He cut his afro and borrowed native clothing hoping that he can pass for Naga by firelight. For the last time, Perry is taken into custody. Under tight security, a sickly Perry is transported to the Chabua stockade and kept in an isolation cell. The army decides not to return him to Lido stockade. They fear a potential racial uprising. Perry's interrogated by MPs who want to know where he got his guns. Perry refuses to snitch. He's sorry over Katie's death, but also says that he would have killed his pursuers if he had a chance. March 15, 1945. A few days after his capture, Perry is woken before dawn and under extremely tight security transported to Lido stockade. Per his last request, Perry is allowed to write a farewell letter to his brother Aaron and given a final cigarette before he's quietly hanged just after 7 a.m. March 17th. Perry's mother receives a notice from the army informing her of her son's death by judicial asphyxiation due to his own misconduct. Despite repeated requests for information, she hasn't heard anything since her lawyer submitted the brief in December. She knows nothing of her son's escapades or anti-hero status. Some months later, a small group of black GIs are on an expedition through the Patkai Mountains to check for survivors of a crashed cargo plane. They hire some Naga guides and end up spending the night at a remote village where one of the guides' relatives lives. As guests, the GI are served a special treat for dessert, canned fruit cocktail. One of the soldiers curiously inquires as to where the cocktail has come from. The next morning, before they leave, the soldiers are taken to the only basha in the village, painted a bright yellow-orange. It turns out to be owned by the chief's teenage daughter. The date is 1945, and the war in the Pacific is not going well for Japan. What started out as a campaign of blistering successes that saw the Japanese Empire spread across Southeast Asia has turned into a fight for its life against the United States. The words of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto just after the raid on Pearl Harbor now ring in every Japanese commander's ears. "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Pushed back across the Pacific and every front, the situation only worsens for Japan, as they now also face growing Russian forces on the eastern borders of their collapsing empire. Each Russian soldier eager for revenge after suffering humiliating defeats in the decades prior to World War II. Yet the Japanese Bushido Code is clear. There can be no surrender, even in the face of certain defeat. But of all the soldiers in the Japanese army, few would embody the Bushido Code more than Hiro Onoda, who would continue waging World War II for 30 years after its end. Born on March 19, 1922, Onoda joined the Japanese Imperial Army when he was 18 years old. Onoda was one of a long line of warriors, able to trace his family's fighting ancestry all the way back to samurai ancestors that took part in the frequent wars that plagued Japan's feudal history. His own father had served in the Japanese cavalry and died in the Second Sino-Japanese War. Showing an aptitude for outside-the-box thinking, Onoda was soon training as an intelligence officer in an elite commando school, the precursor to modern special forces training. The Nakano School trained troops specialized in jungle and guerrilla warfare, sabotage, counterintelligence, and propaganda skills that would come in great use for Onoda in the years to come. In 1942, Japan had seized the Philippines and overthrown the Filipino government, forcing the surrender of their U.S. allies. Just 2 years later, though, Japanese forces were spread thin around the South Pacific, and America, indeed full of terrible resolve, had pushed Japan back on every front. Now they threatened the Philippines themselves, an important strategic position in the war. With its proximity to the South Pacific sea trade lanes, control of the Philippines would allow the U.S. to threaten Japan's oil supplies, and if that happened, then the rest of the Japanese fleet had only months of supplies to fight with. The Philippines must be held at all costs, and so a bloody resistance of the American invasion began. By winter of 1944, though most of the Japanese were forced off the major islands and to the smaller islands that ring the archipelago, on December 26, 1944, Onoda was dispatched to Lubang Island and instructed to engage in a guerrilla warfare campaign against invading U.S. troops. Conventional Japanese military protocol, however, demanded that Japanese troops face the invaders head-on, rather than retreat and fight in an unconventional war from the shadowy jungles the way Onoda had been trained and ordered to do. Upon arriving at the island, Onoda's superior officers refused his previous orders and prevented him from carrying out his objectives, which was to abandon several fortified defensive positions and flee to the jungles before launching a series of surprise attacks against a nearby airfield and pier. Hopelessly outnumbered and overpowered, the Japanese defensive garrison was utterly defeated when American forces landed on February 28, 1945. Seeing that defeat was imminent, Onoda, who was under strict orders not to surrender or take his own life if defeated, ordered 3 other soldiers, Private Yuichi Akatsu, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, and Private First Class Kenshichi Kozuka, to follow him into the jungle and begin a resistance against the American invaders. U.S. forces quickly left the island after eliminating the Japanese garrison, though, and Onoda began to engage in guerrilla raids against local Filipino troops. Noticing a lull in the fighting, though, around October of 1945, and with no way of contacting any other Japanese unit to learn of Japan's surrender, Onoda assumed that the main course of the war had shifted somewhere else, but continued his guerrilla campaign regardless. Onoda and his men laid ambushes for local farmers and engaged in shootouts with police forces in the area, and the U.S., realizing that there was an active Japanese resistance still on the island by troops who had no idea the war was over, began to drop leaflets informing the soldiers of Japan's surrender. Onoda eventually stumbled across one of these leaflets, but immediately assumed it was propaganda, meant to lure him and his men out so they could be captured. His training and propaganda techniques only made Onoda more suspicious of the leaflets, and in his mind, he was but one of several Japanese units still fighting behind enemy lines. Surely Japan had been pushed back, but defeated? Impossible. Toward the end of the year, though, more leaflets were dropped in the jungles of the Philippines, and this time with official surrender orders signed by General Tomoyuki Yamashita of the 14th Army. Onoda carefully scrutinized the orders, but once more his propaganda training kicked in. and he surmised that these were fake too. More so, however, the idea that the entire Japanese army had surrendered seemed ludicrous to Onoda and his men, who firmly believed that Japan would fight until the very last man, just as they were now doing. For 4 more years, the team of guerrillas continued their war against the people of the Philippines, raiding farms for supplies and attacking police forces and farmers. The men sabotaged fishing boats and generally engaged in as much destructive activity as they were capable. Trained to live off the land, Onoda and his men gathered what fruits they could and stole rice, grain, and other foodstuffs from their raids on local farmers, and continued their war with a stash of ammunition and grenades that could see 4 men fight for years to come. In 1949, however, Private Akatsu came to the realization that the war was over and left the unit to live by himself in the jungle for 6 months before surrendering to the Philippine Army on March of 1950. Akatsu let U.S. and Filipino authorities know of the other men still fighting in the jungle, and the U.S. underwent a campaign to track down family members of the other 3 holdouts. Eventually, they obtained family photos and letters from relatives all urging the soldiers to surrender, airdropping the messages across Lubang Island in 1952. Unfortunately, upon discovering the letters and photos, Onoda assumed that the Japanese homeland had fallen and their loved ones were now living under American occupation, and thus forced to write those letters. This belief only filled Onoda and his men with greater resolve to continue resisting. 2 years later, though, Corporal Shimada was shot and killed by a Filipino search party that was looking for the men, intending to arrest them and bring them to trial for the murders they had committed. For another 18 years, Onoda would continue his war alongside Private First Class Kenshichi Kozuka, clashing with police forces and farmers until in 1972, Kozuka would be killed by police while raiding a local village. Onoda was now all alone, and still, he refused to surrender. In 1974, Japanese adventurer Norio Suzuki embarked on a trip around the world. Lieutenant Onoda had become something of a celebrity in Japan at this point, who had become entranced by the soldiers' refusal to surrender. As the highlights of Suzuki's trip, he declared that he wanted to see Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman, in that very order. In February of that same year, Suzuki landed in Lubang Island and managed to track down Onoda, greeting him by saying, "Onoda-san, the Emperor and the people of Japan are worried about you." Suzuki informed the old soldier that the war had been over for decades, yet Onoda still said that he would not surrender until relieved of duty by a superior officer. The Japanese government quickly tracked down Onoda's surviving commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, and flew him to Lubang. On March 9, 1974, and 52 years old, Onoda emerged from the jungle, still dressed in his service uniform and carrying his rifle and service sword, accepting the order from his commanding officer to at last surrender. Later, he would surrender his sword to the President of the Philippines, who granted Onoda a pardon for his many crimes. Upon returning to Japan, Onoda was hailed as a hero, yet Onoda was deeply troubled by the Japan he returned to. He did not believe that Japan should have apologized for the war in Asia, and he was utterly dismayed to discover that the military had been dissolved by the Allies. Uncomfortable with the new liberal Japan, who wanted to distance itself from its warlike past, Onoda became involved with right-wing politics, calling for Japan to return to its former military might and become a world power again. Luckily, nobody paid much attention to Onoda, and unable to accept a peaceful liberal Japan not under the thumb of military, Onoda eventually moved to Brazil in 1975, where he would spend most of his life. Onoda's 30-year war was an incredible, if foolhardy, act of dedication. While initially praised as a national hero and a soldier by the Japanese people and admirers around the world, Onoda's return and troubling penchant for authoritarianism quickly saw him fall out of favor with a population thoroughly sick of war. In the end, Onoda was a relic of the past who couldn't accept the change that had gripped the world after the horrors of World War II, change which valued international cooperation over empire building. The Vietnam War is in full swing, and back home in the USA, hordes of civilians are protesting the US's involvement in what's seen as a pointless war almost every day. The government pushes back against these protests, stating that it's important to cut off communism wherever possible before it spreads like a plague. For 12 men on patrol deep in the jungles of South Vietnam, though, none of this matters. What matters now is their own lives. It's near dusk and the men are cautiously making their way through thick jungle back to their fire base. They're not far now, only 2 or 3 miles away, but are very wary of running into an enemy ambush. The Viet Cong and their North Vietnamese allies have taken to hitting American patrols on the way back, when the men are exhausted after hours fighting in the jungle and being eaten alive by mosquitoes and other creepy crawlies. Suddenly, a rifle opens up, and then a dozen more. The GIs hit the ground and return fire. A quick heads up reveals that no one's been hit. It's hard to see the enemy, but it's getting dark enough that the muzzle blasts reveal each shooter's position. The men must be careful to kill their target without being killed in return. In the midst of the firefight, one of the American soldiers suddenly notices a large hulking figure, which he had assumed was a big bush, stand up and immediately flee across the battlefield. The creature is impressive, clearly at least 7 feet tall, and with a body that's pure muscle. Thick, matted fur, not fur, it's hair, covers the creature's entire body as it crosses the jungle in huge bounding steps. The American is in shock and briefly forgets all about the ongoing firefight. On the other side of the battlefield, there's an alarmed cry from the Viet Cong fighters, and the firing dies off briefly. The enemy soldiers shout a word over and over again, and suddenly one of them fires on the creature. Several American soldiers see the creature get struck by enemy fire, roar, but keep on going. The Viet Cong are in a near full panic now and begin to retreat, allowing the Americans to flee the ambush. The next morning, the American GIs relate their encounter to their commanding officer and ask for permission to investigate the ambush site. Working their way back to the battlefield, the men quickly identified the location of the firefight and where the beast was originally seen. As they searched, they made a grisly discovery. An enemy Viet Cong soldier lays dead, a frozen look of horror still on his face. The body has been mutilated, practically ripped apart, and there's not a single bullet wound on it. This encounter is not new to American forces operating out of Vietnam though, and the locals quickly inform the soldiers that what they're encountering is a creature they have known for generations. The Batutut, Uze, or Noi Zoom, otherwise known as the Jungle People. These creatures have been known by the locals to inhabit the deep jungles of Vietnam and Southeast Asia, exactly the places that have now been turned into battlefields. Initially, American troops quickly make allusions to Bigfoot or Sasquatch of North America. By the time of the Vietnam War, Bigfoot mania was already sweeping the United States. Tracks of a giant biped humanoid had been discovered in Northern California at a construction site a few years ago, and the tales of the elusive Sasquatch had begun to flood the media as witnesses silent for years for fear of ridicule began to come forward with their tales. Experts claim that the creature is a hoax and that no such great ape could possibly still be living in North America without being discovered. And yet, the footprint evidence continues to pour in from all across the nation, and eyewitness accounts along with them. Strangely, the creature seems to not be uniform in size or even appearance across North America, with witnesses in the north and west of the continent describing it as having black or reddish fur, while witnesses in the south of the United States describe it as having light brown to reddish fur. What is intriguing is that the descriptions of the beast, and even the tracks photographed or collected as plaster casts, all seem to fit the general geographic description of the mystery animal. Could all these people be in on one big hoax? These rock apes, though, as the GIs begin to call them, couldn't be more different than the Sasquatch of back home. These mystery apes stand about 6 feet tall, a full foot to 2 feet shorter than the North American Bigfoot, and their fur is brown and black like a Sasquatch but bare in the knees and the soles of the feet, hands, and the face, more akin to an orangutan or a chimpanzee. Behaviorally, they couldn't be further from the North American Bigfoot. While American Sasquatches are widely said to be gentle, even shy creatures who rarely ever act aggressively, these rock apes are highly aggressive and bold creatures, often charging straight at humans who trespass into their territory. With their powerfully muscled bodies, the result of being caught by one of these creatures is perhaps best evidenced by the sorry condition of the Viet Cong fighter the American soldiers in our opening story discovered. Much like Bigfoot, though, the rock apes are said to be active at night or at dusk, which could help to explain why they're so rarely ever seen, and why they've avoided scientific detection. Unlike Bigfoot, though, rock apes are known to travel in pairs, while Bigfoot is rarely ever spotted in a group. With a jungle full of dangers, though, it's perhaps no surprise that rock apes see a need to travel in groups. Sightings of rock apes were surprisingly common throughout fighting in Vietnam by both sides of the conflict. One NVA general became obsessed with capturing a specimen alive and even ordered a hunting party be formed, though most of the soldiers and locals were too terrified of the animal to ever approach one willingly. It would be American soldiers who nicknamed the creature the rock apes for the way that the animals would hurl back rocks thrown at them, and on several occasions even live grenades. Skeptics claimed that American troops were seeing orangutans and misidentifying them in the thick jungle. Except that while orangutans did once inhabit Vietnam, they went extinct there thousands of years ago. Another candidate for the rock ape was the gibbon, which was native to Vietnam and inhabits the area in large numbers. The sheer size disparity between a rock ape standing nearly 6 feet tall and a gibbon which can weigh as much as 20 pounds, though, makes that highly unlikely. The unsettling conclusion may simply be that at least some rock ape sightings were real, and not the result of misidentification. The creatures were at least real enough and spotted often enough that one hill where they were frequently sighted ended up being called Monkey Hill by the Americans. Interestingly, the creatures were never spotted in the jungles near the coastal areas or close to civilization, and instead only in the deepest parts of the Vietnamese jungle. This perhaps explains why the animals were so fearless toward humans. Their extreme isolation in the deepest jungles would have rarely ever brought them into contact with humans, aside from the few villagers living extremely isolated lives. Seeing as prior to the war no sizable human presence had ever entered these jungles for long, it's perhaps not surprising that combatants on both sides might have stumbled across an entirely unknown great ape species. The encounters would continue to pour in throughout the war though, and sometimes with a very large amount of eyewitnesses. One encounter as told by soldiers of the 101st Airborne details an encounter between a troop of rock apes and an entire infantry platoon that was settling into a quick lunch. Apparently, the apes were suddenly spotted breaking clear of the jungle and advancing along a trail on the ridge of Nui Mo Tao, a large hill that would end up being the site of the Battle of Phu Loc. The American infantry immediately thought the figures were Viet Cong and opened fire with M16s, machine guns, and even grenade launchers. The figures quickly fled into the jungle. Unlike a normal animal though, these rock apes appeared to rush through the trees, almost as if waiting for a break in the gunfire to charge the American troops, even stepping out briefly to howl and flash huge fanged teeth at them. The creatures also let loose with howls and barks, much like angry dogs, a behavior that's common to many apes and even attributed to the North American Sasquatch. Eventually, the soldiers realized they were not firing at people and ceased their fire, and as the animals retreated, they searched the area but found no bodies. Another incredible account relates to the story of a full-blown battle between rock apes and American Marines. Taking place on Hill 868 in Quang Nam Province, the battle began with a unit of Marines deep in the jungle radioing back to their HQ that they'd spotted movement in the jungle near their position. The Marines, likely a patrol made up of around 30 men total, were told to hold their position and not give themselves away, simply observe the enemy's movements and radio back. After a few minutes, the Marines nervously radioed back stating that they'd been surrounded by what looked like hairy bipedal humanoid creatures. Likely assuming the creatures were nothing more than the gibbon so common in the area, the Marines were told to simply toss rocks at them in order to scare them away. Upon throwing rocks though, the creatures became enraged and began tossing rocks back at the men. Suddenly, what sounded like a pitched battle was heard over the radio, complete with men yelling, inhuman screams, and the sounds of gunfire. A patrol sent to reinforce the Marine unit discovered a battlefield littered with several corpses of rock apes along with many injured Marines. This account, however, relies entirely on eyewitness testimony, as no evidence of these rock apes was ever recovered. The veracity of this particular tale is in serious question, though given the nature of the fighting in Vietnam, it may come as no surprise that nobody took the time to try and recover a body. Still, such a stunning incident should come with more hard evidence than scattered eyewitness testimony, and for us, we're willing to file this story away as a possible tall tale. Hard evidence for the rock ape wouldn't appear until 1974, a year before the end of the Vietnam War. With both sides reporting the existence of the creature, Professor Va Quy of Vietnam National University decided to lead a North Vietnamese expedition into the jungle to search for it. While he never discovered a real rock ape, he did photograph and make plaster prints of extremely curious tracks. The tracks were said by locals to have been formed by the Batutut, a creature that they'd shared stories of for generations. Curiously, the print, much like many Bigfoot prints, shows features that are strikingly similar to apes, while being much larger than that of any known ape. As had been said of many Bigfoot prints thought to be authentic, if these were hoaxed, then they would have been hoaxed by someone with detailed knowledge of ape physiology. Sightings of the rock ape continue to this day, and though no hard evidence has been gathered, perhaps the best evidence for the existence of these creatures is the sheer amount of reported sightings. Then there's also the fact that these are creatures believed to be real flesh and blood animals by locals, rather than mythical spirits or animals of legend. Skeptics point to a lack of remains or physical evidence as reason to doubt its existence. And yet these are the same skeptics who were also stunned in the early 1990s by the discovery of the Saola, an animal described as an Asian unicorn.
The Saula was spoken of by natives for generations too, and yet science denied its existence until a body was finally found in 1992. Since then, the animal has been officially classified and is considered one of the rarest mammals in the world. Perhaps if a large mammal like the Saula can lurk in the deepest jungles undiscovered for thousands of years, then so too can an equally rare and terrifying beast such as the Vietnamese Yeti, the legendary rock ape.
Arthur Wehrmuth crawled through the mud of the Philippine jungle. He paused to let a squad of Japanese soldiers march past. Once he was in the clear, Wehrmuth continued to stealthily make his way through enemy territory. He spotted a small hill that overlooked an enemy camp. Wehrmuth made his way to the ridgeline and took aim at the Japanese soldiers below, then unleashed a rain of lead from his Thompson submachine gun. The confused soldiers shouted, "How did American troops get behind us?" What they didn't know was that the Americans causing so much chaos and destruction was actually only one man, a man who would later be called the One-Man Army of Bataan. Arthur Wehrmuth was assigned to Company D of the 57th Infantry during World War II. What made this squad unique was that it consisted of mostly Filipino soldiers. A small group of American soldiers, including Wehrmuth, was attached to the 57th Infantry. The squad itself was nicknamed the Filipino Scouts, as their main mission was reconnaissance and infiltration behind enemy lines. Sent to the Philippines in 1941, it didn't take long before Wehrmuth was promoted to the rank of captain of the Filipino Scouts. As the much larger Japanese force pressed forward, Wehrmuth and his men repelled attack after attack. They were heavily outnumbered and outgunned, but with Wehrmuth's leadership they caused numerous setbacks for the Japanese army. In January of 1942, the Japanese launched an offensive against the Allied forces. It seemed that the American and Filipino soldiers would be overrun and the islands would be lost, but Wehrmuth had other plans. He grabbed his Thompson submachine gun, two .45 caliber pistols, and as many grenades as he could carry. He covered his skin in dirt and camouflaged his helmet with foliage. Wehrmuth snuck across enemy lines and hid in the dense jungle. He waited for a Japanese patrol to pass by. Eventually, a heavily armed squad crossed his path. He was so well hidden that one of these soldiers almost stepped on him. The enemy squad was heading toward the Allied lines. Wehrmuth knew that if he stayed with the squad, he would be able to surprise them from behind once they were engaged with the Allied forces. As the last Japanese soldier passed, Wehrmuth stepped to the end of the line and followed the Japanese soldiers as if he were one of their own. They proceeded miles through the dark jungle, the Japanese unaware that Wehrmuth had infiltrated their ranks. When the soldier in front of him made too much noise, Wehrmuth shushed him. The Japanese squad neared the fortified position of the Philippine scouts. Wehrmuth did not want to get caught in the crossfire from his own soldiers, so he decided it was time to get away, but not before causing a little chaos. Wehrmuth purposefully stumbled into the soldier directly in front of him. As he pretended to grab onto the man for support, he handed him a live grenade. Wehrmuth gave the enemy soldier a shove and then dove into the protection of the jungle. The Philippine scouts could hear screams from in front of him. All of a sudden, the grenade went off, taking enemy soldiers with it. More importantly, the explosion gave away the position of the Japanese squad. The Philippine scouts, with the help of Wehrmuth from behind, made quick work of the enemy troops. It was acts of courage and destruction like this that earned Wehrmuth the Japanese title the Ghost of Bataan, a name that he rightfully deserved, as each one of his adventures behind enemy lines got crazier and crazier. Although Wehrmuth was a one-man army and could cause mayhem by himself, he often worked with his close friend and brother-in-arms, Jock. Jock was a massive 6'4", 220-pound Filipino soldier. As they fought together, they quickly became friends who always had each other's backs. Wehrmuth liked working alone, but Jock was adamant he'd go with his captain as backup whenever Wehrmuth volunteered for a dangerous mission. Jock saved Wehrmuth's life on more than one occasion. The most notable time this happened was on a mission to uncover a Japanese tap into the Allied communication systems. This mission was so astounding that a portrayal of it would end up in wartime gum packages back in the United States. It had become obvious that the Japanese were able to tap into the Allied communication lines. They seemed to know too much about Allied movements and plans. The commanders asked for volunteers to scout the wires along the front lines to find and disrupt the Japanese wiretap. Wehrmuth was the first to volunteer. Jock immediately stepped forward to join his captain. They set out together to locate and dismantle the deadly problem. The two men made their way through the damp jungle. They had to dodge poisonous snakes, deadly spiders, and the watchful eyes of Japanese snipers. They searched and searched for the wiretap, but came up empty-handed. Wehrmuth and Jock started to make their way back to the Allied defensive position. On their return journey, Wehrmuth got tangled in what seemed like a vine at first. He tripped and landed in the mud. As he went to cut the vine, he noticed that it wasn't a vine at all. It was a wire. Wehrmuth and Jock followed the wire. Suddenly, Wehrmuth fell into a camouflage ditch, landing directly on top of a shocked Japanese soldier who was tapped into Allied transmissions. Wehrmuth pushed off the enemy soldier and drew his pistol like a cowboy in an old Western movie. He fired and killed the Japanese soldier, who was too slow to draw. Wehrmuth slowly made his way to the recording equipment to get a better look at how the Japanese had tapped into the Allied communication system. He was so fascinated by the technology that he did not notice two other Japanese soldiers who had crept up on him from behind. The sound of a branch snapping behind him caught his attention. Wehrmuth spun around, but this time he drew his gun too slowly. One of the Japanese soldiers plunged a bayonet into his arm. The rusty metal scraped along his bone and pinned him to a wall. Wehrmuth knew he was in big trouble. There was only one person who could save him. He called out for Jock. "Japanese! 2 more down here!" he yelled. Jock raced to where his captain had fallen into the ditch. Without hesitating, Jock jumped into the hole. He landed hard on the ground below. When Jock looked up, Wehrmuth was struggling in hand-to-hand combat with the Japanese soldiers. Jock pushed off the ground and launched his huge body toward the assailants. He used the butt of his rifle to bludgeon one enemy unconscious. Jock next turned to the second enemy. He shoved him away from Wehrmuth and shot the remaining Japanese soldier. After the threat had been dealt with, Jock ran over to Wehrmuth to tend to his wounds. His captain had nearly passed out from the pain in his arm and loss of blood. Jock carefully removed the bayonet and bandaged the wound. He threw Wehrmuth across his soldiers and carried him back to the safety of the Allied base. If it weren't for Jock, the one-man army of Bataan might have died in that Japanese ditch. This story and the exploits of Wehrmuth made it back to the US. He was seen as a living war hero. The successful mission of finding and dismantling the Japanese wiretap by Wehrmuth and Jock made headlines. It was so well known that a drawing of the mission was placed in the wrappers of wartime gum to help fund the war effort. Wehrmuth spent a lot of time in and out of the hospital. He would get patched up, and even before the doctor gave him the all-clear, he would ask to be sent back to his squad. His next exploit was so insane, you won't believe how he managed to get out of it alive. Allied headquarters had determined that the only way to disrupt the Japanese advance was to destroy a bridge that allowed them easy access into the area surrounding Manila. There was only one bridge in the area, but it was deep behind enemy lines. Someone needed to sneak far into Japanese-held territory and blow up the bridge, otherwise Allied forces would quickly be overwhelmed. Arthur Wehrmuth volunteered for the job. He set out just before dawn when the sun was low in the sky. Most of the Japanese soldiers were still asleep at the time. Wehrmuth carried the 2 5-gallon drums of gasoline with him to create a distraction before he blew the bridge up. He made his way into the town of Calagiman, which is where the bridge was located. He stuck to the shadows of alleyways to keep out of the sight of enemy snipers and guards. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers inhabited the town. It was a main hub for transporting supplies. The plan was that once Wehrmuth set fire to the town, the Allied artillery would unleash a barrage of shells on Calagiman. This would serve as a distraction so that Wehrmuth could make his way to the bridge and detonate the TNT to destroy it. He snuck to the far end of the town and began spraying gasoline onto the walls of the thatched roof buildings. He struck a match, set the buildings ablaze, and waited for the chaos to ensue. Japanese soldiers ran out of the burning buildings on fire and screaming. They rolled on the dirt ground to put out the flames as artillery shells began falling from the sky. Wehrmuth made his way to the bridge. He tried his best to stay in the shadows, but he was running out of time. He made a break for the bridge, running up one of the main streets. Wehrmuth was spotted by the enemy soldiers, who began shooting at him. He dodged fire in the streets, ducked under the flying bullets, and dove for cover. He caught his breath and began running toward the bridge again. He was almost there when a stray bullet ripped through his leg. The pain was immense, but Wehrmuth ignored it and sprinted to his target. He placed the charges while providing his own cover using his Thompson submachine gun. He blew up the bridge successfully and disappeared into the jungle. Upon returning to the Allied headquarters, he was debriefed and sent to the hospital where the bullet was removed from his calf. This was when Wehrmuth received his first of several Purple Hearts. After the surgery, Wehrmuth had no choice but to wait in the hospital until his leg healed. However, as soon as he felt strong enough, he discharged himself and returned to the front lines to join his squad. He continued to lead his men with bravery until March of 1942, when Wehrmuth and his Philippine scouts were ordered to recapture Mount Bukat from the Japanese. This was a suicide mission, but Wehrmuth was not going to disobey orders, and he would do everything he could to take the high ground. It would be an uphill battle that would nearly cost the one-man army of Bataan his life. As the squad moved up through the jungle, they were ambushed. One of the enemy soldiers rushed toward Wehrmuth, trying to stab him with a bayonet. Wehrmuth dodged the attack and wrestled the Japanese soldier to the ground. He pulled his knife and plunged it into the enemy. The Philippine scouts fought off ambush after ambush, losing men in the process. They dealt heavy losses to the Japanese forces as they pushed forward, but the cost was great. As they fought up the mountain, bullets ripped through the jungle trees and into the squad. There was a Japanese machine gun dug in across a stream. There was no way for Wehrmuth and the Philippine scouts to move forward without destroying the machine gun first. Wehrmuth mustered his bravery and led the squad in a daring counterattack. He pulled the safety ring out of a grenade and tossed it at the machine gunner. As the grenade left his hand, Wehrmuth was struck in the chest by a bullet. The bullet chipped a rib before passing through his lung. Members of his squad grabbed their captain and pulled him to safety. They retreated back to base to get Wehrmuth to a hospital. This wound was the worst one yet. The doctors told Wehrmuth he was done fighting and needed to stay in the hospital. But Wehrmuth knew his brothers were still out there trying to take the high ground. He would not abandon them. Wehrmuth was in the hospital for about a week until he could wait no longer. Against doctors' orders and with pus oozing out of his wound, he made his way back to the Philippine scouts, but it was too late. The Japanese forces were pushing the squad back. Wehrmuth was too weak to sneak behind enemy lines and ambush them like he had done so many times before. He called for a retreat. As the squad made their way back down the mountain, Wehrmuth slipped and tumbled down a ravine, slamming his head on a jagged rock below. He was knocked unconscious and had to be carried back to the hospital by his squad mates. This would be the end of the reign of the one-man army of Bataan. While in the hospital, the Japanese defeated the Allied forces in the area and took all who remained captive. But his fight to survive was not yet over. Wehrmuth was so wounded that he was unable to be sent into the Bataan Death March, where around 70,000 American and Filipino prisoners of war were marched 70 miles to a POW camp. Thousands of soldiers were forced on the trek and died en route to the prison. Once he recovered, Wehrmuth was sent to work on building a runway for Japanese aircraft to land. He and the other men working on the project sabotaged it so the runway buckled under the weight of landing bombers and damaged them. He was then put on the Hell ship, or Yokumaru, as one of 1,620 prisoners. This ship was bombed on December 15, 1944 by aircraft from the USS Hornet. The American ship thought the Oryoku Maru was carrying enemy troops, not prisoners of war. The mistake cost the lives of several hundred POWs, but Wehrmuth survived this ordeal as well. Eventually, Wehrmuth was imprisoned in Mukden, Korea, where his prison camp was finally liberated by Soviet forces in August 1945. When he was returned to the American military, he weighed almost 80 pounds lighter than at the beginning of the war. Wehrmuth was finally going home, where he would receive the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions in the Philippines. He had become a household name in the United States as a war hero, affectionately called the one-man army of Bataan by newspapers and civilians alike. Arthur Wehrmuth was credited with over 116 kills, received the Silver Star, and 3 Purple Heart medals. Modern Western civilization can trace its roots to ancient Greece, with the foundations for military and government systems drawn from 2 of the most legendary city-states to ever exist, Athens and Sparta. Athens would inspire Western civilization to rule fairly and espouse democratic ideals, while Sparta would form the backbone of military traditions meant to defend that democracy. But what was life really like in ancient Sparta? Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographic Show. Today we're asking, what was life like for a Spartan warrior? Spartan society was, well, Spartan. It was a civilization that eschewed luxury and comfort in favor for discipline, precision, and obedience. Its men and women were wholly dedicated to the Spartan military, with almost the entirety of their efforts spent every day in supporting or strengthening Sparta's ability to wage war. Spartan citizens weren't even allowed to engage in trading, and coins were outlawed. Every free citizen was equal. There was no gender or wealth gap, as engaging in trade or even making clothing and farming was seen as work only fit for slaves to do. There was no 1% as there was no interest in amassing wealth. Sadly, there was also little interest in the arts, science, or philosophy, unless it served the military. A Spartan soldier's life began at birth, with the child inspected and discarded if found to be physically or mentally handicapped in any way. When a child reached age 5, they would be inspected once more and killed if found to be too unhealthy. Sparta had no room for the weak. At age 7, male children were taken to a local agoge, a sort of military academy boot camp. From that moment on, a Spartan child no longer belonged to his parents, but rather to the state as a whole. At the agoge, Spartan children were purposefully underfed and encouraged to steal food, only to be severely beaten if they were caught. But not because stealing was wrong, but because they were in fact caught. This was meant to teach them to be stealthy and crafty, but also to endure hunger, as they may have to in the midst of a long campaign. You didn't have to be caught doing anything wrong in order to earn a beating though, as part of a Spartan child's training in becoming a soldier included routine and random beatings meant to ensure they grew up tough. Living in groups under the tutelage of an older man, boys were encouraged to fight amongst themselves to determine who was the strongest, although they were strictly taught to never fight each other in anger or hold grudges. This too was purely pragmatic rather than philosophical, as it ensured that morale stayed good amongst soldiers fighting side by side. Spartan children were not given bedtime
beds to sleep on, but instead had to make their own from tough reeds pulled from riverbanks by hand, and forget about sheets or blankets. At age 12, they were given only a single item of clothing a year, a red cloak, and would not earn shoes until graduating into military service, going barefoot even in the middle of winter. This would prepare Spartan soldiers for the reality of life on the campaign trail, as Spartans did not carry sleeping cots, tents, or even blankets with them as they marched, sleeping on the ground itself wrapped only in their clothes. At age 12, a Spartan child was put under the tutelage of an older soldier in a sort of mentor relationship. Although many Greeks often made claims about pederasty in Spartan society, this one-on-one relationship was meant to pass on knowledge and experience, as well as build loyalty between soldiers and from the young child to the state. At age 18, a Spartan youth would then be initiated into adulthood through a practice called the Crypteia, a ritual seen as barbaric and brutal by the rest of the civilized world. During the Crypteia, Spartan teenagers formed into small groups and were tasked with murdering a number of slaves. Sometimes blades were provided, other times they were left to fend for themselves and improvise weapons or murder with their bare hands. The teenagers would then look for the largest and strongest of slaves and ambush the slave when unawares. Weak slaves or female slaves were rarely targeted as they were not seen as a great threat, and thus it was the biggest and strongest who were at risk of being murdered. Though participants in a Crypteia could be punished with beatings if caught, the beatings were punishment not for the murder, but for actually being caught. Slaves had no rights or protections, and in fact, every year the ruling Spartan body would declare war on their slaves, so their murder was not seen as a murder, but rather as a casualty in an ongoing war. Considering that Spartans relied completely on their slaves for everything from sewing their clothes to trading with the other city-states, it may seem insane that murder of their own slaves was encouraged and even mandated, but for all their warrior might, Spartans lived in constant fear of their slave population. Outnumbering normal Spartans 7-1, Spartans were all too aware that a revolt could be devastating to the city-state, and in fact, it very nearly ended a Spartan rule around 490 BC when slaves revolted and nearly overthrew the Spartan government. From that day on, Spartans kept a very tight leash on their slaves, and once even put wreaths on the heads of 2,000 of their strongest slaves and promised them their freedom only to lead them away to a temple and slaughter them all. At age 20, Spartans officially became part of the army, but they were not allowed to marry and live together in barracks until the age of 30. During this time, they also competed fiercely with each other for entry into the Spartan Hippeis, a royal guard of honor, of which only 300 of the best warriors would be chosen to accompany the king. Also at age 20, Spartans were voted into one of several public messes, with votes cast by members of those messes. Think of it as pledging to a fraternity the way college students do today, only with far less partying and drinking, as most Spartans did not drink alcohol and were warned against it from childhood. For Spartans, alcohol and any other substance that incapacitated you was seen as building weakness, and slaves would often be forced to get drunk on alcohol and then be publicly humiliated so that Spartan children could see the dangers of drinking. Votes for entry into a mess had to be unanimous, and this would build a strong camaraderie between the members of that mess and ensure cohesiveness in battle. Spartans had until the age of 30 to gain entry into a mess, after which if they still had not gained entry, they would be denied full Spartan citizenship, which means they were not allowed to vote or hold office. Upon joining the army at age 20, Spartans drilled day and night in battle formations. Spartan armies made the use of the dreaded phalanx formation, in which rows of soldiers would be stacked one after the other, with each soldier's shield protecting the right flank of the man next to him. This created an impenetrable wall of bronze bristling with spear points that was nearly impossible to defeat as long as it held its cohesiveness. Yet, as powerful as the phalanx was, if discipline failed for even a second and the army forced an opening, the entire formation would shatter, leaving soldiers vulnerable and exposed. This, in essence, was the entire point of Spartan training. The phalanx must never break, and in fact, Spartan phalanxes hardly ever did. With row after row of soldiers, each Spartan would push his shield into the back of the man in front of him, pushing the entire formation forward and pressing into the enemy. Those on the first 3 or 4 ranks would stab out with their spears or hurl them at the enemy, and if injured or cut down, the man behind him would immediately take their place. A living tank of bronze, leather, and human muscle. The Greek phalanx was a thing to be greatly feared, as the Persians would learn, and few were more formidable than those made up of Spartan men. Spartan society revolved entirely around their military might, and their adult life from ages 7 to 60 was devoted entirely to training and fighting. While not at war, Spartans spent every waking moment training and drilling, honing themselves for future battles. The ancient Greek historian Plutarch commented that for Spartans, war was seen as almost a holiday, saying their bodily exercises were less rigorous during their campaigns, and they were allowed a regimen less rigid. They were the only men in the world for whom war brought a respite in the training for war. Yet brutally overseeing a population of slaves that outnumbered them greatly and routinely rebelled against them, it's perhaps little wonder that Spartans dedicated themselves wholly to fighting. In the end though, this myopic focus on fighting would lead to Spartans influencing the military traditions of the modern Western world, but it would be their hated rivals, Athens, who would truly be the shining beacon of philosophy, science, and democracy that built a brighter future for mankind.
Do you think you've got what it takes to be a soldier? Today we are going to look at the life of soldiers in this episode of the infographic show, American Soldier versus British Soldier. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell button so that you can be part of our notification squad. There are many different types of military service, with the most renowned arguably being the Army. If you join the military, you could also end up working in the other main branches, which are the Air Force, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Coast Guard, or even as a reserve. There are many more things you could do that make you a military man or woman, so to not complicate matters too much, we will discuss the American and British armies today. We'll start with how you get into the Army and what it takes to do so. The American Army is the largest and oldest branch of the US military. It was founded in 1775 to fight the British during the American Revolution. It's now one of the largest and certainly most powerful armies in the world, with a total number of personnel of just under 1 million. The Brits may have been fighting their battles for many centuries, but the British Army was only formally established in 1660. Prior to this, the English Army was the strongest military force in the region we now call the British Isles. Notwithstanding the British Army's successes and how it helped to forge an empire, the present British Army is quite small, with around 112,000 personnel. So how do you become a soldier in one of these armies? In the US, you must be between the ages of 18 and 35, although if your mother or father gives you consent, you can join at the age of 17. You should probably have a high school diploma, although most military websites do say that exceptions can be made, especially if you have passed a general educational development test. They ask you not to have more than 2 dependents, and you must pass a medical exam and physical tests. They also require that you pass the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Test. We looked at example test questions online, and it seems you must know some basic English vocabulary and grammar, as well as have a fairly basic understanding of math, science, and mechanics. Do you know the meaning of the word observe, or where the coolant flows in a car? If you do, you are partway there. Once all that is done with, you can start your 10 weeks of basic combat training, commonly referred to as boot camp. If you want to join the regular British Army, you can do so at the age of 16 without any kind of qualifications. Remember that Brits can leave school at 15 if they don't or can't take A levels. This might be a reason why the BBC reported in 2013 that 39% of new recruits to the British Army have a reading age of 11. On the other hand, to join the Officers Corps, you need some qualifications. The Army states that you can start the application process before you are 16, although if you actually join before the age of 18, you still need your parents' consent. You cannot apply if you are older than 33. The Army recruitment site says even criminal convictions won't stop you getting in, as it states, Army life is a great way to make a fresh start. You'll be given some medical tests and also have to prove you are fit. One such fitness test is to run 1.5 miles in less than 10 minutes 30 seconds, or 12 minutes 45 seconds for females. You'll also have to do 44 push-ups in less than 2 minutes. Females only have to do 21. Once that is done, you will join a 20 to 40 week boot camp to learn basic skills and see what area you might specialize in. Once you are in, what can you expect? In the US Army, you'll receive healthcare, food allowance, housing, and pay. You might also be paid more depending on where you are deployed. Wage depends on your rank, but if you've just started out, you'll get a basic salary of just less than $2,000 a month, as well as housing benefits. After 2 years of service, this goes up, and if you are deployed somewhere like Afghanistan, you can receive extra deployment pay of $250 a month for separation from family, $150 hazard pay, and $225 for being in the line of fire and in imminent danger. British Army newbies during their long training stage will get as much as $24,890 a year. Once you are trained, you'll begin a series of steps from lieutenant to second lieutenant and earn between $33,297 and $42,669 for a number of years. A downside for British troops is that they don't seem to be paid extra for hazards and getting shot at. In fact, according to recent articles in the media, given they often work 16 hours a day, their wage ends up being less than the hourly British minimum wage. In the UK and the US Army, if you stay longer than 5 years, your rank and salary will improve greatly if you are doing a good job. Once you have decades under your belt, you might achieve colonel, and in both armies the pay is good. A US colonel with less than 2 years in the position will receive about $91,000 a year including benefits, while the British colonel just after promotion to the position will receive $109,855 a year. year. Brits receive a total of 6 weeks paid vacation time a year, which includes public holidays, while US soldiers receive 30 days a year providing they worked the full year. They also get public holidays. This amounts to about the same as a British soldier. Retirement benefits are a little confusing as it depends on how long you have been a soldier. In the US, if you work 20 years in the Army, you'll receive 50% of the last pay packet you receive. So if you earn $70,000, you'll get around $35,000 per year for the rest of your life. If you decide to stay on each year, the 50% will go up by 2.5%. In the UK, you can wait until 55 to collect your pension, or also opt to leave the service after 35 years and collect 50% of final pensionable pay. Soldiers can also opt to pay into different pension schemes. A very important matter is life on the job, and certainly if you are working in a dangerous area. The latest statistics according to the US Department of Defense Casualty Report says that the war on terror claimed the lives of 2,350 in and around Afghanistan from 2001 to 2015. 20,092 soldiers were injured. 40 US deaths and 183 wounded followed in later campaigns in the same areas. What the government called freeing Iraq amounted to 4,424 US deaths and 31,954 wounded. Later campaigns in Iraq have claimed hundreds more lives. Far fewer British soldiers lost their lives in the Iraq invasion, with the number reported at 179. Less than 500 were killed in Afghanistan. In fact, The Economist reports that since 1945, a total of 7,186 British soldiers' lives have been lost around the globe. The US number is over 100,000 since the same date. Another thing we should mention is the effect being a soldier might have on the mind. Reports state that US soldiers are 7 times more likely to develop post-traumatic stress disorder than UK soldiers, a condition that has been well documented in books and documentaries. Experts suggest that this is cultural, and certain cultures deal with stress and trauma in different ways. Apparently, the British stiff upper lip plays a part here, and it seems American soldiers express their grief, while the Brits bottle it up or even turn to the bottle. Speaking about British soldiers, after working with them in the Middle East, one American troop is quoted as saying, "Those Brits are a strange old race. They show affection by abusing each other, will think nothing of casually stopping in the middle of a firefight for their brew up, and eat food that I wouldn't give to a dying dog." He also said he'd prefer to fight alongside those troops than any other country's soldiers. The reason, he said, was that when the chips are down and there is no hope left, they just soldier on. This sounds nice and is quoted all over the internet, but we can't confirm the original source or its veracity. The British Army's Special Air Force, aka SAS, began operations in 1941 during the Second World War. The reason for having such a specialized set of soldiers was to get behind enemy lines and attack them from within, or at least destroy what they could while gaining intelligence. It still takes part in operations that involve the United Kingdom, but as it's very much a covert special forces unit, much of what the SAS does is a secret. The Navy SEALs, Sea, Air, and Land Team, was formed much later when President John F. Kennedy established them in 1962 as a clandestine unit which, like the SAS, would take on special missions much of the time in very hostile environments. They also act under a veil of secrecy and are sometimes referred to as America's Secret Warriors. If both these units are so secretive, then how does one get a job with them? Well, with the SAS, there is a small problem to begin with if you are a mere civilian. They won't allow you to apply. So to start with, you must already be in the British Armed Forces or be a soldier in the British Commonwealth. Another way to get in is to join the SAS Reserves, and they do accept civilians. As long as you've passed the reserve training and worked with them at least 18 months, you can apply to work in the SAS proper. To apply for the SAS, you should be between 18 and 32 years of age and be in amazing physical and mental shape. You'll be required to do at least a 3-year stretch. Women can apply, but have so far been excluded from most combat movements. To apply, you must accept that you know the harsh demands expected of you, people have died during training, and that means signing an Army General Administrative Instruction form. You're basically acknowledging you are willing to go through hell. Next comes the medical, the battle fitness test, which will mean running fully kitted or squatted for 1.5 miles in 15 minutes. Apparently 10% of applicants don't even make it past this point. That pace for even an average person in running shoes and shorts isn't too bad. Now you start your real training. To join the Navy SEALs, you need to be a natural born or naturalized American between the ages of 18 and 28, although at 17 you can join if your parents say it's okay. If you want to become an officer, you can be up to the age of 33. The first woman ever started the training in 2017, but dropped out soon after. You'll need to have a clean record, and many background checks will be done. You'll then undergo physical and mental tests, including an eye test to make sure you have under 20/70 vision. As for what shape you must be in, well, you are going to go through hell with the SEALs, so they suggest you follow their Navy Special Warfare Physical Training Guide. This includes lots of long and short swims and runs, lots of interval training, as well as other workouts. As for other strength training, their gym workouts basically tell you you'll have to be as strong as a bull as well as have all the cardio attributes. You'll be screened before you can start training, and that will mean you must show that you can run 1.5 miles in 11 minutes, but not squatted. This also comes after a 500-yard swim in 12.5 minutes, 42 push-ups, 50 sit-ups, and 6 pull-ups, all with a short rest in between. Once you actually start training with the SAS, the first phase lasts 4 weeks. This will test your endurance and ability to navigate through the wilderness, that being a harsh mountain range in Wales. In 2015, a young recruit died during this exercise just half a kilometer from the end. He died at the part nicknamed WWII, standing for Voluntary Withdrawal Valley. 2 other soldiers died that day too, leading to an inquest into the treatment of soldiers. Some of the activities in the mountains included a 15-mile hike to start with. Those that can get through that then have to do a 40-mile hike carrying a 55-pound backpack, a rifle, plus their food and water. They are not allowed to use any established trails, but they do have a map and a compass. After that, they can rest a bit and start the weapons training phase, as well as do parachute training. After that, there is 6 weeks of jungle training, usually in the rainforests of Belize, Borneo, or Brunei. The last phase is called Escape and Evasion, which will mean being forced into some horrible survival scenarios, as well as learning how to handle being interrogated. This will include humiliations and other psychological harassment, as well as being blindfolded, deprived of sleep, given nothing to eat or drink, being put in stress positions, imprisoned in a small cage, and having to listen to loud noises all the time. SAS tough guy turned novelist said physical injuries finish a lot of people off during training, but you need a lot of strength of will to get through the psychological stuff. In 2016, the Washington Times reported that 1 Navy SEAL died in 3 out of the last 4 training classes. One was a drowning, another a suicide, and another a car crash after drinking heavily. The Post states that the 6-month training will include a 7-day stretch of little sleep, self-induced hypothermia, and brutal physical conditioning known as Hell Week. It's Hell Week where most recruits drop out. The training in Colorado starts with 5 weeks of pre-training in class. Get through that and you enter the realm of pain and indignity. The Navy SEALs website doesn't go into specifics, but states that you'll be tested to your limits of fatigue. This will include running through sand, swimming in oceans, sometimes in the middle of the night with your clothes on, rappelling down cliffs or buildings at speed, enduring cold and heat, getting lost and finding ways out, combat training, long-distance underwater dives, weapons and explosives training, mission planning, tactics training, and more. Hell Week seems to be the worst part. One soldier described it as being designed to put you through 24/7 days of no rest and continual harassment. From his class of 300, only 19 completed the training. In all, it will last 5.5 days and you'll almost continuously be pushed to your limits. You are allowed no more than about 4 hours sleep during the entire training. You'll also have to deal with integration in what's called the survival, evasion, resistance, and escape phase. Former SEAL Brandon Webb said it will involve sacks over your head, being beaten with sticks, and humiliation. It's here, he said, that some people lose their minds. At least after that, you get some classroom time. For 7 weeks, you'll also have a land warfare phase as well as parachute training. If you pass it all, you'll be given the Navy SEAL Trident, but then have to do advanced training. This will include sniper, communications, and free fall parachute training. Once you are done, you'll have way more weapons to use than a regular soldier. In the SAS, this will include a C8 carbine assault rifle, an ultra-compact individual weapon, an M16, an HK MP5 submachine gun, an HK 417 sniper rifle, an AW50 anti-material rifle, handguns, tear gas, canister launchers, stun grenades, rocket launchers, portable anti-personnel mines, grenade launchers, surface-to-air missiles, and many more things it will take too much time to talk about. You'll also, of course, get all the kit, including things like body armor. According to the Navy SEALs website, your regular SEAL on land will carry such things as the Colt Automatic Rifle 15, the M60 machine gun, M203 grenade launchers, a shotgun, an SASR 50 caliber sniper rifle, an M107 anti-material rifle, a Beretta M9 handgun, a 20mm Gatling gun, and AT-4 rockets. Again, these are just some of the most used weapons, as the list is endless.
January 26, 1991. Night. The Iraqi desert. 2 SUVs barrel across the moon-bright desert toward Chris. He crouches low, getting into position. His body shakes from the wild pounding of his heart. He breathes deep and thinks of his 2-year-old daughter. His hand steadies. The vehicles are closer now, 55 yards away, then 40 yards, 30 yards. At 20 yards, he pulls the trigger. A rocket whooshes from the launcher. The first SUV explodes with a heavy bang, thick smoke billowing up. Chris launches a grenade at the second SUV, nailing its hood. Then he pops up and charges toward the vehicles, spraying bullets in case there's anyone still alive in the wreckage. Satisfied that he won't be chased anymore, Chris turns and runs until it feels like his heart is going to burst. For now, he's escaped the enemy. He doesn't know if anyone else in his patrol is alive or dead. His only chance for survival is to walk across the desert and cross into Syria. It was supposed to be a straightforward mission. During build-up to the ground invasion of Iraq, B Squadron of the 22nd SAS is stationed at a forward operating base in Al Juf, Saudi Arabia. 3 8-man patrols, Bravo 10, Bravo 20, and Bravo 30, are to infiltrate deep into Iraqi territory on intelligence gathering missions. The main task of Bravo 2 is to find a good lying-up position and set up an observation post to monitor the main supply route, or MSR, that runs between the town of Hatida and 3 airfields. It's thought that the Iraqi army is moving Scud missile launchers along this route. The patrol is to report on enemy movements via radio or SATCOM. After 10 days, a chopper will resupply them or move them to a new location. Bravo 2 consists of Patrol Commander Sergeant Andy McNabb, Sergeant Vince Phillips, Corporal Chris Ryan, Lance Corporal Dinger Pring, and troops Bob Concilio, Legs Lane, Stan McGowan, and Mark Coburn. On the night of January 22nd, an RAF Chinook drops the soldiers into the Iraqi desert. Unlike the other 2 patrols, Bravo 2 opts to travel on foot instead of bringing vehicles. It's a decision they'll soon regret. The mission gets off to a rough start. The desert's colder than expected. It's hard work moving their heavy equipment. They've misjudged the terrain from poor, outdated maps. Bravo 2 soon realizes that the spot they're in is hot. There's an anti-aircraft encampment less than a quarter of a mile away. Legs, the patrol's radio man, has trouble contacting command on the radio. The day after their insertion, Bravo 2 is compromised when a young goat herder stumbles upon them and then alerts other people. In the afternoon, the patrol finds themselves hunkered down in a wadi, or a dry river channel. From about 219 yards away on a bluff, 2 Iraqi men watch them. It's a tense moment, and then Chris makes a bad mistake. He waves. It's meant to be a disarming gesture, but he waves with his left hand, which is offensive in Arab culture. The men instantly begin firing their weapons. Bravo 2 returns fire and the situation rapidly deteriorates. The Iraqis are quickly joined by a dump truck full of men with AK-47s. As the firefight rages on, the patrol retreats further down the riverbed, struggling under the weight of their heavy haversacks while shooting and trying to evade getting shot. Chris activates his Tactical Rescue Beacon, or TACB, and yells that they're under attack. Andy also activates his TACB. Though their beacons are set to different frequencies to alert both the US and SAS forces, neither gets a response. Bravo 2 ditches their biggest packs so they move faster. Legs leaves behind radio equipment. At the last minute, Chris runs almost 20 yards back to get a hip flask his wife had given him as a present out of his discarded pack. Miraculously, the patrol escapes the Iraqi fighters. They regroup some distance away. Amazingly, no one had been hit, but they lost a lot of their gear. Not sure if their communications have gone through, they decide not to wait for a rescue to show up and head for the Syrian border. As dusk falls, Bravo 2 detours and doubles back through the rough, rocky terrain in case they're being followed. Then they walk south. Periodically, Mark switches on his GPS to get a fix on a satellite. They then check their maps to determine which way to go. After walking for several hours, Stan collapses. He has on thermal underwear and the fast pace has caused him to sweat hard. He's dehydrated. Chris, who's trained as a medic, gives him rehydrate powder mixed into water. Some of the others want to find a safe hiding spot and leave Stan behind, but Chris won't allow it. He cajoles and threatens the semi-conscious Stan into continuing to walk. When they venture near the MSR, fearing discovery, Chris sets an even more punishing walking pace. Stan and Vince keep up with the rest of them. After about an hour, they pause to consult which way to go and discover that the rest of the patrol, Andy, Bob, Mark, Legs, and Dinger, are missing. From higher ground, they pause to look out over the desert floor, but don't see the missing soldiers. Chris turns on his TACB, and to see if by chance Andy has his on, they'd be able to communicate. Unfortunately, there's no answer. The patrol is down to 3 soldiers. Chris, Stan, and Vince walk on, occasionally trying to contact Andy on the TACB. At around 5 a.m., having hiked some 43 miles through the night, they take shelter in a ditch. They take turns sleeping and keeping watch. As the day wears on, it grows colder and begins to snow. After resting, Stan seems better. Chris's feet are beginning to grow blisters due to his rough wool socks. The 3 snuggle together in the muddy, snowy ditch until dark. At night, they set out, trying to navigate toward the border via compass. They walk for hours in the freezing cold. Vince gets belligerent and loses his grip on reality due to hypothermia. Eventually, he falls behind. Chris and Stan briefly retrace their steps, but they can't find him. Chris makes the difficult decision to press on, and Stan agrees. The patrol is now down to 2. After walking for hours, near morning, Chris and Stan cuddle for warmth in a wadi and sip whiskey from Chris's flask. Thankfully, it's a sunny day and they're able to dry out some. Chris eats 2 biscuits, the last of his food. They've lost track of time, but they think it's Saturday, January 26th. Midday, they hear the jingling of bells. Goats. Along with the goats comes the threat of them being discovered again. Chris wants to ambush and kill the herder, but Stan doesn't want to kill a civilian. Against Chris's wishes, Stan steps out of their hiding places and tries to communicate with the herder. Unfortunately, the surprised herder doesn't speak English and they don't speak Arabic. Stan decides to go to the nearby village with the herder. Chris begs him not to go, but Stan's adamant. Chris tells him he'll wait until 6:30 p.m. for Stan to come back. As promised, Chris waits until dusk for Stan to return before checking his compass and walking north. He's walked for about 15 minutes when he sees the lights of an approaching SUV. Thinking that it's Stan, he runs toward the SUV, and that's when he notices a second set of headlights. Stan would never send 2 vehicles. Chris turns and runs from the SUVs, and that's when they begin to chase him across the desert. After Chris destroys the SUVs with his rocket launcher, he continues his trek towards Syria. Now out of water, he keeps thinking that he should reach the Euphrates River soon, but doesn't. Eventually, he sees a small village with crops. Surely they're near the river. Chris stealthily skirts the village as the dogs start barking. At the river, he tries to fill his water bottle, but discovers that the water is shallow over a layer of silt, so he wades out further and ends up getting sucked down by quicksand. Luckily, Chris is able to struggle free. He carefully fills his water bottle, and the water is murky, foul-smelling, but it tastes good. Chris realizes he can't cross the river, it's cold, and the middle current is too strong and unpredictable. He has to go another way. Chris spends the next few nights hiking through the desert, occasionally zigzagging miles out of his way to avoid villages, vehicles, and goat herders. He sips a little whiskey when he needs a pick-me-up. With each step, his blistered feet grow more painful. During the days, he hides in the wadis or culverts and rests. Sometimes he turns on his TACB, but there's never any answer. He consults its map, but has trouble lining up landmarks with it. Chris crosses the MSR again and becomes demoralized by a highway sign, which announces that Al-Qaim is 50 kilometers, which means that the Syrian border is 80 to 90 kilometers away. He thought he was much closer. The lack of water becomes an urgent problem again. Starting to get careless from exhaustion, Chris stumbles into a signal base, but manages to avoid the soldiers, at times crawling and shimmying across the ground. He finds a clear spring and fills his water bottles. Then Chris accidentally wanders into the large compound of a local politician. A huge portrait of Saddam Hussein is painted on one of the buildings. As the day approaches, Chris is deciding where to hide when he realizes that 2 men are headed in his direction. There's no way they won't see him when they pass. Despite his exhaustion, Chris's training takes over. He ambushes the men, stabbing one in the throat with his knife. He wrestles the other man to the ground and, using a judo hold, snaps his neck. He drags the bodies into the tall grass by the riverbank to hide them. Chris takes refuge in a stinky sewer culvert full of rotting trash and feces. He can barely maneuver his stiff fingers to open his water bottle. Finally, he gets it open and takes a sip. The water tastes metallic and seems to burn Chris's mouth. He spits it out and uses his flashlight and compass mirror to check his tongue. Everything looks okay. He tries a second mouthful of water with the same reaction. Clearly, the water's bad. Chris dumps it out, very disappointed. It's been 8 days since he had a proper meal and 2 days since he's run out of water. Chris's feet continuously ache, but he doesn't dare take his boots off because he doesn't know if he'll be able to get them back on. Furthermore, he's lost feeling in the tips of his fingers, and due to the dirt stuck under his fingernails, infection has set in. Chris dozes uncomfortably in the culvert, waiting for dark. At night, Chris is finally able to escape the compound area. He limps toward the town of Krabillah but can't find it. Later, he'd learn that Krabillah was blacked out due to war and he'd gone right past it. Eventually, Chris comes to a big barbed wire fence. Finally, is this the border? He manages to cross it with only minor injuries and staggers on. Suddenly, there's a blinding light and Chris wakes up sometime later. He drags himself to his feet and keeps going. He has several random blackouts. Chris sees a dwelling in the distance and makes for it. He turns on his TACB. If need be, he'll kill someone for water. The goat herd family, although surprised and rather suspicious, helps Chris. He manages to ask where he is and they can confirm that he's in Syria. They give him water, sweet tea, and flatbread, but he can't swallow it. For the first time in days, he takes off his boots. His feet are rotting, the toenails falling off. An older woman washes his feet. For a while, he's able to lay by a fire, warming his feet and letting them breathe. Through sounds and sign language, Chris communicates that he wants to go to the police. He gives the family a gold coin for their help. That actually makes things grow tense. They want more money and threaten him with an ancient rifle, but he mimes that he's out of money. The young man is aggressive about taking Chris to town, so Chris carefully eases his feet back into his boots, and he and the young man stand on the side of the MSR and hitch a ride. The camel farmer driver who picks them up speaks a little English. Chris lies to him, saying that he's a crashed airline pilot. Halfway through the ride, the driver kicks the young man out and sends him back home. Chris starts to worry. In the tiny town, they stop for gas. The farmer gets belligerent. Chris tries to bargain with him. The farmer whips up a crowd of people. Chased by a mob, Chris runs into a police station. The police take away his kit and open it. It's a tense moment when they find his .203 automatic rifle grenade launcher. Luckily, an official who speaks English shows up and asks for information. Chris provides his correct name and birth date, but lies about his regiment and repeats the crashed pilot story. Strip-searched, blindfolded, and 2 wild car rides later, Chris ends up in Damascus. He's delivered to the head of the Mukhabarat, the Syrian secret police. The secret police allow him to finally get properly cleaned up. For the first time in several days, Chris sees himself in a mirror. He's gaunt. He's dropped from 176 to 140 pounds, losing 36 pounds in 10 days. Though the authorities provide him with a feast, he can't eat. He can only drink water. Per Chris's request, they take him to the British Embassy. He's questioned by embassy brass and writes down his whole story. They work out the route he took, and chances are the spring he drank from was contaminated with nuclear effluent. After a few days of government red tape, Chris flies into a base in Cyprus. From there, he ends up in Riyadh, where he's interviewed multiple times by the brigadier and colonel in command of the special forces. The rest of Chris's patrol is still missing. No one knows what happened to them. The other patrols, Bravo 1 and Bravo 3, had declared their areas too dangerous upon arrival and had been extracted shortly thereafter. As it turns out, legs had been given the wrong radio frequencies, and the base only received 3 garbled messages on January 24th. The Army waited 2 days before mounting a search, which had to be aborted due to bad weather. Another search was mounted on the 27th with a focus on the most likely escape route, but they didn't find the patrol. A third search was also aborted, this time due to an ill pilot. On February 24th, the ground war launched and was over in 5 days. As it turns out, 5 members of Bravo 2, Stan, Dinger, Mark, and Andy, were separately taken as POWs, ultimately ending up in the same prison. Eventually, they were handed over to the Red Crescent and released after the war. Legs died from hypothermia while trying to cross the Euphrates. Bob died after being caught in a firefight, and Vince died of exposure in the desert. The patrol originally broke into 2 because Andy heard a jet and stopped to use his TACB. Bob, Legs, Mike, and Dinger had been behind Andy, so they stopped with him. After trying to contact the jet, the men saw movement ahead and thought it was an Iraqi patrol, so they stayed put until the patrol moved on, and by that time, Chris, Vince, and Stan had vanished. Chris physically recovered in about 6 weeks. The dentist had to remove some loose teeth, and Chris's gums had receded due to malnutrition. He also had a blood disorder from drinking dirty water and a high level of enzymes in his liver produced in reaction to the nuclear effluents. Thankfully, he didn't have radiation poisoning. It took Chris much longer to overcome the recurrent nightmares and psychological scars the mission caused. In all, he walked just under 200 miles in 10 days. It's D-Day, World War II, and Canada has joined the international struggle to politely ask Hitler to stop being a mass-murdering Nazi dickhead by sending her soldiers to kill as many Nazis as they can. Amongst the men charging the beaches of France that day is one Canadian infantryman serving with the Régiment de la Chaudière, Leo Major. In his early 20s, Major joined the Canadian military years earlier in a bid to prove to his estranged father that he was someone to be proud of. Major would soon prove that, as he single-handedly helped put a considerable dent in the rapidly shrinking global supply of Nazis. Major manages to make it off the landing beach intact, while many around him are felled by German artillery and machine gun fire. Making his way past the bunkers guarding the beachhead, he stumbles across a German communications team working from the back of an armored truck. A proper Canadian through and through, Major proceeds to politely introduce himself to the Nazi soldiers with his bullets. Moments later, several dead Nazis are all that remains of the communications team, and Major has managed to single-handedly secure an incredible intelligence victory for the Allies. The armored truck is loaded down with German radios and code books, a veritable treasure trove that will allow the Allies to monitor German radio broadcasts for weeks to come. Days later, the Germans make a compelling counter-argument for the Allies to please leave Europe, sending huge formations of tanks and infantry against the Normandy beaches. The Allies sternly refuse the invitation to leave Europe in Nazi hands, and Major soon finds himself going up against a squad of elite Nazi Schutzstaffel, the feared SS. In a fierce firefight, Major and the men of his unit managed to destroy the SS, but not before one of the men threw a phosphorus grenade, which exploded and coated parts of Major's face with burning phosphorus. Rushed to a field hospital, Major suffered some burns to his face, but tragically, he also suffered the loss of his left eye, which the phosphorus had rendered blind. The medical officer in charge informed Major that his part in the war was done, and that he would soon be returned home. Major, however, had different plans. He marched straight to his commanding officer and demanded that he be allowed to remain, pointing out very obviously that he in fact had been born with 2 eyes, because God had seen fit to give him a spare just for this very reason. After proving that a man really only needed 1 eye to look down the barrel of a rifle or into a scope and kill Nazis, Major was allowed to stay. From then on, he would wear a trademark eye patch and begin referring to himself as a pirate, which, if you lose an eye killing 4 members of the most elite Nazi warriors, you totally get to do. From this moment on, Leo Major would become a bona fide Nazi-eradicating pirate sniper, and we double dog dare you to tell us of a more awesome job title in history. Canada's pirate sniper would fight across France, gradually helping the Allies push back the Nazis and liberating town after town. A year later, as Major joined Canadian forces fighting in the Netherlands, he was sent to scout alone for a patrol of fresh recruits who it was feared had gotten lost. Making his way to a small Dutch town in freezing cold rain, Major spotted 2 German soldiers walking along a dike and immediately took one prisoner, using him as bait to try to capture the other. The second soldier, however, possibly because he believed a real-life pirate had just time-traveled to the present and now demanded his surrender, panicked and tried to go for his weapon, forcing Major to shoot him dead. By now, the Allies had learned that Germans made some of the finest soldiers in the world because they were really good at listening to orders. So Major made his way to the unit's command post with his prisoner in tow and captured the unit's commanding officer. Major ordered the German to surrender his unit, and because if you yell at a Nazi loud enough with an authoritative voice, they pretty much do what you tell them to do, the majority of the German unit surrendered. 3 men, however, raised objection to being captured by a single, possibly time-traveling Canadian pirate, and Major silenced those objections by killing them dead. Marching his nearly 100 prisoners back to Allied lines, nearby Waffen-SS unit saw an entire unit being held prisoner by a single man and opened fire. Major, however, considered this nothing more than a rude interruption of his afternoon stroll and ignored the SS troops, though the SS managed to kill 7 of their own and injure several others. Upon returning back to friendly lines, Major was chosen to receive the Distinguished Conduct Medal, the oldest British medal for gallantry, and second only to the Victoria Cross. Major, however, refused the medal, as if he accepted it, then it would be British General Bernard Montgomery who pinned it on his chest. And in Major's view, Montgomery was a puffed-up blowhard interested only in his own glory. Given the fact that Montgomery had just sacrificed the lives of thousands of Allied paratroopers in the disastrous Operation Market Garden 2 months prior, Major had a rather good point. When a secret Nazi program to travel back in time to stop the first pirate from being born, so that Major would never exist, failed to stop his rampage across Europe, it would be a mine that nearly knocked Canada's pirate sniper out of the fight for good. In February 1945, Major was assisting a military chaplain load German corpses from a burned-out Tiger tank into an armored personnel carrier. The chaplain and the driver then sealed themselves in the front compartment, while Major rode in the back with the dead. Minutes later, the APC ran over an anti-tank mine, and later Major would recall that he remembered only hearing a loud blast and the feeling of being thrown up into the air and coming down hard on his back. He would awake later to 2 medical officers doing their best to treat the wounds across Major's body, which had very suddenly developed an allergic reaction to landmine explosions. Drifting into consciousness, the first thing Major asked was if the chaplain was okay, though the medics ignored the question. The chaplain and the driver had both been killed in the blast. Major was rushed to a hospital, the truck having to stop every 15 minutes so that the medics could administer a fresh morphine injection for the terrible pain in his back. Drifting in and out of consciousness, Major eventually was made stable, though the doctors had terrible news for him. He had broken his back in 3 places. He had also shattered 4 ribs and both ankles. The war was over for Leo Major. The Nazis had at last eliminated their pirate sniper scourge. Or that's what would have happened if Major hadn't sought out a second opinion on his injuries from himself. A week later, Major fled the military hospital, and we have to remind you here that he did this with a back broken in 3 places, 4 shattered ribs, and while fleeing on 2 broken ankles. If the military was going to be stupid enough to send him home for something as measly as a debilitating, crippling injury, then he would just have to get away from the military for a while. Hitching a ride to the Dutch town of Nijmegen, Major stayed with a family he had met while previously passing through the area. The family gladly took him in, and Major informed his broken body that it had exactly 30 days to fix itself before Major would return to the business of killing Nazis. Major would end up only giving his shattered bones 28 days to heal though, as everyone knew that the war would be winding down soon and there'd be no more Nazis to crush, at least not until 2018. Major returned to his unit, and luckily for the Allies, his commander decided that it would be best not to punish the man who had single-handedly captured almost 100 Nazis just for going AWOL so he could avoid being sent home. A month later, Major would repeat this incredible feat, though in a far more spectacular fashion. When asking for volunteers for a dangerous recon mission, Major and his best friend Corporal Willy Arsenault both stepped forward. They would be tasked with reconning the Dutch city of Zwolle, which was currently under the control of Nazis. Their mission was to discover the number of German defenders and then contact the Dutch resistance, so that later a full assault could be launched on the town. After arriving at Zwolle, Major and Arsenault decided that a full-blown battle would devastate the beautiful little town, and so instead, they chose the next rational course of action: simply capture the entire town by themselves. Defended by well over 100 Germans, the duo snuck into the town with the same trick in mind that Major had used earlier in the war. Simply capture the commanding officer and order the Germans to surrender, then shoot any that decline. Unfortunately, Arsenault gave away the two's position and a firefight erupted, during which Arsenault was killed. This proved to be a slight mistake for the Germans, as watching his best friend get gunned down drove Major to go all Super Saiyan and murder the living crap out of 2 of the Germans before the other dozen fled for their lives. Still, Major persisted with his self-appointed mission, knowing that a full-scale battle would devastate the civilians trapped in the town. Ambushing a German officer, Major told the man that Canadian artillery would begin firing on the town at 6 a.m., causing untold casualties amongst the Germans and civilians alike. Believing that they were facing insurmountable odds, the Germans agreed that holding the town would be foolish, and so Major returned his weapon to him and let him leave unharmed, hoping that the officer would warn the rest of the Germans about the terrible bombardment they would soon be facing. Then Major decided to fool the rest of the Germans into believing that the town was under full-scale attack by Canadian forces, and thus he ran across the town like a madman, firing his submachine gun and throwing grenades, making such a racket that the Germans were fooled into believing the Canadians were attacking. As he ran across the town raising hell, Major would regularly run into groups of German soldiers, and 10 times throughout the night, he captured groups of up to 10 men and ran them back to the Canadian troops waiting outside the town. After handing over each batch of prisoners, Major simply rushed back into the town to keep waging World War II all by himself and do it all over again. Eventually, he discovered the Gestapo HQ and set the building on fire. When he then discovered the SS headquarters by accident, he got into a close-quarters firefight that saw 4 Nazis dead and the other 4 flee for their lives. By 4:30 a.m., all the German soldiers in the town had ran for their lives, and Major had successfully captured an entire city by himself. For this feat, Major was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal, which he accepted this time. Sadly for Major, World War II was soon over, and he returned to civilian life to work as a pipe fitter. Just 5 years later, though, the Korean War broke out, and while it wouldn't be the same as killing Nazis, Major decided that killing communists would simply have to do. He volunteered for service and he joined a scout and sniper platoon. A few years later, ceasefire talks were planned between both sides. Knowing that a ceasefire would lock each side's forces into their current positions, both sides attempted to capture strategic positions they could hold onto and reinforce during the ceasefire. In one corner of the war, American troops held a spot known as Hill 355, a commanding position which allowed whichever side that held it to control over 20 miles of terrain around it. The Chinese decided that they wanted that hill for themselves and sent 40,000 men against the US's 3rd Infantry. After 2 days of fighting, the Americans were forced to retreat, and after a failed counterattack, the hill remained in Chinese hands. To make matters worse, the Chinese army had also taken up position on Hill 227, near Hill 355, which in effect left UN forces nearly surrounded. Major, now in command of his own platoon of scout snipers, was immediately dispatched to shore up Canadian and American defenses. However, deciding that the best defense is a good offense, Major once more chose to creatively interpret his orders and led his men as they snuck into the middle of Chinese positions on Hill 355 in the dead of night. At a signal from Major, the men all opened fire, and the Chinese, confused and panicked at why and how they were being fired at from within their own ranks, fled the hill. An hour later, though, the Chinese regrouped in 2 divisions numbering at a staggering 14,000 men, launched a counterattack. Reinforced with some Canadian and American troops, the UN forces were still hopelessly outnumbered. And yet, the Chinese had failed to take into account the fact that Major was in fact a certified Nazi-murdering pirate sniper. Major's own commanding officers also failed to take that fact into account. And when he was ordered to retreat, Major noted that there was little if any cover for his men if they tried to make a run for it. And thus he declined the order and proceeded to politely request the Chinese get off his hill by killing hundreds of them. Holding against incredible odds for an entire night, Major would go on to earn his 2nd Distinguished Conduct Medal. After the Korean War, Major settled into his civilian life and raised a son to ensure that the pirate bloodline would not end. He would return to the Dutch city of Zwolle regularly and befriend its inhabitants, who thanked him each time for liberating their city and sparing them the horror and suffering of being caught in a full-blown battle. The city would go on to honor him by naming a major road after him. And in 2008, Major would finally be laid to rest at the age of 87. Or at least that's the official story. And we here at the Infographics channel believe that as a possible time-traveling pirate, Major actually left our timeline to find Earths in an alternate dimension where Hitler had won, liberating one timeline after another from the rule of Nazi dickheads.
Today we're pitting the American soldier head-to-head versus the Russian soldier and looking at the different capabilities, training, and equipment that each brings to bear. With tensions starting to heat up between the 2 former Cold War superpower adversaries, what would a showdown between East and West actually look like from the average soldier's perspective, and who would fare best in a war that would surely be more catastrophic than both world wars put together? First though, let's take a look at the background and recent history of both nations' armed forces. Though no longer the juggernaut that threatened Western Europe with its endless hordes of armored battle tanks, Russia still retains a formidable military. Unlike most nations on Earth, and perhaps with its rival America being the only other exception, Russian troops have faced ongoing combat action since the end of World War II, albeit at a much lower intensity than the United States. The largest conflict in modern times that Russia engaged in was the invasion of Afghanistan in December of 1979. Acting in support of a communist Afghan government, the Soviet Union soon found itself in a similar quagmire as the United States in its own invasion decades later. Ultimately a strategic failure, the Soviet Union finally pulled out of the country almost 10 years later in February of 1989. The United States, by comparison, has been involved in high-intensity combat action nearly every decade since the end of World War II. From Korea to Vietnam, Grenada, Iraq, and then the double invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, America has fought wars in nearly every climate and continent on Earth. Ultimately though, it would be the US's own invasion of Afghanistan that would best highlight the key differences in American and Russian combat doctrine and capabilities. When Soviet troops entered Afghanistan, they did so much like America, with overwhelming force spearheaded by columns of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles overwatched by tremendous air support. Also like America, the initial Soviet invasion saw little resistance from the Afghan Mujahideen, who could not hope to match Soviet military power on a one-on-one basis. Much like the United States, Soviet troops had been trained to fight a conventional war against a conventional enemy, NATO, where enemy soldiers were clearly identifiable by their uniforms and battle lines clearly drawn across each side. The Mujahideen would exploit this Soviet war-fighting doctrine by instead fighting a guerrilla or asymmetric war, wherein they would launch lightning raids before retreating into the countryside or melting into the local population, thus denying the Russians a chance to bring their formidable firepower to bear on any discernible enemy. Exactly like America's own war 2 decades later, each element of the Soviet armed forces would come into play, but the bulk of the war effort would be executed by small groups of soldiers. The small unit action nature of both the American and the Russian-Afghan war thus gives us the best comparison point for the 2 nations' infantry forces. So how well exactly did each nation's soldiers perform? Both nations entered the guerrilla war phase of their Afghan campaigns at major disadvantages. Russian and American infantrymen had both trained for decades to face each other on European battlefields, and thus each nation's infantry were primarily trained in mass unit tactics and combined arms warfare, wherein they would work in collusion with other ground, air, and fire support elements. Trained to defeat columns of armored tanks and hordes of enemy infantry, the intimate door-to-door nature of both nations' Afghan war proved a steep learning curve. The very first and greatest weakness exploited by the Afghan Mujahideen was both nations' lack of training and experience in close quarters combat. During the Afghan-Soviet War, Russian infantrymen became notorious for their extremely poor performance once the enemy closed in to within 50 meters, once even breaking and retreating when a token force of Mujahideen surprised a superior Russian force by popping up from sewer tunnels within mere meters of their position. Just a few years into the war, Russia's performance in close quarters was so poor that troops were mostly kept in fortified garrisons and would rarely engage in routine security patrols. American troops would initially face the same challenges, with similar poor performance. While poor Russian performance was due to a variety of reasons, such as low morale, unwilling conscripts forced to fight, and varying quality of training, American troops instead became a casualty of their own superiority. With unmatched air and ground-based fire support, American infantry had become accustomed to hunkering down when engaged and calling in for overwhelming fire support to destroy the enemy, a luxury that Russian troops did not always enjoy. However, faced with a door-to-door war and an enemy that struck from amidst the civilian population, the Americans were forced to forego their fire support advantages and would have to fight soldier to soldier like their Soviet counterparts had 2 decades prior. During the first 2 years of the war, this proved to be a very painful lesson. However, within the first 6 months of the invasion, American basic training and infantryman training programs had already begun to incorporate CQB, or Close Quarters Battle Training. Within years, the United States had completely revamped its training programs and began fielding an infantry force with great expertise in door-to-door urban combat. Though other factors, such as technology and more advanced equipment, would play a role in minimizing US casualties versus their Soviet counterparts, it is American flexibility that would ultimately see them perform far better than the Soviet Union soldiers had decades earlier. Not only did the United States exhibit greater flexibility in its national training structure, but this adaptability has for a long time been a hallmark of American warfighting doctrine. Unlike their Russian counterparts, who were trained to obey orders from very much a top-down command structure, US troops have for a long time been encouraged to act with a degree of autonomy, allowing small unit commanders with on-the-ground situational awareness to make command decisions that a Russian unit would need much higher authority for. This allows American troops to react much more quickly to the chaos of war, and though the US and Russia have thankfully never faced each other in combat, the difference between the two military doctrines was shockingly clear in the first American invasion of Iraq in 1990. Following a rigid, Russian-style top-down command structure, Iraqi forces, who at the time commanded one of the world's largest and most formidable militaries, were utterly decimated by a fast-acting American-led invasion that outpaced Iraqi military leadership's ability to relay orders in a timely manner to troops that needed them. But what about the capabilities of each nation's individual soldier? On a strictly one-on-one comparison, how does each nation's infantryman stack up against the other? The best place to start is by looking at the primary armament of each soldier. Though modernizing to a new battle rifle, the bulk of Russian ground forces still utilize the tried-and-true AK-47. Called the greatest rifle ever made, the AK-47's legendary fame is not without merit. Seeing action in nearly every battlefield around the world since its invention in 1949, the AK-47 has proven reliable in every environmental condition possible. Firing a 7.62mm round at 715 meters per second, the AK-47 has major stopping power and penetration both, and is easily capable of the much vaunted first contact kill, or ability to neutralize an enemy with the first round on target. By comparison, the United States fields the M4 carbine, a rifle that many, even within the US Armed Forces themselves, have for a long time considered inferior to the Russian AK. An evolution of the American M16, it is also a reliable and proven rifle, but suffers from a lower mass bullet as it utilizes the smaller 5.56mm round. While this lighter bullet gives the M4 greater accuracy at greater range than the AK-47, it has been very loudly criticized for lacking in stopping power. In fact, one of the greatest complaints about its performance in the recent Iraq-Afghan war was that it would take multiple hits on target to neutralize an enemy, with the lighter round propelled at a whopping 910 meters per second, often zipping straight through an unarmored opponent and leaving little physical damage behind. This criticism has plagued the M4 nearly since inception, and many American servicemen lament that the one area the US military has always lagged behind their Russian counterparts in is the main battle rifle. Though the American M4 affords greater range and accuracy, in today's urban door-to-door wars, it is the Russian AK-47 that has a clear advantage. Yet history has proven that it is the men and not the weapons that win wars. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Russian forces have suffered from long years of neglect, while American forces have continued to build on their hard-earned battlefield expertise, adding to a rich tradition of proficient warfighters. Yet Russia is a nation that has faced annihilation repeatedly throughout its troubled history at the hands of superior foes, and has emerged battered, bloodied, but triumphant from each challenge. They say war proves mankind doesn't need to invent monsters, as the monsters were inside us all along. Yet sometimes, soldiers report sightings of what can only be described as actual monsters, or in other cases, otherworldly beings. Are these battlefield stresses, or are men whose lives literally depend on remaining alert and aware, seeing things that the rest of us might miss? Do mythological beasts stalk our battlefields? Do curious aliens observe from a distance, making notes on our primal, savage nature? That's what we'll try and figure out today, in this special episode of the infographic show's greatest mysteries, famous wartime paranormal sightings. The first paranormal event on our list comes from World War I and has become a staple of sea monster stories. At the outbreak of the war, the British steamer Iberian was cruising just off the coast of Ireland when it was attacked and sunk by the German submarine U-28. As the U-28's captain, Baron von Forstner, and 7 other crew members watched the ship sink from the sub's conning tower, there was a sudden, large underwater explosion, likely from the ship's boiler detonating. The blast flung debris and men clear out of the water, but as the captain and his men watched incredulously, an animal, about 65 feet long, was flung into the air as well by the force of the explosion. Described as crocodile-like in shape, with pairs of strong front and hind legs adapted for swimming, and a long head that tapered towards the nose, the monster was visible for about 10 to 15 seconds as it was blown out of the water before sinking back into the depths. Skeptics suggest that the story was fabricated by Baron von Forstner, and sadly 6 of the alleged eyewitnesses were all killed during the war. Only the ship's cook survived the war, though he would refuse to comment on the story. The 61 survivors of the Iberian also made no mention of the creature, though with their ship sinking and then exploding in the waves beneath them, they were probably a little busy with the matter of survival at the time of the brief sighting. Outright fabrication by a baron and naval officer, or confirmed sighting of a surviving ancient seafaring sauropod? We might never know, but the resemblance to other sea monsters around the world is uncanny. Our next paranormal sighting comes from the jungles of Africa. Colonel Remy van Lierde was a decorated Belgian pilot who became an ace during World War II after escaping from a German prison camp. In 1959, flying a mission on behalf of the UN during the crisis in the Congo, Lierde spotted a monstrous snake slithering through a clearing in the jungle. Amazed at the size of the snake below him, Lierde brought his chopper low and began a series of passes so he could get a picture of the beast. Successfully snapping one photo, Lierde went on to claim that the snake reared up as the chopper flew low, raising a head the size of a donkey's over 10 feet into the air. Lierd's photograph is unfortunately slightly blurry, though it does show what seems to be an incredibly large snake. Given Lierd's background, it seems unlikely he would go through the trouble of making up a story and then fabricating a fake photo to go along with it. And if that's not enough, in 2016, workers building a dam in Brazil discovered a whopping 33-foot, 882-pound anaconda lurking in caves near the construction site. The discovery of snakes that regularly exceed 26 feet in length lends further credence to Lierd's story and photograph. From war-torn jungle to war-torn jungle, we now move to the skies above Vietnam, where in 1968, C-130 Loadmaster Robert L. Pollock and his flight crew experienced a truly perplexing and troubling event. Flying just off the coast of Vietnam and exhausted after a 20-hour day of back-and-forth flights, ferrying troops and cargo, Pollock was seated in the empty cargo compartment when he noticed movement at the rear of the aircraft. Looking up from the paperwork he was completing, Pollock was stunned to see a whirling gray, cloudy mass forming at the rear right troop door, spinning clockwise and filling the rear of the aircraft within seconds. Fearing a high-pressure fluid leak that was atomizing the fluid and filling the compartment, Pollock used the interphone system to ask the pilot if there were any indications of trouble of any kind, to which the pilot responded, no. As the misty fog filled the compartment, Pollock was joined by the engineer, navigator, co-pilot, and pilot as the mist continued to creep forwards toward them. In an interview, Pollock recalls that when the navigator said, "This is spooky," he felt anger, as up to that point, he was sure that what they were witnessing was some sort of aircraft malfunction and not anything paranormal. Double-checking their instruments, the crew still found no problems with the aircraft. Finally, placing his hand in the mass, Pollock recalls that the strange fog was so thick and opaque that his hand disappeared from sight. Holding onto each other, Pollock and the engineer walked into the mass, still thinking that there was some kind of mechanical failure of the aircraft, and that if they did not find the source soon, it would fill the cockpit and put them in serious jeopardy. Plunging into the mass, the lights in the aircraft disappeared, and the two were forced to feel their way around the cargo bay by touch, keeping in contact with the rest of the flight crew, who called out constantly, inquiring about their well-being. According to Pollock, the strange mist did not burn or sting his eyes, nor make breathing difficult. He also felt no threat from the mass, though as he made his way out of it, he was still fearful of it filling the cockpit and blinding the crew as they tried to land their plane. As if on cue, the fog or mist slowly began to recede, moving straight back to the same door it had apparently entered through, whirling counterclockwise this time, before disappearing into nothingness. Upon landing, Pollock and the rest of his crew never mentioned the incident between each other ever again, Pollock owing the silence on the matter to the fact that they were a veteran combat crew and in the midst of war, surviving anything that did not kill them outright was enough not to worry about it. Our next wartime paranormal entry comes from post-revolution Russia in 1925 and was reported by one of the most credible eyewitnesses one could ask for. General Mikhail Stepanovich Topilsky was on a mission hunting anti-Soviet guerrillas hiding out in the western segment of the Pamir Mountains when his troop came upon a small village that regaled them with stories of ape-like creatures that lived in the mountains. Dismissing the stories as local superstition, the general ordered his men into the mountains where they soon discovered several sets of distinctly human-like tracks in the fresh snow. Making notes of the tracks in his personal journal, General Topilsky and his men pressed on in their mission to find the guerrillas, finally tracking them to a large cave high in the mountains. After the resulting firefight, the general's men took prisoners, and amongst them, a man who told Topilsky of weird ape-man-like creatures that had attacked them with clubs. According to the prisoner, his band had managed to kill one of them, which plummeted down an icefall. The general ordered his men to dig for the creature's corpse, finding it in short order. Per the general's notes, the body belonged to a male creature about 5 foot 5 inches tall, elderly or old, judging by the grayish color of the hair in several places. Though the general did not skin the corpse as he had originally planned to, and instead ordered his men to give it a proper burial, he made detailed notes of the body, noting that the creature was covered in hair, not fur, with large, hairless feet covered in hard, brown skin. One may be forgiven for thinking a bunch of bored soldiers on patrol may make up an exciting story to impress their peers, but would a general in the young Soviet army risk his reputation to fabricate a tall tale? Unfortunately, with no physical evidence, it's up to you to decide. Monsters haunt our dreams, and seemingly too our battlefields. But are soldiers around the world really encountering monsters, or simply unknown biological specimens and strange but perfectly natural phenomenon? Without hard proof, we may never know.
Somewhere down the line, a dog starts barking ferociously. You don't need any more warning than that, as you and the 4 men you're playing chess with immediately rip at the canvas bag at your sides holding your gas masks. In the fury to tear your gas mask over your head and secure it in place, you knock over the worn and beaten chessboard, sending the pieces to the muddy floor. In a few minutes, the dog's barking is muffled. Its owner must have finally fitted a mask to it after putting his own on in a hurry. That dog's lucky. A few months ago, the few dogs on the front lines would be killed by incoming gas attacks. Thanks to their incredibly sensitive noses, these war dogs are capable of sniffing out gas attacks a minute or two before the fog-like haze settles over the front lines. Typically, the Germans blast the front with artillery shells modified to release dangerous gases rather than explode on contact. On days like today, though, when the wind is blowing from east to west and is strong enough, they can release the gas from directly outside their own trenches and have it blow across no man's land. The type of gas that might be delivered varied. Sometimes it's largely harmless tear gas, an irritant that served to suppress the enemy's ability to fight back effectively. This is typically followed by a massive assault across no man's land, though, and the effectiveness of gas masks in filtering the gas, as well as its non-lethal properties, made it less and less appealing as the Great War ground on. Germany would later claim that it begun using chemical weapons in a bid to secure quick victory, and therefore grant the world the mercy of a short war with few casualties. Man's best intentions quickly went awry. Tear gas quickly made way for three deadlier gases: mustard gas, phosgene, and chlorine gas. Chlorine gas could be easily spotted if lookouts were actually paying attention, as it moves across the battlefield like a sickly yellowish-greenish cloud. During day attacks, it gives plenty of warning and allows men to quickly don their protective gas masks. For that reason, the Germans and the Allies quickly take to using gas at night, where it can't be as easily spotted. Phosgene gas is chlorine gas's deadlier older brother. It lacks the distinctive colorization of chlorine gas, making it harder to spot, and even worse, symptoms would only set in a day or two after being poisoned. All the warning you would get was the sudden smell of wet, musty hay, and then a day or two later you'd be drowning in your own fluids. Ironically enough though, the gas you must fear the most is mustard gas. It's the most widely used chemical agent of the war. While chlorine and phosgene gas are deadly and could cause havoc on the body internally, there is a peace about knowing that if you were exposed to them, you'd likely soon die. Mustard gas, though, doesn't come with such a guarantee and is perfectly survivable. Yet breathing it in would scar your lungs for life, leaving you permanently short of breath. The giant blisters it produces on exposed skin are not only plentiful and extremely painful, but can also disfigure a man. And in the poor hygiene conditions of Europe's trench war, these blisters could burst and become infected, leading to a protracted, terribly slow death to infection or amputations. Better to die relatively quickly than linger on in agony. But you don't know what kind of gas the Germans are launching today. You do your best to protect as much of your skin as you can anyway. You scramble, rifle in hand, to a pre-prepared fighting position along the massive trench that has been your home for months. Each man has their own slit in the trench, consisting of a slightly elevated position from where they could comfortably stand and fire at incoming soldiers. As you do your best to sight down the barrel of your rifle, you scan the banks of gas clouds for human figures. Gas attacks of this sort are typically preludes to a massive attack. It's summer and the gas mask is stifling hot. Your eye holes fog up constantly and you have to try to breathe shallow to limit the fogging so you can actually see out of your mask. The gas washing over you terrifies you, and you're afraid to breathe at all now. The smallest compromise in your mask will have you sucking in deadly air. You hope that your charcoal filter will continue to filter properly. The constant humidity of the muggy trenches can seriously compromise the effectiveness of the filters. You yearn to rip the hot, muggy, uncomfortable mask off your face, but you know that to do so would be to invite certain death. Instead, you'll sit and bear it for hours on end, at least until the all clear is called. That's, of course, if the Germans don't attack. And that's when you hear it, the telltale sounds of hundreds of boots pounding the ground in front of you. There's no battle cry, no shouts from officers rallying their men forward. The gas masks of both sides are wearing make such feats impossible. There's only the sudden roaring of hundreds of rifles on both sides, mostly yours, like a freak thunderstorm sprung to life from out of the clear blue sky. Typically, attacks are preempted by massive artillery barrages that can last for a day or longer, and more than once you've had to hunker down for days on end as metal death rained down all around you. This time, though, the Germans have aimed for a surprise attack. Closely following the deadly banks of fogs, they silently released into the strong wind to cover their attack. You fire your rifle at the incoming horde of enemy soldiers. The Germans are too busy crossing no man's land to bother firing back. Everyone knows that the only hope for victory is to cross no man's land and dive into the enemy's trench. And once there, victory becomes a brutal hand-to-hand battle for survival. Prisoners are rarely taken, retreat is impossible. Tally too long in no man's land or try to retreat across it, and the machine guns will find you.
a fact that the Germans are currently discovering. You thank your lucky stars that the machine gunners along your section of trench were quick to don their gas masks and are unaffected by the deadly vapors. Of all the weapons in World War I, the machine gun is the most responsible for the deadly stalemate that runs the length of the European continent, spitting out hundreds of rounds a minute. The only way to silence it is to charge headlong into its withering fire, and yet just as effective as it is on the defense, it's all but useless on the offense, the guns being far too bulky and difficult to carry across no man's land. Thus, the Great War has devolved into suicidal rush after suicidal rush, the machine gun's body count rising by the day. Now, withering machine gun fire from several positions strafes across the German advance. Men fall under its fire by the dozens, and yet incredibly the charge continues. The constant barrage of rifle fire is shockingly inaccurate. No surprise given the difficulty and accuracy firing a rifle while wearing a bulky gas mask, and in the rush across no man's land, it's machine guns that claim most victims. It's absolute lunacy, you think to yourself, to continue charging forward into the teeth of the big guns, even as you see dozens of your fellow soldiers fall before them. Then again, what choice does a charging soldier have? Retreating across no man's land will just leave them as vulnerable as charging across it. Once you're up and over the top, there's only one way to live, and it's forward. The first Germans are coming over the trenches, numbers too great even for the machine guns to overcome. Neither side needs much accuracy now in such close quarters, and the hot, fetid, and poisoned air in the trenches is now filled with acrid gunpowder as well as the deadly gas. The mixture creates a grayish fog that permeates the scene, adding a surrealness to the brutal and often hand-to-hand combat that breaks out across the front. Men stab with bayonets or knives, their rifles largely forgotten and too cumbersome for the close-in fighting. You can't tell time in the thick of the melee, but your lungs are bursting with the exertion of frantic breathing through your gas mask. Fighting in such conditions, both sides can barely manage more than a few minutes of intense combat before falling nearly completely exhausted. Entire sections of trench will unofficially fall under enemy control briefly, both sides simply too tired to keep fighting and desperate for a brief rest. The machine guns took too great a toll on the incoming assault though, and the Germans' numbers are low. You spend the afternoon doing the grim work of killing in close quarters, and the narrow, tight confines of the stretches is all too often the work of a butcher killing men too exhausted to defend themselves anymore. Some will be taken prisoner after surrendering. Most simply won't. You push away the consequences of your actions for now. Those are for a living man to deal with, and right now, there's no guarantee on your life. The battle over, the grim work of removing corpses must be attended to and quickly. The trenches must be prepared for a fresh attack coming at any minute. For now, German and Allied corpses alike are simply stashed into the small cutaways along the trenches as defensive fortifications are fixed and manned, you and the rest of the exhausted survivors preparing for a possible second wave. As the hours pass and night comes through, it becomes clear that there's no stomach in the Germans for another attack. You're grateful. You've also no stomach for more bloodshed today. At last, the all-clear signal is given for the gas, and after half a day struggling to breathe through a mask caked with sweat and blood, you rip the thing off. You thought you'd be careful before taking that first breath, the fear of lingering gas still fresh in your mind, but you're so exhausted that you greedily gulp down the fresh air, and despite the stench of gunpowder, the sickly sweet smell of the dead, and the slightly nauseating tinge of gas, that breath of air is sweeter than any you've ever tasted in your life. The Germans might attack again at night, so you can never truly afford to let your guard down, but whether they do or not, there are basic housekeeping duties to be done that are necessary in the trenches. Disease is already rampant in the muddy, unsanitary conditions of the trenches, and there's little need to aid it along, so you and a detail of soldiers work to move the dead through the network of trenches, connecting yours to those at the rear. Somewhere back there, a graves detail service will separate the German soldiers from the Allied soldiers and give as best a burial as possible. By the time you're done, you're too exhausted to even eat. But your work isn't done yet. Your life depends on two key pieces of equipment, your mask and your rifle. And thus, before you can even think of getting a few hours of much-needed sleep, you set to the task of maintaining both. Your gas mask is relatively easy to maintain, and you check it thoroughly for tears. You dry off the charcoal filter and do your best to keep it free of mud and excess moisture. Your rifle, though, is a different affair and requires a complex breakdown of its components along with a thorough cleaning. Until you arrived at the front, you had no idea just how much of war is spent simply cleaning one's weapon.
They certainly left that detail out of the heroic war stories you grew up listening to. It's also important to tend to your feet, though not an easy feat. As the war has dragged on, one of the greatest sources of casualties is the dreaded trench foot. The trenches of Europe are routinely filled with water from runoff or rain, and your feet are constantly submerged in muddy, fetid water. The water rots away at the flesh, and if you don't take enough care of them, you'll find yourself shipped back to the rear for a double amputation of feet. It's not easy, but you do your best to dry them as often as possible. Exhausted by your post-battle maintenance though, it's finally time to retire for a few hours of sleep. You head into a small slit cut in the back of the trench, not much more than a hole in the earth. That's your personal sleeping place. It's slightly elevated above the floor of the trench, so at least most of the water runs out and down to the trench floor. But while the French and Germans enjoy entire rooms cut into the earth, you don't get much more than this, a simple hole. For you though, it's the height of luxury, and as your heavy eyes close, it's not long before you're fast asleep. It's summer 1943, and the Allied forces have moved to secure the Mediterranean from the Axis powers once and for all. This means one thing: neutralizing Italy, a staunch German ally led by the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, sweeping away the Italian Navy, which performed atrociously against Allied forces. Allied soldiers at last begin to make landfall on Sicily. From captured airfields, American and British bombers could now reach Rome, and an intense bombing campaign begins against Italy's capital. The intent is not so much to damage Italian industry and its warfighting ability, but rather to capitalize on the low morale of Italian troops and citizens and force them to overthrow Mussolini, thus suing for peace with the Allies. Throughout the war, aside from a few notable exceptions in Africa, Italian forces performed extremely poorly, and soon Hitler was sending experienced officers to supervise his allies' military. The Germans saw it as a babysitting assignment, and the Italians were simply sick of war. They'd been lied to after all. Mussolini had promised to turn the Mediterranean into a giant Italian lake, and now the Allies were on Italian territory. The time was ripe for revolution, and shortly after the beginning of the bombing campaign, the Italian government ousted Mussolini, imprisoning him on a mountaintop ski resort, a secure prison for one of the world's most dangerous men. This was a disaster for Hitler, but he had one ace up his sleeve: a single man, Otto Skorzeny, possibly the most dangerous man of World War II. Skorzeny had made a name for himself as a firebrand Nazi and devout fascist, quickly climbing the ranks of the German military. Skorzeny's first ambition had been to become a pilot, and shortly after the invasion of Poland he had volunteered for the Luftwaffe, but was denied for being too tall. At 6 foot 4 inches, Otto was a formidable man indeed, and when his imposing bulk prevented him from becoming a pilot, he joined Adolf Hitler's personal bodyguard regiment instead. As Hitler launched his invasion of the Soviet Union, Skorzeny was back on the front lines, fighting with elite SS units. As the Nazis pushed closer to Moscow, Skorzeny received orders from Hitler himself. He was to capture several key Communist Party buildings and the NKVD headquarters. This would have afforded the German military with huge amounts of valuable intelligence and bid a devastating blow to Soviet fighting morale. But Skorzeny's greatest prize was the sluice gates to the Moscow Canal. Hitler had plans to open the sluice gates wide and let all of Moscow flood, turning the Soviet capital into a lake. Fortunately for the Soviets, the German advance began to falter and then halt. Far too valuable to be lost on the Eastern Front, Otto Skorzeny was ordered back to Germany after being hit in the back of the head by shrapnel. Healing from his injuries, Skorzeny had nothing but time on his hands, time that he used to contemplate his previous orders to capture important communist buildings, the Soviet secret police headquarters, and the Moscow Canal sluice gates. Skorzeny felt that the German military lacked units specialized in such forms of unconventional warfare and began to develop theories on waging unconventional warfare deep behind enemy lines. He studied historical partisan movements and spoke with experienced infantry and paratrooper commanders. In a time before special forces, Otto Skorzeny was developing the first modern plan for a special operations task force. Skorzeny's task force would operate deep behind enemy lines and use subterfuge, espionage, and intelligence rather than brute force to achieve its objectives. By Skorzeny's accounting, a small team of specialized commandos could easily accomplish more than an entire company of infantry could. He was only too right, as British commandos were already training and preparing for deployment behind enemy lines on mainland Europe. The powers that be were slow to listen to Skorzeny, however, at least until British commandos began raiding behind enemy lines in Europe to devastating success. To even his staunchest critics, Skorzeny was quickly proved right.
A small team of elite soldiers could in fact accomplish far more than entire companies of infantry could. Skorzény's name was quickly put forward to command Nazi Germany's first true special operations training schools, and soon he was made commander of the Waffen-Sonderverband ZBV Friedenthal Special Forces Unit. Germany may not have been short on syllables, but they were short on allies, and one of Skorzény's unit's first missions was to parachute behind enemy lines in Iran and contact local tribes. It was hoped that tribal members in Iran could be incited to attack Allied supply lines to the Soviet Union, which despite its massive manpower was almost completely reliant on American supplies for its war effort. Luckily for the Soviets, the effort was deemed unsuccessful when most of the tribes contacted refused to take part in raids. Skorzény's next efforts, however, would be much more fruitful for Nazi Germany. After Mussolini's ousting from power by the Italian Grand Council of Fascism, Hitler knew that the Italian king would declare an armistice with the Allies. This would be a major setback for the German war effort, as Italy had forced considerable resources to be dedicated to the Mediterranean by the Allies. It also threatened his links to oil supply routes in the Middle East, and would give Allied aircraft access to Germany's southern flank if Italy allowed Allied warplanes to be stationed on its territory. Thankfully, the mighty Alps made an overland invasion of Germany from Italy all but impossible, but still Mussolini had to be restored to power, and there was only one man who could get the job done. Locating Mussolini was not easy, as the Italians feared that the Germans would doubtlessly launch a rescue. Hesitant to simply hand him over to the Allies as no armistice had been declared yet, the Italian government had hoped to use Mussolini as a bargaining chip as it sued for peace. To keep the German rescue effort at bay, the Italians moved Mussolini from location to location, making him difficult to track. For weeks, Skorzeny and some of his most trusted men worked the streets of major Italian cities, gathering intelligence and intercepting radio messages. Skorzeny made free use of counterfeit British pounds, created in yet another unconventional Nazi war plan to defeat the Allies, to bribe Italian officials, and recruit double agents and informants. At last, Mussolini was located, and a rescue plan could be put into effect. But rescuing Mussolini would be one of the riskiest operations of World War II. Fully aware of a plot to rescue their fascist dictator, the Italians had taken great precautions with the imprisonment of Mussolini. They moved the dictator to a mountaintop ski resort high in the Apennine Mountains, which could only be accessed by a cable car. The cable car station was itself guarded by Italian infantry, and at the mountaintop resort, Mussolini was guarded by 200 elite Carabinieri guards. The resort was in effect a fortress, with only the cable cars leading up to the top of the mountain. Any troops attempting to use the cars would be slaughtered long before they got a chance to disembark. Rescue would be impossible. But the Italians never counted on the borderline insane daring of Otto Skorzeny. Realizing that the only possible way to get to Mussolini would be to avoid the rail cars altogether, Skorzeny consulted with some of the best Luftwaffe pilots, and he had one question for them. Could a glider be landed on the grounds of the ski resort despite the treacherous mountain air currents? Most agreed that technically, yes, it should be possible, but the risk was insane. Unpowered gliders would be completely at the mercy of tumultuous mountain wind currents, and landing room on top of the mountain was already extremely limited. Even if gliders made it safely, it would be a miracle if they stopped in time before tumbling off the edge of the mountain. On the 12th of September 1943, the weather was at last suitable for the attempted rescue, and Otto Skorzeny and his men loaded up onto 10 gliders. Each glider carried a single pilot and 9 soldiers, bringing a total of 90 elite SS troopers to face off against 200 heavily armed Italian Carabinieri. But Skorzeny had a trump card to play in this gambit. Flying alongside him was General Fernando Soletti, head of the Polizia dell'Africa Italiana, and a respected officer. Skorzeny gambled that if caught unawares in a surprise attack and with the presence of a respected Italian officer, the Carabinieri would stand down. He'd soon find out. As the gliders lifted into the air, 2 companies of German paratroopers launched an attack on the forces holding the cable car station at the base of the mountain. The fighting was fierce, but the Italians were quickly overwhelmed by the far more experienced and capable German troops. Still, not a single German would live to reach the top of the mountain unless Skorzeny was successful, and so the troops held their position to prevent Mussolini being moved via the cable cars. The mountain currents made flying treacherous, more so for the unpowered gliders. The bombers towing the first 3 gliders decided that they needed to gain more altitude before releasing the gliders, and thus began long, slow looping turns to gain altitude. This would threaten the delicate timeline that the operation needed for success, however, and Skorzeny ordered the rest of the planes to continue, regardless of the risk to the gliders. If Skorzeny could not take and evacuate Mussolini quickly, then more Italian forces would soon be on their way. Released from their two hooks, the gliders shuddered in the tumultuous winds of the Italian mountains. The pilots, among some of the best in Nazi Germany, fought the controls to keep the gliders stable and on course. Incredibly, one by one, the German gliders made the almost impossible landing on the tiny tabletop shelf of land at the top of the mountain. Although one of the last to arrive crashed, severely injuring many of its occupants. Leaping from the gliders, though, the bulk of Scorzeni's force was soon running toward the hotel. Scorzeni had given his men a strict order. Not a single one of them was to open fire unless Scorzeni opened fire first. If Scorzeni was injured or died, then one of his officers would be the first to open fire. It was critical that the assault force capture Mussolini without having to fight the 200-strong Italian defenders. With General Fernando Soletti ordering the guards to stand down, the Italians laid down their arms and allowed Mussolini to be taken. In less than an hour, one of the riskiest operations of World War II had succeeded without a single shot being fired. Scorzeni would be an overnight hero to Nazi Germany and earn his place in the Special Forces Hall of Fame if he survived the final phase of the plan to rescue Mussolini, the escape. German forces would be unable to provide security for Mussolini if they tried to bring him down the mountain and move him by land. Therefore, a small plane was ordered to make the incredible risky landing atop the mountain. This would be Mussolini's ticket off the mountain. But there was a problem. The small plane only had enough power and room for its pilot and one other passenger, and Scorzeni refused to leave Mussolini out of his sight. The pilot argued with Scorzeni, telling him that there was little chance that the plane could hit the required speed for liftoff if it were carrying the weight of the three men. Scorzeni refused to budge. Mussolini was his personal responsibility, and he would be the one to see him brought before the Führer himself. Then Scorzeni pointed out the obvious. If the airplane required velocity to generate lift and the takeoff area was too short, then it would simply have to gain speed by falling off the side of the mountain. Scorzeni climbed aboard the tiny plane alongside Mussolini and, under the threat of being shot, ordered the pilot to take off. The tiny plane sputtered to life and began to roll toward the edge of the mountain, slowly picking up speed. As the precipice loomed before them, the pilot's worst fears were realized. The plane could not take off overburdened as it was. The wheels soon left the ground as the plane pitched over the mountainside. By some miracle, however, the plane shuddered its way back to horizontal after a brief dive. Against all odds, Scorzeni had pulled off one of the most daring rescue operations in history. Otto Scorzeni would go on to achieve great success during the waning days of World War II, cementing his place as one of Nazi Germany's most dangerous soldiers. The man became an international special forces legend, and most of his training and operational methods would go on to influence or be outright adopted by special forces programs around the world. Perhaps most surprising of all, however, would be Scorzeni's eventual role as a Mossad agent working for the Israeli secret organization and helping bring Nazi war criminals to justice. The American General William Tecumseh Sherman is often quoted as saying that war is hell. Few members of the military have more of a right to believe that than the subject of today's video, Lieutenant General Sir Adrian Carton de Wiart. This hard-as-nails officer of the British Army served in the Second Boer War in South Africa, World War I, and World War II. He sustained horrific injuries in the line of duty and was brought to the edge of death more times than a person could count. However, war was definitely not hell for this borderline deranged military hero, Adrian Carton de Wiart. For this unkillable soldier, it was more like home. While de Wiart has been held up by the English as a legendary example of courage and national pride, he was actually half Belgian, half Irish. He was born in Brussels, Belgium on the 5th of May 1880. His father was a Belgian aristocrat, lawyer, and diplomat, Léon Carton de Wiart. Léon was a man of high international regard, as Grand Cross of the Egyptian Orders of Osmandia and Medjidie, and a Knight of the Belgian Order. Needless to say, having a father with two such prestigious titles could have easily set Adrian up for a charmed life. His mother was Ernestine Zephyrine Emily, an Irish woman who would die quite early in Adrian's life. The same can also sadly be said of three of Adrian's young sisters. Even from a young age, Adrian Carton de Wiart's life played out like fiction. Growing up, his reputation was marred by rumors that he was secretly the illegitimate son of Belgian King Leopold II. Much of Adrian's childhood was split between Belgium, England, and Egypt. Due to his father's business dealings in the Middle East, young Adrian became fluent in Arabic. When Adrian's father remarried, this time to the English woman Mary James, Adrian was shipped off to a Catholic boarding school in Birmingham, UK. He attended the Oratory, where he was trained to become the quintessential British gentleman and also an avid sportsman. Adrian was being groomed to follow his father's path into business and law, but Adrian had other ideas. The founder of his boarding school, John Henry Newman, was famous for saying, "Fear not that thy life shall come to an end, but rather fear that it shall never have a beginning."
Even if Adrian had never heard this quote, its sentiment clearly resonated deeply with him. The courtroom held no satisfaction for Adrian Carton de Viart. For as long as he could remember, he yearned for the excitement of battle, the thrill of war, and he knew that as soon as he got an opportunity, he would eagerly enlist. That opportunity presented itself with the beginning of the Second Boer War in 1899. At the time, Adrian was attending Balliol College in Oxford, trying to earn a law degree. He was an unimpressive student, underperforming in exams and being dispassionate toward his studies. When Adrian heard about the war, he immediately fled Oxford and found his way to the nearest enlistment center. Adrian knew he needed to be involved in the war somehow, saying later in his memoirs, "At that moment, I knew once and for all that war was in my blood. If the British didn't fancy me, I would offer myself to the Boers." The enlistment center was where Adrian ran into his first obstacle. He was 19 at the time and the enlistment age was 20. This didn't do much to stop him though, as Adrian lied about his age, his parental permission, his citizenship, and enlisted under the name Trooper Carton. Before he knew it, he was off to war. Adrian's long and illustrious life as a military serviceman was about to begin. The Second Boer War was a conflict between Imperial Britain and the local forces of South Africa, the Orange Free State and South African Republic, also known as the Boer States. Adrian became a member of the Middlesex Yeomanry, a volunteer cavalry regiment. He served alongside Paget's Horse, an elite British cavalry unit that acted as the backbone of Britain's ground offensive in the Boer conflicts. However, while he was serving in the Orange River Colony, he was struck down, not by enemy soldiers, but by a sudden fever. He was hospitalized for a brief period before re-enlisting with the local military corps. Adrian experienced his first of many injuries while attempting to cross a river in South Africa, where Boer commandos ambushed him and shot him in the stomach and groin. He was no older than 20 at the time. When he was found injured by his superiors, they asked him if there were many Boers in the area. Adrian's reply, "No, but the few were very good shots." Adrian survived and was shipped back to England for treatment, where his furious father chastised him for skipping school. But Adrian didn't care. He may have been shot, but he survived, and now he'd truly gotten a taste for the thrill of battle, a thrill he didn't intend on giving up. When Adrian fully recovered with his father's begrudging approval, he quit college and decided to pursue a military career full-time. He took an extravagant first-class plane trip back to Cape Town, handing out huge tips to the air hostesses and landing almost completely broke as a result. But Adrian didn't mind. He was a soldier again, and that made him feel alive. In South Africa, Adrian began to act out. He was promoted from trooper to corporal before being immediately demoted for threatening to punch a sergeant. While he managed to reach the rank of second lieutenant during his service in South Africa, he saw practically no combat, which Adrian found extremely frustrating. He was a fighter and a playboy with a love of gambling, drinking, socializing, and hunting. The one thing Adrian couldn't abide by was boredom. So when the Second Boer War came to an end, he applied to be sent to British Somaliland. There, British Imperial forces were fighting against a guerrilla warfare campaign led by Mohammed bin Abdullah, known to the colonialist authorities by his nickname, the Mad Mullah. However, instead of immediately getting his combat wishes, he was instead stationed in Mutra, India. There, his boredom drove him to create more trouble. Mounted pig hunting became his favorite pastime because it was the closest thing to real combat he could get. Even this caused him injuries, as after falling from a horse, his horse also fell on him, cracking his ribs and ankle. Adrian's frustration grew so great that he even shot an Indian servant in the butt after a petty squabble. His superiors jailed him for his act of wanton violence. He'd spend the next several years killing time, but not enemy soldiers, in various British and Allied territories across the globe. Adrian used his oodles of downtime to practice physical fitness, getting so strong he was capable of ripping apart decks of playing cards with his bare hands. Though that skill probably didn't make him popular with fellow soldiers in the barracks who just wanted to play some poker. In this time, he swore allegiance to the king and officially became a British citizen. During his deployment in Europe, he also married an Austrian countess with a ridiculously long name. Friederike Maria Carolina Henrietta Rosa Sabina Franziska Fugger von Babenhausen. He was doing pretty much everything except fighting. When World War I broke out, Adrian was ecstatic and finally deployed to British Somaliland to join the war against the Mad Mullah. Adrian was assigned a squadron of the Somaliland Camel Corps, tasked with hunting down the dervishes, followers of the Mad Mullah. During a daring attack on one of the Mullah's fortresses, Adrian, wrapped up in the adrenaline of the fight, decided to charge in head first. Unsurprisingly, the dervishes shot Adrian 3 times in the face, taking out his eye and blowing off half of his ear.
Because Adrian seemed to be borderline immortal, this didn't kill him. He lost that eye forever and was sent back to England for treatment and redeployment. When describing this conflict later on, Adrian said, "It had all been the most exhilarating fun." The British Army conceded to Adrian's wishes to be assigned to the Western Front on the condition that he wore a glass eye. However, because he found the glass eye to be uncomfortable, he tore it out in the cab taking him to the airport. Adrian was more of an eye patch guy. Later, biographers would even describe him as looking like a gentleman pirate. Adrian joined the 4th Royal Irish Dragoon Guards, a cavalry regiment stationed along the Western Front in February of 1915. During the Second Battle of Ypres, while attempting to relieve an infantry unit, Adrian's regiment was fired upon by a German artillery unit. Shell fragments and exploded parts of his own wristwatch utterly mutilated Adrian's hand. It only left part of his palm, and his 2 remaining fingers were hanging on by some thin tendons. When a field medic refused to amputate the fingers, Adrian just tore them off at the stump and carried on. Adrian then fought in the Battle of Somme and was once again a hard-as-nails lunatic. Other soldiers reported seeing Adrian tearing the pins out of grenades with his teeth and throwing them into enemy territory with the hand that still had fingers. During the assault on the occupied village of La Boisselle, after the sudden deaths of 3 unit commanders, Adrian took command of all 3 units and led them to victory across no man's land. He was awarded the prestigious Victoria Cross for his act of valor in battle. Like any adrenaline junkie, Adrian wanted to maintain the high. He continued charging ahead in battle after battle, until another near-death experience in the Delville Wood trenches, a series of trenches so treacherous they earned the nickname the Devil's Wood. There, a sniper blasted him straight through the back of his skull. Predictably, he didn't care, nor did he care in subsequent battles when he was shot once again in the ear, hip, leg, and ankle. Whenever Adrian was released from the hospital, he ran straight back to the front line, having the time of his life. In the aftermath of World War I, he remarked that he really quite enjoyed the war. In the interim between World War I and II, Adrian couldn't bear to remain out of conflict. He took part in battles across Eastern Europe, assisting Poland in its wars against Lithuania, Czechoslovakia, the Ukraine, and Soviet Russia. In classic WWII style, he achieved numerous feats of daring high-octane action. He survived several plane crashes, nonchalantly brushing off the resulting injuries. He also fought off an onslaught of Cossack cavalrymen with a single revolver when they attempted to hijack a train he was protecting. Even when he fell off said train while it was moving, he was quick to jump back on and continue the battle. After victory in the Polish Wars, Adrian remained in Poland for 18 years. However, when World War II began, Adrian didn't hesitate to jump back into the battle. Using a fake passport, he returned to the UK and re-enlisted. By this point, Adrian was 61 years old, with one eye and one hand. It didn't stop him, because as you've probably gathered by this point, basically nothing could stop Adrian Carton de Vire. Initially, Adrian narrowly survived taking part in a few disastrous operations to drive the Nazis out of Northern Europe, all of which failed. In 1941, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill gave Adrian a secret envoy mission to offer assistance to Tito in Yugoslavia. However, during this mission, the Wellington bomber transporting Adrian and his comrades crashed into the Mediterranean Sea. Adrian, despite being an elderly half-blind amputee, still managed to swim himself and a wounded fellow soldier back to the shoreline. He was then taken to a POW camp for British officers in Vinciliata Castle near Florence by Mussolini's forces. Was this the end of Adrian's story? Of course not. He and 5 other prisoners, all of whom were in their 50s, built a 60-foot tunnel under the castle and escaped. They posed as Italian villagers despite not speaking a lick of Italian, and managed to evade capture for over a week before getting found and taken back to the castle. When Mussolini was deposed and killed, Adrian and the other prisoners were freed and returned to the UK. This would be Adrian's final war, but not the last of his experience in international relations. He was sent on a diplomatic mission to China, and while he didn't kill anyone, he still managed to exercise his trademark brand of foolhardy bravery. He told Chairman Mao Zedong to his face that he hated communism. Mao apparently took it in good humor, and just because he was a creature of habit, he survived another plane crash during his stay in China. Adrian finally passed away not from war but from natural causes at age 83. He died in his County Cork home in Ireland, survived by his wife and 4 children, none of whom were mentioned in his memoirs. Though, in Adrian Carton de Vire's defense, he had a lot of ground to cover. A Nazi soldier opens the hatch to his Panzer tank. He scans the horizon for enemy Soviet forces. Suddenly, a single soldier pops out from behind a kitchen tent.
He holds a rifle in one hand and an axe in the other. The Soviet has a crazed look in his eyes as he runs toward the Nazi tank, screaming at the top of his lungs. He swings his axe back and forth, ready to decapitate anyone who gets in his way. Shocked, the Nazi soldier slams the hatch shut and peers through the viewport. The Soviet soldier leaps into the air and lands on the tank. The man who would later take down this and other Nazi tanks using his axe and deception was Ivan Pavlovich Sereda. The craziest part was that he was only a cook. That's right, this Soviet war hero who would go on to destroy tanks and successfully fight off countless Nazi soldiers during World War II started out as a cook in the Red Army. Ivan was drafted into the 91st Tank Regiment in 1939, just after Nazi Germany launched their invasion into Poland and started World War II. At the time, Germany and the Soviet Union had a non-aggression pact, but Stalin and the rest of the Soviet leaders did not trust Adolf Hitler to keep his word. This would turn out to be a smart decision. The Soviet Union started amassing tanks and troops along their western border just in case Hitler decided to break his pact. Ivan Pavlovich Sereda wanted to serve his country and asked his superior officers to transfer him to the front lines. They looked at him and thought for a moment, and then his CO shook his head. He told Ivan that anyone could shoot a gun, but not everyone could cook as well as him. His talents were needed in the kitchen to keep the troops fed, which was just as important as being stationed at the border. Ivan disagreed but followed his orders. Then in February 1941, Nazi Germany started amassing troops along the Romanian-Soviet border near where Ivan and his tank platoon were stationed. The Soviets had been keeping close tabs on the war in Europe. Hitler and his Axis powers seemed to be decimating the continent. However, Great Britain was still a thorn in the side, and the Soviets didn't think Hitler would be bold enough to launch an offensive on a second front. But he was a psychopath, so anything was possible. Ivan's regiment was repositioned and stationed in the small forest near Dvinsk, which is now Daugavpils in current-day Latvia. For several months, there was no action. It just seemed like both sides were at a standoff, and Hitler might actually keep his non-aggression pact. But then on June 22, 1941, Ivan and his regiment heard a crackling voice come over the radios. The Soviet communications network was not very reliable, and it was difficult to make out exactly what was being said. But between the static, the words everyone was dreading were heard. The Nazis had launched an invasion into the Soviet Union. The attack was called Operation Barbarossa and consisted of over 3 million soldiers and approximately 3,000 tanks, 7,000 pieces of artillery, and 2,500 aircraft. Ivan was only a cook, but he couldn't help but feel a sense of duty. He wanted nothing more than to be promoted so he could fight on the front lines, but it was not to be for the moment. The Nazis began bombing cities along the border as they pushed through the Red Army. Their forces decimated Soviet resistance and advanced further and further into the motherland. Ivan in the 91st Tank Regiment had seen little action, but in August 1941 that was about to change. Word had reached them that the Germans were moving closer to their position. The tank battalion was sent out on a scouting mission to see if they could intercept the incoming Nazis. Ivan was left all alone at the camp to prepare dinner for later that evening. Ivan was cutting up potatoes and other vegetables to put into a hot stew that would keep his comrades warm and their bellies full. It was a quiet afternoon. The wind blew gently across the field where Ivan whistled to himself as he cooked. As he took a break from stirring and stepped out of the tent that served as the kitchen, he heard the sounds of engines in the distance. He thought that his regiment must be returning from patrolling the area, so he continued to cook. The sound of the tank started getting closer and closer. The pots and pans in the kitchen began to clang against one another as the ground shook from the approaching tanks. They didn't seem to be slowing, which made Ivan nervous. The area where the supplies were kept and the tanks were parked was a decent way away from the kitchen, but these tanks seemed to be rolling right up to the tent. Ivan poked his head out to see what was happening. From where he was, he couldn't see over the embankment on the other side of the road. He stepped out from inside the tent and walked toward the road. He slowly climbed up the small hill and peered over the side. What he saw was startling. 2 German tanks from the 8th German Tank Division were heading toward him. He ducked back down behind the ridge and paused for a moment. He could hear the tanks continuing straight toward him. Ivan had wanted so badly to be on the front lines, and now he was. The only problem was he was all alone, and he was up against a heavily armored Panzer 38T. In an ideal situation, he would be with a platoon of men, or at least in his own tank, but that was not what fate had in store for him. As he peered back down over the embankment, he saw one of the tanks peel away and head in a different direction. However, the other Panzer was still moving straight toward him. Ivan slid down the hill and ran behind his cooking tent. Just as he disappeared from sight, the Nazi tank crested the hill and approached the road. The roar of the engines began to slow as the tank came to a stop. The hatch of the German Panzer 38T creaked open, and a Nazi soldier stuck his head out. He scanned the area for any Soviets, as this appeared to be their encampment, but he didn't see anyone. Ivan was panting behind the tent. He closed his eyes and slowed his breathing. The air was cold. His breath rose like steam coming off a hot pot. Ivan looked to his left and saw his rifle leaning against a crate. He grabbed the rifle and a grenade resting on top of the box. Ivan knew that the Germans would roll over him if he didn't do something quickly. Or even worse, they could lie in wait for his comrades to return and launch a surprise attack. Ivan decided that he would need to take out the tank himself. He moved around to the side of the tent. His foot bumped into something resting on the ground. He looked down to see an axe impaled on a log that he was chopping. Ivan looked at the axe for a moment and then smiled. He had an idea. Ivan picked up the axe, peered out from behind the tent, and prepared to do something crazy. When the Nazi looked the other way, Ivan ran toward the tank, screaming like a madman. He fired his rifle with one hand while swinging the axe wildly with the other. This surprised the Nazi, who quickly retreated back into the tank and shut the hatch. He screamed to the tank crew that they were under attack. The machine gunner swiveled the 7.92mm ZB-53 machine gun toward the crazed Soviet running at the tank. He pulled the trigger. Bullets started whizzing by Ivan's head. They ripped through the tent behind him, but Ivan managed to dodge back and forth to stay out of the direct line of fire. Miraculously, he made it to the side of the tank without being hit by a single bullet. Ivan launched himself off the ground and scrambled up onto the Panzer's hull. He moved toward the front of the vehicle and brought his axe down on the machine gun. He hit the barrel of the gun over and over again until it bent and jammed. Ivan had disabled the tank's close-range weapon, and now he needed to deal with the crew inside the metal behemoth. The Nazis began to yell. The tank's engines roared to life. It started to move with Ivan on top of it. He looked around for some way to stop the Nazis from getting away. He used his axe to cut off a piece of tarp that was holding down supplies on the hull of the tank. Ivan grabbed the tarp and stuck it over the viewport so the crew inside couldn't see where they were going. The tank began to swivel back and forth. Now Ivan had to think of a way to get the Nazis to come out of the tank. He began shouting at the top of his lungs for his comrades to start setting grenades under the tank in order to blow it up. This was a bluff, as there were no other Soviet soldiers around, but the Germans didn't know that. Ivan continued to shout orders and bang on the hull of the tank with his axe. This confused the Nazis inside, who now thought there was a whole platoon of angry Soviet soldiers outside the vehicle. Ivan continued to shout at the Germans to give up or their tank would be blown up with him inside it. He even used different voices to make it seem as if there were more people than just him banging on the tank. The Nazis tried desperately to escape, but since they couldn't see, they had no idea there was only one man outside their tank holding them hostage. After several minutes of this charade, the Nazis shouted from within the bowels of the tank that they wanted to surrender. Ivan smiled to himself as he agreed to their surrender and told them to come out one at a time. The first Nazi crew member turned the locking mechanism on the tank's hatch and exited the armored vehicle. He was greeted by Ivan holding up his rifle and instructing the German soldier to line up along the tank. The rest of the tank crew followed. Ivan had captured 4 Nazis and a Panzerkampfwagen 38T tank single-handedly. When the Germans realized they'd been duped, they were likely extremely ashamed, and at that point they didn't even know that Ivan was only a cook. That evening, the rest of the tank regiment returned to camp. They found a Nazi tank with its crew tied up waiting for them. The Soviet soldiers got out of their vehicles and looked in astonishment as their cook, Ivan Pavlovich Zareta, exited the kitchen with hot food in his hands. His superior officers asked him what happened, and Ivan gladly recounted the events of the day to them. The Soviets examined the vehicle, interrogated the Nazis, and found that Ivan was telling the truth. He really had captured the Nazi tank using nothing but his rifle and an axe. That night, as all the Soviets ate the meal that Ivan had prepared, they listened to his daring story of how he'd managed to trick the Germans and take them all prisoner. They were all astonished at his tale. His commanding officers immediately took him off the kitchen duty and promoted him to scout. He'd finally gotten what he wanted. Ivan was sent on missions to scout Nazi positions in the area and bring information back. The story of how he used his axe to destroy a machine gun on a German tank and then capture the crew spread like wildfire across the Soviet Union. It was used in propaganda posters to bolster the morale of troops. Ivan was now a war hero, but he didn't let it go to his head. Only a few weeks after taking out the Nazi Panzer with his axe and becoming a scout, Ivan captured another tank and demolished a unit of Nazi soldiers. This time he was better equipped, but what he did was no less miraculous than his first battle with a tank. Ivan and a group of scouts were conducting reconnaissance on an area that was reported to have German soldiers patrolling it. As they made their way through the forest, the birds were singing, and the sun warmed the air. They reached the tree line and sighted a group of Soviet soldiers running down a dirt road. Ivan was going to make his presence known when suddenly a Nazi tank broke through the trees. The tank fired its cannon at the retreating Soviets, causing the trunks of the trees to explode into shards of splintered wood. The debris went flying everywhere as the machine gun aboard the German tank opened fire. The bullet slammed into the ground all around the retreating Soviet force. As the tank laid down covering fire, a group of Nazi foot soldiers appeared from behind the armored vehicle. They started to pursue the Soviets down the road while the tank followed. The Nazis shouted at the Soviets to halt. However, if they were caught, they'd be tortured for information, so rather than surrender, the Soviets dove behind fallen logs and returned fire. But the support of the tank was too much, and the members of the Red Army appeared to be doomed. Ivan fell back to the tree line and stealthily worked his way behind the tank. The Soviets fired at the tank, but the armor was too thick, and the bullets bounced off harmlessly. The Nazis continued to advance forward. While the tank and Nazi soldiers were focused on the trapped Soviets, Ivan climbed up the back of the vehicle. He carefully stepped over the gear strapped to the tank's hull and made sure his footsteps made as little noise as possible. Since the machine gunner was firing at his comrades, they couldn't hear Ivan scurry across the top of the tank and unlock the commander's hatch. Ivan armed a grenade, opened the hatch, and peered down into the opening for a moment. He locked eyes with the Nazi commander sitting in the middle of the tank. The German yelled to warn the others, but it was too late. Ivan dropped the grenade into the tank, slammed the hatch shut, and jumped off the moving vehicle. The grenade detonated, killing everyone inside. He'd done it again. Ivan had single-handedly captured another tank. Without missing a beat, Ivan jumped back on the tank and ran to the hatch. Even though he'd killed the tank crew, the Nazi soldiers were still advancing on his comrades. Ivan threw the hatch open and climbed into the smoldering inside of the tank. The bodies of the crew were covered in shrapnel and blood. Ivan moved the gunner's body out of the seat and took position. He turned the turret and aimed directly at the advancing German force. Taking a deep breath, Ivan peered through the sighting tube and made sure everything was lined up. He squeezed the trigger. The tank buckled as the shell was ejected from the barrel. It flew through the air and slammed into the middle of the Nazi unit. The detonation threw bodies everywhere. Around a dozen of the German soldiers were instantly killed or seriously injured. The rest laid down their guns and immediately surrendered. They were now sandwiched between their own tank, which was controlled by the former cook turned war hero, and a squad of angry Soviet soldiers. Confused as to what was going on, the Soviet troops cautiously approached the Nazi tank. Its barrel was still smoking. They asked whoever was inside to come out slowly. Ivan popped the hatch and poked his head through the hole with a smile on his face. The entire unit let out a cheer. When Ivan returned to base after his impromptu rescue mission, he was greeted with even more accolades. On August 31, 1941, he received the Presidium of the USSR for exemplary performance of combat tasks as the command on the front of the fight against the German invaders and showing courage and heroism. He also received the title of Hero of the USSR, the Order of Lenin, and the Gold Star Medal. He would soon be transferred to another unit, but one of his former comrades said that the 91st Tank Regiment kept his axe as a battle relic and a reminder of Ivan Pavlovich Sereta's heroism. There was no time for Ivan to celebrate his awards, however, as the worst fighting of the war was yet to come. Ivan was made platoon leader of the 4th Infantry Regiment and gained command of the 46th Infantry Division of the 1st Shock Army. He saw some combat during this time, but it was when he was promoted to company commander of the 7th Infantry Regiment that things got really intense. This unit was sent to Leningrad during the siege of the city, which would become one of the bloodiest and most brutal blockades the world had ever seen. In fact, many historians believe that the siege of Leningrad was actually a form of genocide because of the Nazis' systemic starvation and murder of civilians who were stuck in the city. Things got so bad during the siege that there are accounts of Soviet civilians cutting off their own flesh and eating it for sustenance. The siege began on September 8, 1941, when the Nazis secured the last road into or out of the city, and didn't end until January 27, 1944, 872 days from when the blockade started. It was at this point that the Red Army was able to overcome Nazi forces and push them back toward Germany. Ivan joined the fight to hold Leningrad at the beginning of the siege, as it was pummeled by Nazi artillery. He would not stay for the duration of the battle, as his skills were required in Moscow only a few months after the siege of Leningrad had begun. While in Leningrad, Ivan was likely deployed for reconnaissance and saboteur missions. With his ability to take out tanks in unconventional ways, he might have been ordered to disrupt enemy artillery encampments and try to break the siege. During these missions, Ivan and his unit would use forests surrounding the city of Leningrad to hide from German forces. Using the cover of night, they could place bombs near ammunition stores and do their best to hinder enemy operations. We don't know the exact role that Ivan played in the defense of Leningrad, but it may have been just as crazy as his other two major run-ins with the Nazis. After a few months of fighting at Leningrad, Ivan was made the company commander of the 185th Infantry Division of the 30th Army and sent to the Battle of Moscow. On November 27, 1941, Ivan and his unit met up with other Soviet forces near the city. The brutally cold temperatures of the Soviet winter were quickly approaching. Although the Red Army didn't have the supplies and equipment they needed, all of the soldiers, including Ivan, had survived decades of winters in their country. It would not be enjoyable, but the Soviets knew how to handle the brutal weather. The Nazis, on the other hand, were worn down from months of battling Soviet forces to get to Moscow. Ivan and his men were set up along the outskirts of the city to stop the advancing German forces. They would send tank regiments to try to break through the Soviet defenses, but units like Ivan's had laid down mines and set up kill zones where they would ambush any Nazi forces that came through. With each day that went by, the weather got colder and colder. The Germans were beginning to freeze to death. Although Ivan was now in charge of his own company, he may have also helped out in the kitchens where his career in the military had begun. He carried his axe with him, as it was a valuable tool not just for defeating Nazi tanks but also for chopping wood to keep his soldiers warm. By December, Ivan and the rest of the Soviet forces had held off wave after wave of Nazi advancement toward Moscow. The Germans could not break the line. Their army was starving and freezing to death when on December 5, 1941, the Soviets launched a counteroffensive that would push the enemy away from Moscow and back to Germany. By January, the Nazis could no longer fight back. Temperatures were recorded as low as -42 degrees Celsius or -44 Fahrenheit. The German Luftwaffe couldn't fly their planes as their wings and propellers were frozen in place. Ivan and the Soviet forces at Moscow pushed forward and destroyed any German force that was unable to escape the harsh landscape and climate of the Soviet Union. But the weather and continuous fighting also took their toll on the Red Army, and a stalemate developed. Ivan continued to fight the Nazi invaders for the duration of the war. His expertise and heroism allowed him to move up in the ranks of the Red Army. Ivan was a lieutenant when the war came to an end in 1945. He retired but still had a desire to serve the people of the Soviet Union. He became chairman of his village council to help rebuild after the devastation of World War II. Unfortunately, the toll of war does not end when the fighting stops. Due to breathing in harmful fumes from tanks, spending countless nights in below freezing weather, and harmful chemicals that were ingested while fighting the Nazis, Ivan's health began to decline rapidly in 1950. He passed away at the age of 31. From the time he could join the military to the day he died, Ivan Pavlovich Sereda served his country and gave his life to the Soviet Union. He died a highly decorated war hero and remains the only known chef to take out a tank using an axe. Guns, tanks, stealth jets, and lasers? The US military has a pretty advanced army, and buried in those vaults are some of the strangest weapons ever invented. Here are the craziest military weapons the Army still uses today. Number 20. Atchison Assault Shotgun. Everyone knows the positives of a shotgun. They hit like a tank, complete with an earth-shattering sound. The cons? Very limited capacity. That makes it useful for scaring off a daughter's boyfriend or blowing the head off a zombie, but maybe not so much in combat. Military weapons require both accuracy, ease of use, and high capacity, not something shotguns are typically known for. Enter the Atchison. Also known as the Auto Assault 12, this gun is one of the only automatic combat shotguns ever created. It only needs the user to make a quick trigger pull to fire and can fire up to a whopping 300 shots a minute. While this model was designed in the 1980s and has largely fallen out of favor, future designs built on it and combat shotguns are still used today. Making them even more useful, the powerful recoil that comes with a shotgun, knocking many an unexpecting user off their feet, is barely present here. It takes the power of a shotgun and combines it with the accuracy and use of a rifle. But sometimes the best way to survive combat is not to be seen. Number 19. Adaptive Camouflage. It's hard to get a convoy through enemy territory. One wrong move and you could come under attack from dozens of snipers. And staying under the radar is easier when you're not taking massive military vehicles with you. Camouflage has been used by militaries for thousands of years, often as simple as the color of clothing soldiers wear. But disguising something large like a tank is a different story. In 2011, that all changed as BAE Systems announced an incredible new program that could protect convoys from enemy eyes. But could someone really make a tank invisible? Surprisingly, yes. The adaptive camouflage system was simply surprisingly effective. The sides of the armored vehicle would be covered with around 1,000 hexagonal panels that would take thermal images of everything around the vehicle. They would then reflect what was on the other side, creating an image of an area without the vehicle in it. Alternatively, the camouflage could reflect the chosen image, like a harmless car driving through, to eliminate suspicion. The infrared stealth system remains one of the top choices for high-tech camouflage available today. Sometimes what an army needs is strength. Number 18. Hulk. No, they're not dropping a green giant guy on the enemy, although that would be pretty effective. The Human Universal Load Carrier was an attempt by Berkeley Robotics starting in the year 2000 to see what a human can do when given a little assistance. Carrying equipment is one of the biggest challenges of the Army, and it often makes it hard to travel from one location to another. So, the scientists asked, what if we could increase a soldier's carrying capacity? By how much? How about an inhuman 200 pounds while traveling 10 miles an hour? And all it would take was a simple exoskeleton. The Hulk was designed to fit around the legs and back, providing support and a powered assist while carrying a massively heavy backpack. Powered by batteries, it would run for up to 8 hours while marching and could operate for days with lighter use. While it did perform up to par for weight and none of the troops using it were injured by the weights, the Army wasn't quite satisfied with the freedom of movement it offered, and it could cause strain on muscles. While it's not currently used in combat, interest in the project remains, bringing us all a little bit closer to being Iron Man. In combat, the most important factor is none other than accuracy. Number 17. Precision-guided firearm. In today's Army, many of the soldiers are trained marksmen, but many only get basic training. And in the event of a draft, it's likely some would be thrown into combat with only a few weeks of training. That's why today's military is focused on how to take a little of the work off the soldier and onto the gun itself. The precision-guided firearm is an upgraded sniper rifle that not only has the traditional tracking scope, but comes with wireless smart technology to pick up data to make it easier to hit your target. And when we say pick up data, we mean all of the data. The most advanced of all these weapons can hack into a local and larger network to pick up data from voice and video all around. The digital scope can also provide visual assistance for locking onto the target, similar to how fighter jets often have precise targeting mechanisms. If this sounds like super spy territory, that's because it is, and many of these weapons can track targets and figure out the best possible vantage point to hit them from, without much input from the man behind the scope. But what if it wasn't just the gun that was smart? Number 16. Smart bullets. Precision-guided munitions are not new. Missiles and torpedoes are often equipped with guiding mechanisms that can not only just lock onto targets but change their trajectory if the target moves. In 2008, the Exacto program at DARPA switched their strategy from focusing solely on smart guns, developing bullets that can have the same abilities. The earliest model would illuminate the target with a laser designator, and the bullet would be keyed to follow that. It would be able to track targets up to a mile away and change position 30 times a second. But modern designs might be even more advanced. The research into smart bullets is ongoing, and Dr. Roland Barrett developed a model that would have 3 fiber optic eyes around it for tracking. Other designed bullets would be able to be controlled by radio waves or travel around corners automatically without needing to be fired from a curved barrel. These weapons are still in development, and the biggest roadblock in their way? Money. After all, most soldiers will only use one gun, but a lot of bullets, and making every one of them a smart bullet would involve a lot of technology. Maybe time to send those bullets through community college instead. Sometimes, though, you need non-lethal weapons. Number 15. Taser Shockwave. A stun gun can be a useful way to neutralize an enemy without killing or seriously hurting them, like when you need them coherent for interrogation. But that becomes a lot harder when the person is part of a large group of enemies, and they're all coming right at you. They're probably going to overwhelm you before you get the chance to fire the taser more than once, and that's if you don't run out of charge. But what if you could fire 10 tasers at one time? That's the question the mad scientists at the Taser Corporation decided to answer, and the resulting weapon was amazing, if not exactly practical. Meet the Taser Shockwave, a battery of stun guns attached to cables and loaded into a launcher. When triggered, the tasers shoot out and deliver powerful shocks to just about anyone they hit. It might look like a many-headed dragon, but it's effective at incapacitating attackers quickly and in large numbers, if it hits the target. Accuracy isn't really its strong suit, and in a combat situation, there's no guarantee it would hit its target. Taser continues to refine the weapon, and some think it might be more suited to crowd control than combat. And sometimes, you need weapons in the most unusual circumstances. Number 14. Heckler & Koch P11. You're on a submarine, and you get an alert. A saboteur is trying to sink you. You get into the water to engage, but there is just one problem. Your gun isn't equipped for firing underwater. Ordinary rounds lose range and accuracy when fired underwater. Fortunately, you're armed with the Heckler & Koch P11, one of the best underwater pistols ever developed. It's short and stubby, looking more like a checkout scanner than a gun, but it packs a punch. But the surface isn't the only thing that makes it different. The P11 only has 5 barrels as opposed to the usual 6. It fires steel darts rather than traditional bullets, but they can still tear through the enemy. And rather than being traditionally fired, it uses a battery pack in the grip. Also, don't use it recklessly. It can't be reloaded by users and has to be returned to the factory for more ammo. This isn't a weapon that's used too often unless we wind up fighting an army from the lost city of Atlantis, but its secrets are well kept. So well, in fact, its manufacturer won't comment on it. Sometimes the military goes small, and sometimes they go big. Number 13. Electromagnetic Laboratory Railgun. The U.S. Office of Naval Research is not a place you get into easily. This is where all the prototypes of the most advanced weapons in the military stable can be found. But one of them has the potential to be one of the deadliest weapons ever created, taking an already powerful tool and supercharging it with modern technology. A railgun is a massive weapon that fires projectiles at rapid speed and would be one of the most powerful weapons in the U.S. arsenal without needing the equipment for traditional firing. So what is the secret of this massive prototype? Instead of chemicals designed to ignite explosions, this railgun would fire projectiles entirely using magnetic fields and electricity, and they would travel faster and hit harder than any bullet currently available, up to a whopping 5,600 miles per hour. This gives the railgun power associated with cruise missiles. It's currently in testing and the military is optimistic about mounting it on ships soon enough, but to get there they'll have to perfect the repeated fire capability, because for this gun it's both quantity and quality, and that means a lot more tests. But what if the military didn't need to use humans at all? Number 12. The Fire Scout. When troops are in a pitched firefight and they see a helicopter from up above, it usually means one thing: backup is here. But the powerful defense contractor Northrop Grumman has given a new twist. The helicopter is here to provide support, but that doesn't mean there's anyone on board. The Fire Scout looks almost exactly like a standard military chopper, but you'll see a few differences. For one thing, it doesn't have windows, because there's no one inside to look out of them. The Fire Scout might be the most advanced drone ever created. It can take off and land independently, provide aerial fire support for ground troops, and has a top-of-the-line targeting system. While it's designed to be used in combat, it's also an effective surveillance tool. It was declared mission-capable in 2019 and took to the skies, although the Navy continues to develop and enhance it. This raises the question: if the smart machines are the wave of the future, which other heavy artillery could soon be roaming the battlefield without any soldiers on board? Naturally, we're about to find out. Number 11. The Black Knight. Tanks are the workhorse of the military. These treaded vehicles provide valuable shelter for soldiers, run over enemy lines, and are equipped with powerful guns. There's just one downside. If they take a hard hit, they can be hard to escape from in a hurry, which is why the mad geniuses of BAE Systems asked, what if we had a tank without the vulnerable people inside? Enter the Black Knight, a 12-ton tank designed as an unmanned ground combat vehicle. It looks like an ordinary tank on the surface, but much like the Fire Scout, looks can be deceiving. Let's just say you don't want to be in the way of this drone. It's armed with both a turret-mounted large gun and a coaxial machine gun, runs on traditional Caterpillar diesel engines, and its tractor treads make it ideal for off-road operations. It's operated by remote control, but also can use its computer system to make in-combat decisions, independently of operator input. While it's ideal for missions that are too dangerous to send soldiers into the field, its technology is still a work in progress as the military tries to perfect the wireless communication system. But many people in power think this is the remote tank that might be the wave of the future. The military has developed many non-lethal weapons, some with a devastating impact. Number 10. Phaser. It looks like a sci-fi laser gun, and it kinda acts like it too. The Phaser, officially titled the Personnel Halting and Stimulation Response Rifle, is a massive laser dazzler gun designed by the Air Force's Research Division. It doesn't fire a projectile, but can neutralize an entire field of enemies in seconds by unleashing a massive burst of light that can temporarily blind them. This is a low-intensity laser, which means that the victim should recover quickly, but it can leave an entire field of soldiers stumbling among each other and firing nowhere in particular. So why is this weapon not everywhere yet? It's not that the gun didn't work, it's that the military had to make sure it didn't work too well. Blinding weapons that can cause permanent damage are banned under a 1995 UN protocol, and using them is seen as a crime against humanity. So the military needed to make sure there were no lasting side effects. They also had to give it a really cool name, and someone in the design process was definitely a Star Trek fan. But unlike its namesake weapon, this one only has a stun setting. This next weapon might be the way out of some close quarters. Number 9. The Corner Shot. In the 1940s, the Nazi army debuted a new weapon, the Krumlauf, a rifle with a curved barrel that could shoot around corners. It was an innovative solution to a major combat problem, and it was a complete failure, with the bullets getting jammed and damaging the barrel after only a few shots. But over 50 years later, the design might have been perfected, ironically by an Israel weapons designer named Amos Golan. Designed in cooperation with American investors, the Corner Shot has become a key tool for modern militaries. But technology has marched on since the 1940s, and it shows. Unlike the failed version, this weapon doesn't try to shoot a bullet through through a curved barrel. Instead, it mounts to a small pistol on the end of a larger weapon, allowing it to be aimed at the target that can be seen through a periscope lens. And it's not a high-powered weapon, but it's one that makes shooting targets from the safety of cover much easier. And in case you're looking for a little more firepower, it can be equipped with a 40mm grenade launcher that can send rounds flying in any direction you choose, without the risk of blowing up your own barrel. Sometimes it's not about the firepower you pack, but it's about what you see. Number 8. IVAS. Soldiers can be armed with the best weapons in the world, but in the fog of war, they're dependent on their own eyesight. If they're caught in smoke or in a snowstorm, their aim might be off, leading to missed targets or worse, friendly fire casualties. This gets even more dangerous when the enemy releases vision-clouding weapons, letting them get the drop on the soldiers, which is why teams in the United States Army are working on a unique new headset, one that will not just clear their vision, but plunge the soldiers into a new world. Are our soldiers ready for virtual reality? The Integrated Visual Augmentation System, or IVAS, is an augmented reality headset that eliminates visual fog and provides soldiers with a unique array of image options. This includes a thermal setting, so soldiers will be able to see hidden enemies. It also can filter out interference and let soldiers focus on what's important. The headset is in final testing, and the Army plans to use it both as a field tool and a training tool, with soldiers able to engage against virtual enemies in the headset. Maybe exclusive headset video games will soon make some pro gamers sign up for the service too. It's not the only field where the military is working on what sounds like science fiction. Number 7. Quantum Stealth. Guy Kramer comes from Canadian innovation royalty, being the grandson of the man who invented the first walkie-talkie. But he might be looking to outdo his granddad by cracking a concept H.G. Wells invented in fiction over a century ago. How do you turn someone invisible? The military has been working on a vehicle camouflage for a while, but options for mobile soldiers are much limited. That's where quantum stealth comes into play, a long-term project between Kramer's company Hyperstealth and military officials in both Canada and the USA. So what's the secret to his innovation? The keys to quantum stealth are being kept close to the military's chest, but what we know is that quantum stealth uses lenticular lenses, the same technology seen in 3D movie posters. The lenses refract light according to the angle they're viewed at, and the way that they're arranged creates dead spots where the object isn't visible, but the background is. While it doesn't render the subject completely invisible and can create a blurry spot, it's more than effective enough to confuse a soldier observing from a distance. So it's no surprise the government is investing heavily in the technology. But sometimes you need an earth-shattering kaboom. Number 6. XN1 Laws. Unleash the death ray. Laser weapons are part of science fiction lore, but the US government doesn't want to destroy any planets with them, we hope. The advantage of lasers is that they use a simple powered device and don't rely on ammunition, so they can deliver more than one hit in quick succession. The XN1 Laws was developed by the US Navy and first deployed for field testing in 2014, and the USS Ponce was the lucky ship to get to fire it first. It uses an infrared beam launched from a laser array to hit flying and sea-based targets. So, how does it work? For one thing, it's highly energy efficient, needing only an energy pulse to fire and none of the equipment. It can also be adjusted for power, being useful for temporarily blinding enemies at the lowest level. But when it's dialed up to the maximum level of 30,000 watts, it can deliver a massive punch. Not only can it target motors and fry sensors, but it can detonate explosive material on an enemy boat before it reaches its target. It might not be able to blow up enemy battleships from afar, but it's the most effective laser weapon yet. And when it comes to non-lethal tech, sometimes things get weird. Number 5. LED Incapacitator. The enemy is advancing, and the only thing that will defeat them is a flashlight? Well, not just any flashlight. The LED Incapacitator is one of the oddest weapons designed by the Department of Homeland Security's Innovation Research Office, and it's largely designed for use at border crossings and other locations where confrontations with suspicious individuals who might be carrying contraband are likely. Rather than using a traditional weapon, this weapon unleashes a series of random pulses of multicolored light, which switch frequencies often and cause pressure on the brain, and the effects can be messy. The first symptom is a severe headache, and subjects can experience temporary blindness because their eyes can't adjust to the flashing lights. But they also can't focus, become disoriented, and are hit with a wave of nausea, which is why this weapon has earned the nickname the Puke Ray. It's largely an effective weapon against individual targets, but some subjects have been proven largely immune. While it hasn't been deployed everywhere due to concerns over its effectiveness, the odds are it would at least be a useful distractor. But that's nothing compared to what this next non-lethal weapon does. Number 4. Active Denial System. The US military and defense contractor Raytheon wanted a way to maintain perimeter security and crowd control without having to rely on live fire, and they developed an option that comes out of science fiction. Known as the ADS, it works by firing an energy beam of similar wavelength to the way a microwave oven works. But instead of heating up your frozen burrito, the ADS is going to heat up you. It activates the water and fat molecules in the skin, suddenly heating them and creating a painful effect that sends anyone hit with it running. But surely, microwaving people can't be ethical, right? While the technology is scary, the effects have been minimal. A microscopic percentage of those affected develop minor burns and blistering, while most retreat from the painful sensation without suffering any obvious injuries. While the device could seriously hurt someone if focused on them, the device is intended to protect perimeters and deter people from entering, meaning they'll have the option to run away as soon as they feel the heat. Authorities are now exploring deploying it in both theaters of war and as a way to keep prisoners from escaping over the fence. This next weapon raises the question, is James Bond becoming real? Number 3. The Armatix IP-1. This weapon doesn't look like much, it's just a standard handgun. But if the agent carrying it gets attacked and disarmed, the enemy grabs their gun, they'll be in for an unpleasant surprise. Because it doesn't matter how many bullets are in the chamber, that gun is not firing. The Armatix IP-1, developed by a famous German firearms manufacturer, is notable for being one of the most advanced smart guns in the world. Not only is it optimized to be safe and easy to fire and equipped with a camera, but it can only be fired by its authorized user, and it pulls that off with an unassuming accessory. The Armatix IP-1 comes in 2 parts, the gun and the wristwatch it's linked to. It might look like a standard accessory, but it's actually an RFID system that communicates with a handgun and can wirelessly affect it when within 10 inches. If the gun is separated from the watch wearer, it becomes a paperweight. This is one watch battery you don't want to run out, so it indicates the charge on both parts, and it comes with a targeting system that can identify and only fire toward the assigned target. It's not a surprise that this gun is not only being considered for classified missions, but many people want some of its features added to standard guns. But what's the ultimate frontier in combat? It just might be droids. Number 2. Modular Advanced Armed Robotic System. What's better than armed combat vehicle drones? How about an armed robotic soldier that can head into battle instead of humans? We might be a long way from the cyborg wars, but that hasn't stopped the Defense Department from dreaming big. They've been experimenting with combat robots for a while, and the current models are more advanced than ever. Coming soon to a battlefield near you, the Mars, a nearly 400-pound robot armed with sensors, weapons, and cameras, and it's packing more firepower than any human could carry. How much? How about a machine gun? 4 grenade launchers, the capability to fire non-lethal gear like tear gas, as well as laser dazzler and a loudspeaker for communicating safely with the enemy. For non-combat missions, the Mars can be equipped with the ability to carry up to 120 pounds. While some combat robots are designed for artificial intelligence, the Mars is more analog, controlled by an operator at base like a drone. But it doesn't need to be a smart robot, it's got enough brawn to make up for the brains. But there's one more robot in the field that might take you by surprise and make you say, "What a good boy." Number 1. Robot dogs. A battlefield is stressful enough, but imagine seeing a large 4-legged animal approaching you. It looks kind of like a dog, but the proportions are off and it's moving fast. This isn't some weird desert beast, it's one of the military's most popular innovations, the Big Dog. This 4-legged military robot was developed by Boston Dynamics and DARPA in 2005 for equipment carrying purposes, essentially replacing the pack mules of old. Its 4-legged system would let it overcome rough terrain, and each one would have a complex onboard computer. But sometimes reality defeats innovation. The Big Dog project didn't work out for carrying military equipment because they were too loud for combat. Turns out all those moving parts aren't quiet. But this wasn't the end of the project. While the original shut down in 2015, a smaller all-electric model with a lower carrying capacity was soon introduced. And many current models are being equipped not just with carrying capacity, but with non-lethal defense capabilities. That means these robot dogs have a bite, and they might just be coming to a city near you. It's burning hot outside. Temperature's well over 100 degrees, and the air conditioning on our up-armored Humvee barely does a thing unless you press yourself right up against the vent. I'm really tempted to let down the window, but even when the wind blows out here in the desert, it just feels like a blow dryer to your face. Also, we're stopped, and it's hardly safe to let your bullet-resistant windows down in this part of the country when your vehicle's at a dead standstill. I'm a fire team leader. My team and I are providing escort security for a VIP in the Humvee in front of us. Directly in front of his Humvee is 2 others, and the lead Humvee stopped because of a suspicious pile of trash on the road ahead. But now everyone's on edge when they travel these roads. The insurgency has been hiding IEDs in everything from children's toys to random piles of trash and triggering them as a NATO column moves by. We've stopped for about a minute now, and I'm getting really nervous. This is my first deployment.
and I've heard stories about what happens when your convoy sits still for too long. On the radio, I hear the VIP, some general, call out to the lead vehicle, "Just shoot the damn thing and drive past." That actually sounds like a good idea. It's moments later and the lead vehicle opens up with a 50 caliber machine gun in its turret. There's a dull thump sound, and past the 3 vehicles in front of me, I can see a cloud of dust rising up into the air. Yep, it was an IED after all. Suddenly, I'm more nervous than I was before, if that's even possible. We were supposed to have an MRAP with us to clear the way. That's a mine-resistant, ambush-protected vehicle that we've been told can take an IED to the face and keep on trucking. They just got in theater though, and as usual, maintenance issues means they weren't ready to go when we needed them. The lead vehicle is waiting until visibility is restored before pressing forward again. No point driving straight through a thick dust cloud into whatever may have been waiting for our lead vehicle to take that IED and get knocked out. There's zero chance any insurgents in the area know of our VIP cargo, but to them, hitting one convoy is as good as any other. They just want to score casualties. Still nervous about sitting still, I tell our Mark 19 automatic grenade launcher gunner, who is looking behind us and providing rear security, to keep his head on a swivel. Then it happens. There's a dull thwack, thwack, thwack sound, and 3 cracks appear on the driver's side bullet-resistant front window. I can see dull sparks from rounds pinging off the armor of the Humvee in front of us. Without needing to be told, the M60 gunner in that Humvee immediately spins his turret and starts putting out fire into the field to our left, where the firing is coming from. My mouth goes dry. This is it, and I very desperately want one of 2 things to happen. I want the convoy lead to order us to dismount, because sitting in a Humvee is not a good place to be when the bad guys have RPGs, even if you're driving an up-armored version like we are. I also want the convoy to just press forward, pedal to the metal, get the hell out of here. That's exactly what doctrine states in most situations. You push out of the ambush zone, but we don't move. Then we get a question over the radio. Are we receiving fire to the rear? Negative. After a moment, the convoy lead asks for our gunner to lay down a 100 meter by 100 meter barrage on the field we're taking sporadic fire from. I yell at my gunner, who seems eager to obey the order. A half second later, there's the dull thumping from the huge automatic grenade launcher, and in my stomach, I can feel the impact of the 40mm grenades exploding. He puts out fire in a 100 by 100 meter square as instructed, because we can't see the shooters, and in my head, I remember practicing the same tactic when I too qualified on the Mark 19. I always pictured myself painting a giant box, the grenades being full of paint, and making sure every single square inch of that box got filled in. The fire we were taking dies off long before our gunner finishes his job, then immediately turns his turret around to provide rear security again. We sit in silence for a few moments, and the order to go forward is given. I look down at my watch, and incredibly, only 2.5 minutes have passed since we stopped for the suspected IED. My first combat felt like hours, and it was barely 150 seconds. Later we get word that a security sweep of the area found the remains of 3 bodies. When I hear the news, I realize these guys weren't the real deal. Probably just some fired up kids hoping to take out some Americans and make a name for themselves. The real insurgency is a lot better at their jobs. It's now 2 days later, 1800 hours. We just got out of a briefing for tonight's op and are headed for Chow. We've been tasked with providing security for some intelligence guys as they lead us to a house in a local village. Tonight's gonna be a snatch and grab. The target is a bomb maker who's suspected of being pretty high up the chain, and likely the guy who either built the bomb the teenagers who got themselves KIA the other day tried to use, or planted it himself and left them behind to try and take out some Americans. The intel guy suspected he's been sent there by his higher-ups to try and bolster the local insurgency. This area has been relatively quiet for years, but we're getting intel from locals that the insurgent forces are moving back in. If we can take this guy alive, it'll be a huge intelligence victory. So we're told over and over again how important it is we practice strict fire discipline. Also, the house is located in the very center of the village and packed right in next to 2 other houses on each side. The walls in most of these houses are really thin, and even our M4s can punch through these walls and hit someone on the other side. Limiting civilian casualties is critical. Nobody wants to be responsible for killing a civvy. I'm scared to death, but I try not to show it for the sake of my team. The prospect of going into the middle of a village to try to snatch a high-ranking enemy VIP makes my stomach churn. We've trained extensively for urban combat, even went through FBI training in close quarters battle or CBQ, and I know it can be a nightmare. There's too many places to hide or get ambushed from. Civilians everywhere. In military parlance, it's a total shit show. Also, tonight we can't go in with heavy weapons. We're limited to just M249 saws on the Humvees, and even those are for emergencies only. The M249 is like the smaller cousin of the M60 or the M240 Bravos, and there's something about seeing the big 60s or 240s on a turret that makes me feel safer, or preferably a 50 cal in a Mark 19. Everyone's in high spirits though. Only one other guy in our team has seen combat before, our sharpshooter. He doesn't really like to talk about it, but none of the snipers ever really do. Through a long-range scope, you can see the faces of the people you shoot at, and that makes the war real personal for those guys. It's now 0100 hours, and we're rolling back down a road en route to our target. The great thing about this part of the country is that few of these places have electricity, and the clear desert skies let you see more stars than you've ever seen in your life. The starlight is good for us. Lets us drive our Humvees and one escorting Bradley without headlights. Everyone uses night vision instead. Our vehicles may be loud, but we want to give the enemy as little a heads up as possible. A half hour later, we're rolling into the village, and everyone's on high alert. I remember asking during the briefing why we didn't just stop short of the target and hoof it. I feel safer approaching on foot without the vehicles making a bunch of noise and alerting the village the moment we enter. They want this to be a quick operation though. Literally drive up to the guy's front door and yank him out before anyone has a chance to react. On paper, it seemed like a good idea. In reality, I have my doubts, and those doubts grow as I start to see curtains being pulled back in windows and faces looking down at us in surprise. We're at the target block of houses within a minute of arriving though, and I find myself hopeful that we're fast enough to take off guard anyone who might be protecting the enemy VIP. I tell our driver to pull to the back of the houses. Us and the second team are tasked with securing the rear of the buildings and making sure nobody makes a run for it or tries to ambush us from this location. We're out of the Humvee in seconds, taking up positions overlooking the rear and corners of the 5-block row of houses. I look back and see my gunner in the turret behind the 249, and something in my gut tells me to get him off that turret. This is supposed to be a fast op, in and out, so it makes sense for him to stay in the turret, but I can't explain. Something tells me to get him and that gun down, so I do. He ends up taking position by one of the tires of the Humvee, proned out and gun facing down the road we're on. I can hear the entry team bash the front door in, and on cue, two of our guys back here pop flashbangs inside the two windows on the rear of the small target house. Up front, they do the same thing, and almost simultaneously, there's the roar of 4 or 5 bangers going off at once. We have no idea where in the one-story house this guy is at, but we're not taking any chances. If he was awake and waiting for a fight, I guarantee he's no longer in a condition to do so. Everybody gets tense, waiting for the sound of gunfire, but there's nothing. Just the screaming of some civilians. A man and his wife and kids run out of one of the next door houses and take off down the street, fleeing in terror. We let him go. Then there's a call over the radio. We hit the wrong house. The intel guys screwed up bad. The only people inside are an old woman and her 2 older daughters. The old woman's in bad shape from the bangers and she needs medical treatment ASAP. I hear the call to abort. We lost the element of surprise, and the last thing our 20-man crew wants to do is get caught with our pants down, as they currently are, in the middle of this village. Everyone starts rushing for the Humvees. Up front, they're taking the old woman and her daughters into the Bradley so they can rush them back to base for medical attention. Briefly, I think about my own grandmother. What if it had been her in that house? We made this mess. Now we gotta clean it up and make it right. Suddenly, there's light, then heat. Finally, a roar. I'm staring up at the sky and I can barely hear anything. Slowly, my hearing comes back. Then I look over at my Humvee just 40 feet away and it's in flames. Took an RPG and it looks like the gas tank got hit. There's burning diesel everywhere. Immediately, I look for my gunner and I see him miraculously laying down fire towards a house a block over. The thick, heavy-duty tire and axle somehow protected him from the blast. War is so random sometimes. My head's all fuzzy as I look at my gunner firing away, and I keep remembering, don't fire unless you need to, and keep off the 249s unless absolutely critical. There's civilians everywhere. I open my mouth to tell him to stop firing, but then I see the dust that's being kicked up all around me. Little explosions of dust everywhere, and I realize we're being shot at a lot. My hearing finally comes back as I crawl for cover behind a short concrete wall. The air is full of sharp cracks, and it dawns on me that that's the sound of being on the wrong end of a bullet. I make contact with my team, checking for any casualties. Everybody's fine, but the other team with us has a guy down. My mind races as I take stock of the situation. We're being told to extract ASAP, but I radio back that our Humvee's out and we got 1 casualty. The fire's coming from a house directly up the street from us, and I realized that this was probably the house we were looking for all along. Just our luck to be caught right out there in the open in front of it too. There's fire coming from 2 of the front-facing windows, and somewhere to the left of the house in another building as well. My guys are returning fire best they can, and the 249 is chewing up the front of the house, but having to stop for reloads every 30 seconds or so. He's got no assistant gunner with him this time to help him reload. We weren't supposed to need it. I can see the figures darting in and out of the house, to the left and right, and I realize they figured out that we're just a small team, not even a full-strength platoon's worth of soldiers, and 3 of them are intel guys I'm not sure have fired a rifle since basic. I remember my training. We studied the Russian invasion of Afghanistan a lot. Their biggest mistake was staying put when under fire, letting the Mujahideen maneuver on them and outflank them. They took huge casualties because of that. We don't stay put. I order my SAW gunner to stick with the other fire team to protect the wounded. Now they have 2, and I take my 2 other guys and make a break to our left. We duck behind another row of houses and start slowly sweeping forward. We may be under strength, but we've been trained to fight aggressively. A second fire team from the front of the house is mirroring our movement on a parallel street. One of their Humvees got knocked out as well, and we're down to 2 Humvees in the Bradley. Not enough room to move everyone out. We didn't bring spare vehicles because, again, we were supposed to be in and out. The US military has learned from its mistakes. Too often units have sat still, holding defensive positions waiting for extraction or a chance to make a break for it, racking up casualties the whole time. Not us. We got one way out of this mess, and that's to jump straight into the teeth of it. We take 4 guys completely by surprise. They're practically jogging down the middle of the street, not even bothering to move tactically, rifles up. Guess they expected us to hunker down, to sit still. Their mistake. They'll pay for it. It's a lot like shooting targets at the firing range. A few quick squeezes on the trigger and it's over in a couple of seconds. The 3 of us opening up almost simultaneously. We're now just a few houses over from the new target house, which is being hammered by one of the front team's 249s and incredibly still has people shooting back out of it. The other fire team maneuvering up also ran into their own bad guys, but they got pinned down in a firefight. Yes, their perps were smarter about how they moved toward an ongoing fight. We fixed the number of hostiles by now though, 2 still firing inside the house, and 3 engaging the fire team maneuvering up the street across from us. There's another estimated 3 down inside the house, 2 in front of it after trying to make a break out the front door, plus the 4 my team got. That's 14 hostiles total, 9 now KIA, who were all either living in or next to the target house. Suddenly, I'm really happy we didn't hit the right house. It would have been a bloodbath for the entry teams. It's a small village though, and the good news is that with so many hostiles in one spot, it's unlikely there's reinforcements coming from anywhere else. This gives me an idea. It's insane, and I surprise myself when I realize I'm already transmitting it over the radio. I'm even more surprised when we get the go-ahead. We've been cleared to storm the house, take out the last 2 guys, hopefully seize the enemy VIP still alive, all with a 3-man assault squad. It's insane, I keep telling myself as we move toward the rear of the house, guns up and eyes trained on the windows and doors around us, but especially the rear door of the house. It's been left wide open, probably from the haste the guys trying to maneuver on us were in. I'm afraid. Damn afraid. I'm about to literally jump into the shark's mouth and take guys with me, but I push it out of my mind. I realize that this is the first time I've been afraid since the fighting actually started. I've been running on pure adrenaline, brain falling back on training. I go back to that place and I try to think about what's coming next as just another training exercise, just another breaching exercise. Move in, shoot the stationary target dummies, don't shoot the civilian dummies, reset the course, do it all over again. At the back of the house, I peer into one of the rear windows. There's what looks like a messy bedroom that sleeps at least a dozen guys. Blankets all over the floor, but it's clear. The back door leads to what I'm assuming is a hallway. Slowly, the 3 of us maneuver on that door, stopping just to the right of it. This was my stupid idea, so it's my head that peers out and into the open door. Long hallway, and I can hear what sounds like 2 guys firing from one of the rooms at the end of the hallway. Looks like they didn't leave any rear security. Again, probably expected us to sit tight, defend our casualties, and wait for extract. This is a new war though, we don't sit and wait for air support anymore. Hit us, and we're going for the jugular. I call for the gunner still putting fire on the house to aim high. The machine gunner is now shifting his fire up, hitting the roof of the building so he doesn't inadvertently put rounds through the thin walls and into us. By keeping up the fire though, he's drawing the attention of the 2 guys still inside, making them think they're still taking direct fire. I take point. Again, it's my bad idea. Might as well be the first in. Also, it's my team. The thought of one of the guys buying it and me going home safe because I was 2nd or 3rd in scares me more than this firefight. We stack on the side of the door, just like in training, ready to burst in almost simultaneously. The 3rd man on the stack squeezes the shoulder of the 2nd guy, who in turn squeezes my shoulder. That's the cue. And on getting that squeeze, I silently whip into the door, rifle up and ready. It's supposed to be a 4-man stack, but we adapt. I push past the first door on the left and the 2 men behind me whip into the room. I hold position just past the door, still focused dead ahead where the shooting is coming from, a room further down the hall on the right. A second later, the 2 come out of the door whispering all clear. We press forward once again. again. The hallway is tight, too tight for the guys behind me to safely fire if anything happens without running the risk of hitting me in the back, so I'm all the security we have as we move forward. I'm duck walking, my feet spread widely apart and chest forward to the enemy. That way if I do take a round, it'll go straight into the thick armor plate covering my chest. It's an awkward technique to learn at first, but we've practiced it so long that it's easy as regular walking for me. I keep expecting someone to pop out ahead of us, but nobody does. The two firing away in the room ahead to our left are still completely unaware we're in the house. There's a body up ahead lying in the hallway. By now we're close enough to the front that I can see all the bullet holes in the walls where our rifle and machine gun fire tore straight through the thin walls of the home. This guy must have caught rounds that came through the closed front door when the fight started. I take a quick look at the body, which is lying face up, and then call for the man behind me to cover me as I take a knee real quick. His rifle goes up as I duck down, checking a photo in my pocket the intel guys provided us with. Yep, it's him, the bomb maker. Now, just another KIA. The entire mission is basically pointless now, just two loose ends left to tie up. The saw gunner out front has been strafing the far left side of the house and the roof to make it seem like he's still opening up on the bad guy shooting out the window. Now I call him over the radio. He pulls his fire up even higher, putting it clear over the roof of the building and into the sky. Me and my team are directly outside the bad guy's door now. I don't feel anything. Just another run through the CQB course back home. Nothing to it but swing in, fan out, take out your dummy targets, and press on. I feel that squeeze on my shoulder, and operating purely from instinct, I swing into the doorway and press forward. In CQB, you slice up a room into individual fields of fire, and each man has his own slice. It's vital you clear your slice first, even if there's no bad guy there, because if you ignore it to open up on a bad guy in somebody else's slice, you could miss someone. And now that bad guy you didn't put down is going to put you down and your team down. I swing into the room and press forward just like in training. First man in, I'm responsible for the far left rear corner of the room, away from the front-facing windows, away from the bad guys. The second and third man are in the room just split seconds after me. There's silence at first, then the roar of gunfire coming from my guys. My slice of the room is clear, so I turn to the known threats, but they're already down. They never saw us coming, never dreamed we would do anything but hunker down and try to defend ourselves. In combat, whoever has the initiative is typically the victor. We've been trained to be aggressive, to seize the initiative and deny it to the enemy, keep him off balance. Tonight, that training saved our lives. I think about this night later, and I find myself glad that my slice of the room had been clear. I'm glad it wasn't me that had to put down a hostile at point-blank range, close enough to see their face.